Welcome back to Harry's Cosmos, where the wizarding world gets rewritten one what if at a time. Today's adventure: what if Harry and Hermione were crowned the true heirs of Merlin and Morgana? Before we dive in, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The night the lake remembered, the dementors came down over the water like a tide given hunger. There were more than 100 of them, and they moved without sound, and the moonlight died wherever their shadows crossed it, so that the far shore of the lake became a torn map of silver and nothing. Frost climbed the reeds. The mud at the waterline stiffened and whitened and cracked. On the near bank under the hawthorn, Harry Potter stood over the crumpled shape of his godfather and understood with a cold, practical clarity that they were all three about to die. Hermione had hold of his wrist. Not his sleeve, not his arm above the elbow where a frightened person grabs, but his wrist, right over the pulse, her fingers cold and exact, and later he would think of that grip as the hinge on which everything after turned. She was not pulling him back, she was standing with him. "There's too many," she said. Her voice had gone thin and level, the voice she used when she was frightened past the point where fear was any use and had decided to work the problem anyway. "Harry, there are too many. I know." He raised his wand. The cold reached into him and began pulling things out. His mother's voice, the green light, the high laugh that lived under all his worst nights. He reached past all of it for the one memory that was not a memory at all, but a promise he had made himself on the walk down from the castle, that he had seen someone drive these things off already from across the lake, and that if time was truly a circle, then the someone was going to have to be him. Expecto Patronum. The stag came out of his wand like an argument the knight could not answer. It was enormous. It lowered its antlered head and charged the dark, and the dementors broke over it, and around it the way water breaks over a standing stone, and Harry poured everything he had down his arm and into the light, and felt, threaded through his own magic, something else. A second current, a different temperature. Hermione's hand had tightened on his wrist, and her own wand was raised beside his, her incantation half a breath behind his own, and though no second Patronus took shape, her casting ran into his like a stream meeting a river, and the stag blazed white, then whiter, then a color that was not white at all. The color was old. That was the only word Harry ever found for it in all the years after. Not gold, not silver. Old the way the light on the sea in certain paintings is old, the way dawn must have looked on the first morning there was anyone to see it. The stag's light went down into the lake, and the lake answered. It began far out, past the shallows, past where the merfolk sang, down where the water forgot the sun for months at a stretch, a brightening, as though a second moon lay drowned on the lake bed and had, after a very long time, opened its eye. The glow spread under the surface in slow rings, and where each ring passed, the dementors above it recoiled, not fleeing the stag now, but fleeing the water, robes snapping, their long wrecked hands flung up against a light that came from below, from the deep, from something that had been there before the castle, before the school, before, perhaps, the naming of the lake itself. Hermione made a sound that was not quite a word. The rings of light reached the shore. The frost on the reeds melted upward, which was impossible. The mud unstiffened. Warmth came off the water like the breath of an animal, vast and living and unhurried. The last dementors fled north over the trees, dwindling to scraps, to smoke, to nothing, and out of the deep, up through fathoms of glowing water, rose a single syllable. Neither of them heard it with their ears. It arrived the way pain arrives, or love, directly, without asking permission of the senses. "Anwelid," said the lake in a tongue that had been dead so long that even its ghost had a ghost. "Beloved." The light went out, not suddenly, but the way a held note ends, with a kind of consent. The moon reasserted itself. Ordinary night crept back across the water. Sirius lay gray and breathing in the grass, and somewhere up the slope a beetle was ticking in the gorse, and the world was only the world again. Harry's legs sat him down. He did not decide to sit. The deciding happened somewhere below the level of his opinions. Hermione folded down beside him, her hands still locked on his wrist, and for a moment they simply stared at the black water where the impossible had been. "You heard it," Harry said. "Yes. What did it?" "I don't know." She said it fast, which meant she did know something and hadn't finished being sure of it. He could read her that well by now. 3 years of trolls and basilisks and time travel taught a person the grammar of a friend. It was Latin. It wasn't anything we're taught, Harry. It wasn't anything anyone is taught. Behind them up the hill they could hear shouting, Snape's voice and Fudge S, and the machinery of the ordinary catastrophe cranking back into motion. They had a hippogriff to save yet, and a godfather, and a night that was already 2 hours deep in stolen time. Hermione stood and pulled him up after her, and her hand, before it let go of his wrist, squeezed once. "Not comfort, confirmation. You saw it too. We both carry it now." They ran for the castle. Behind them the lake lay flat and dark and satisfied, like something that has waited a very long age for a debt to come home and can wait a little longer for the rest. The dream came to both of them, though they didn't learn that until morning. Harry stood in the dream on grass that had never been cut, under stars arranged in patterns no astronomy tower had ever charted. Before him was a table. It was round and vast, made of a single cross-section of an oak so great that the tree it came from must have shaded a whole hillside, and its surface was inlaid with lines of silver that moved gently like slow water, rivers, he realized. a map of rivers with no countries drawn between them. There were chairs around the table. He did not count them. Two, directly across from where he stood, were different from the rest, taller, older, one wound about with carved oak leaves and the other with carved blackthorn. And they were empty in the way a house is empty when its family means to return. Two people stood behind the empty chairs. The man was made of contradiction, big through the shoulders like a smith and worn fine at the edges like a scholar, his beard iron gray and cropped short, nothing like the pointed hats and star-spangled robes of the chocolate frog cards. He wore undyed wool. His eyes were the exact color of the lake's drowned light, and they rested on Harry with an attention that had weight, like a hand on the back of the neck, not unkind. Appraising. The look a man gives a field he is thinking of trusting with seed. The woman beside him was dark-haired and pale and still. Her stillness was the loudest thing in the dream. She had ink on her fingers, actual ink, blots and stains of it, and a thin silver scar through one eyebrow, and she was not looking at Harry at all. She was looking at someone beside him, and when Harry turned his head, Hermione was there, and had in the manner of dreams always been there, with her arms folded and her chin up and her eyes moving over the table, the chairs, the carved thorn, taking notes without parchment. The woman spoke. Her voice was low and dry and carried the way frost carries into everything without effort. "They're young," she said to the man, in the tone of someone continuing an argument several centuries old. "We were younger," the man said. "We were disasters. We were necessary." The man's gaze had not left Harry. "So are they." The woman finally turned her eyes on Hermione, and something in her stillness shifted, a door unlatching somewhere far back in a great cold house. "This one reads the room before she enters it," she said. "This one has been told all her life that she is too much and has decided to be more instead. Yes, I know the shape of that." She lifted one ink-stained hand, palm out, not a wave, and oaths beginning. "Little sister of my blood, when they ask if you are afraid, tell them only of stopping." The man laid his hand flat on the table over the moving silver rivers, and the whole dream rang like struck bronze. "Come and find us," he said. "The water has already told you the word. The rest is only walking." Harry woke in his four-poster with dawn graying the window and the word on his lips, whole, like a coin left under the tongue, Anwilid. Across the castle in Gryffindor Tower's other wing, Hermione woke with ink on her fingers. There was no ink bottle open anywhere in her dormitory. She checked. At breakfast, she slid onto the bench opposite him, put down a book, a scroll, and 2 slices of toast with the air of a barrister laying out exhibits, and said, "Round table, silver rivers. 2 chairs, oak and blackthorn, a man who looks like a blacksmith who got a library wet, and a woman with ink on her hands who talks like everything she says is going in a ledger." Harry set down his fork. Around them, the great hall was doing its end-of-term roar, banners and gossip and the clatter of 500 people who had not been visited in the night. "He told me to come and find them," Harry said. "He said the water already gave us the word. Anwilid." Hermione said it carefully, the way a person handles a blade to learn its balance. "It's Old Welsh, or something older, wearing Old Welsh like a coat. I found it referenced once in the whole library, Harry, in a footnote in Cantrip S. Sunken Kingdoms of the Isles, and the footnote just says the word appears on exactly one artifact, provenance sealed." She turned the scroll around so he could see her notes, tiny and ferocious. "Sealed by whom, you ask, because of course you ask. Sealed by Gringotts under something called the Deep Charter." "What's the Deep Charter?" "That," Hermione said, "is the interesting part. There is no book in this library that says what the Deep Charter is. There are 4 books that mention it exists, and every one of them mentions it the way you mention the weather in a country you're not allowed to visit. The oldest reference is from 1211. She took back the scroll, rolled it with a snap. "Whatever spoke to us out of that lake, the goblins have known about it for at least 800 years, and every wizard who ever asked was told to mind his own business." Down the table, Ron arrived in a landslide of bacon and Quidditch opinions, and the conversation went ordinary, and Harry led it. But he was aware all through breakfast of a prickle at the edge of his senses, and when he finally gave in and looked up at the staff table, Albus Dumbledore was watching him over the rim of a goblet, blue eyes mild, twinkling, benevolent. The headmaster raised the goblet half an inch. "To your health." Harry nodded back and returned to his eggs, and could not have known, that on the desk in the Tower office, under a silver instrument that measured things no other instrument in Britain could measure, there already lay a parchment in the headmaster's own looping hand. 3 lines were written on it. "The lake woke. Twin casting P&G resonance sustained past severance of contact. Word rendered by the water, variant of the old tongue. See sealed folio, rise. They must not go to Gringotts before I understand what answers." The strangeness started small, the way floods do. On Tuesday, in the last charms lesson of the year, Professor Flitwick set them revision, nothing harder than a cheering charm. Harry raised his wand, got as far as the second syllable, and the charm leapt from him complete, a bloom of effect that hit not only Seamus, his partner, but the 4 nearest desks, whose occupants spent the rest of the hour beaming like lighthouses. Flitwick made him do it again, alone, slowly, and watched with his head cocked like a bird hearing a new song under the ground. "Curious," was all he said. He wrote nothing down, but he stopped assigning Harry a partner. On Wednesday, Hermione, in the library to return books, took the long way through the ancient rune stacks, Habit and Farewell, the pilgrim's circuit of a beloved country, and stopped in front of a case of tablets that were not runes at all, or rather were the mothers of runes, unlettered scratchings from a barrow in Powys that no scholar had ever read. The card in the case said honestly, meaning unknown. Hermione read them. She did not decide to read them. The reading happened to her, the marks resolving into sense the way a stereogram resolves all at once, irreversible. Boundary stone, said the first tablet. Here ends the king's peace and begins the peace of the water. And the second, smaller in a different and angrier hand, she made this ward and it has never broken. Mind that, whoever you are going to be. She stood in front of the case for 20 minutes. Then she went and found Harry on the Quidditch pitch, where he was flying nothing in particular in enormous circles, and told him, and the two of them sat in the stands while the light went long and gold, and were quiet together in the way that had somehow, over 3 years, become the place they both thought best. It's the lake, Harry said at last. Whatever woke, it's still awake. It's in us, or it turned something on in us, or it recognized something that was already there, Hermione said, and stopped it sleeping. She had her arms around her knees. Below them the pitch lay striped with shadow, and the castle beyond it, and beyond that the water, blank and bright as a held mirror. Harry, I keep thinking about what she said in the dream. Little sister of my blood. Her voice was steady, her hands were not entirely. I'm Muggle-born. Whatever's happening, blood is going to come into it, because in this world blood always comes into it, and when it does, then it does, Harry said, and we'll be standing in the same spot we're standing now. He knocked his shoulder against hers lightly, a Quidditch player's nudge. Same as the shore, you didn't let go, I'm not going to. She looked at him sidelong for a moment. Whatever she checked for in his face, she found. No, she agreed. All right. The evening made its slow ceremony over the mountains. Neither of them said anything else for a long while, and neither of them needed to, and that too was a kind of magic, older than any of the kinds with names. The crow came on the last morning of term during the post. Owls fell through the enchanted ceiling in their usual feathered avalanche, and among them, black as a burnt-out star and twice the size of any raven in the owlery, came a crow, and the whole hall noticed, because the crow did not flap and wheel like the owls. It descended in a single straight line, wings set, like a decision that had already been made, and it landed on the rim of Harry's goblet, and it looked at him with one eye and then the other, and every conversation within 30 feet died. It carried 2 letters not tied to its leg but held in its beak, and it laid them down side by side between the toast rack and the marmalade, one addressed in ink the color of deep water to Mr. H.J. Potter and one in the same hand to Miss H.J. Granger. That's a Gringotts death crow, breathed Neville, who knew things about the old families the way other people knew Quidditch standings. Gran says they only fly for the deep vaults. She's seen one once in 70 years. The crow waited with the patience of a creature that has outlived empires, while Harry broke the sealed black wax, stamped not with the familiar Gringotts crest but with a plainer, older device, a single key crossed with a single branch. The parchment inside was heavy as cloth. To the attention of Harry James Potter by authority of the Deep Charter, sealed in the 11th year of the Peace of the Two Courts, Gringotts gives notice. A matter of inheritance, long held in trust and now quickened, requires your presence and your blood's witness. You are summoned to the deep vaults at your earliest liberty. Bring the other to whom the water spoke. No guardian's consent is asked, for in this matter the charter recognizes none above you. The debt is older than the bank remembers. Sharprock, keeper of the deep vaults. Hermione had gone still over her own letter, which she turned it so he could see, was identical save for the name. Around them the hall's noise was flowing back in, 400 students inventing 400 rumors, and at the staff table Albus Dumbledore had risen from his chair, unhurried, genial, and was making his way down between the benches with the air of a grandfather come to admire something. The crow turned its head and looked at the headmaster. It made no sound. It did not move otherwise. But Dumbledore stopped 4 feet away, and something passed across his face that Harry had never seen there, a flicker quickly mastered of a man recalculating in deep and unfamiliar territory. A handsome bird, Dumbledore said pleasantly to the table at large. Harry, when you have a moment after breakfast, perhaps you might come up to my office. Matters of the summer to discuss. Licorice wand is the password. Do bring Miss Granger's counsel if you wish. She has always struck me as. The crow opened its beak. What came out was not a caw. It was one syllable of the old tongue, harsh and exact, and Harry understood it, and by the widening of her eyes so did Hermione, and by the sudden careful blankness of his face so impossibly did Albus Dumbledore. Naj, said the crow. No. Then it took Harry's reply, 2 words written with Hermione's quill on the back of his own summons, will come, and it went up through the rafters and out over the lake, straight as a flung spear, and the last thing Harry saw of it was its reflection sliding across water that had, he would have sworn, brightened to meet it. My office, Dumbledore said again, gently, whenever you find it convenient, and walked back up the hall, and if his stride was the same as ever, his hands, folded behind his back, were folded very tightly indeed. They did not find it convenient. It was the first time Harry had ever simply not gone, and the not going felt like a muscle he hadn't known he owned. That night in the common room emptied by packing, Hermione spread the two summonses on a table and anchored their corners with inkwells, and the two of them read every line another dozen times. "No guardian's consent is asked," she quoted. "The charter recognizes none above you. Do you understand what that sentence does? It's not being dramatic, it's citing law. Whatever this inheritance is, it comes with a legal standing that outranks everyone, the Dursleys, the ministry." A pause, deliberate. "The headmaster, bring the other to whom the water spoke," Harry said. "Not bring a witness, the other, like there's a set of two of something, and we're it." Hermione's fingers touched the older seal, the key in the branch, tracing without pressing. When she spoke again, it had the hush people keep for churches and hospitals. "Sirius wrote to me too, you know, this afternoon, care of a barn owl that looked like it had flown through a hedge. One line and no signature, but it was his handwriting." She recited from memory, eyes closed. "If Gringotts ever calls you under the old seal, go tell no one your hour, and take no one you would not trust with your life." Her eyes opened. He knew the seal on sight, Harry, on sight, from a one-line description. The Blacks are as old as families get, and whatever this is, it's old enough that even they only know to be afraid of it. The fire had burned down to a tectonic glow. Somewhere above them a floorboard ticked, the castle settling its ancient bones for one more night of the 1,400,000 nights it had kept. "Are you scared?" Harry asked. Hermione considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything that mattered, which was one of perhaps 10,000 things he did not know how to do without anymore. "Only of stopping," she said. The train, next morning, gave them one last hour of being nobody in particular. They shared a compartment with Ron and Neville, and for the first 50 miles the talk was mercifully ordinary. The Quidditch World Cup, and whether Mr. Weasley could really get tickets, and whether Trevor the Toad had achieved his personal best of 4 escapes in a single term, or whether the fourth had merely been Neville forgetting which pocket. Crookshanks slept on Hermione's lap like a rug with opinions. Rain came and went along the windows in grey sheets, and Scotland turned into the north of England without asking anyone's permission. It was Ron who finally said it, around a mouthful of cauldron cake. "So are we not talking about the Death Crow, or?" "We're not talking about it," said Hermione, "because we don't know anything yet. You know, it landed on Harry's pumpkin juice in front of the whole school. You know, Dumbledore looked like someone had switched his sherbet lemons for gravel." Ron ticked the points off on his fingers, and there was something under the jokes, a wire of hurt he was working hard to keep out of view. He hadn't asked why he wasn't included. Harry watched him decide visibly not to ask, and liked him enormously for it, and felt the unfairness of it anyway. "You know, Neville's gran wrote him a letter last night, an express letter about you two." Neville went red to the ears. "She wanted to know what I'd seen," he admitted. "The seal, mostly. She made me describe the seal twice." He hesitated, turning a chocolate frog card over and over without looking at it. "You should understand what it means, that she cared. Gran doesn't rattle. When Grey Tuncle Algae set the kitchen on fire, she finished her tea first. But I wrote back describing that key and branch, and her answer came by return owl, and all it said was, 'Tell Mr. Potter and Miss Granger that the House of Longbottom remembers its oaths, and that your great-great-grandfather kept a chair no one was allowed to sit in.'" He looked up. "We've got a chair like that at home, in the hall. It's older than the house. Nobody sits in it, and nobody has ever told me why, and I always thought it was just Gran, and now I don't think it's just Gran." The compartment had gone quiet in the particular manner of a place where something true has been set down among the sandwich wrappers. "A chair," Harry said. "Carved oak leaves," said Neville, "all up the arms," and watched what that did to both their faces with an expression that said it confirmed something for him too. Hermione recovered first. She always recovered first. It was one of the things Harry had stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. Neville. "If your gran remembers oaths, other families will too." "Which families?" "Think who else keeps things they can't explain. Chairs, empty rooms, toasts to names nobody recognizes. The Bones, for certain, the Abbotts, us." Neville counted the way his gran must have taught him, thumb first. "The Ollivanders' gran always says, though they're trade, not gentry, she says it like it matters." And he pulled a face, apologetic. "The Malfoys keep something, nobody knows what. Gran says the difference between old families is whether they kept their oaths or kept the loot, and she says it looking south, if you follow me." "And that," said Ron, whose strategic brain woke up whenever the world resolved into sides, "is the whole game, isn't it? Whatever you two have got, everyone with a chair in the hall is going to want to know which kind of family you'll think they are." He leaned back, hands behind his head, considering the pair of them with a frankness he usually saved for chess. "For what it's worth, the Weasleys haven't got any mysterious furniture. We've got a clock that worries about us. That's the whole inheritance." A shrug, elaborately casual. "But you'll want people around who liked you before you were whatever you're about to be. I'm just saying I've got seniority." Noted, Harry said, and the word came out rougher than he planned, and Ron nodded once and looked out the window, transaction complete, nothing further owed on either side. Crookshanks stretched, resettled, and put one proprietary paw on Harry's knee. The matter of who belonged to whom had been settled long ago and required only occasional renewal of the paperwork. The rain gave out around Peterborough. The sun came through in long yellow blades, and the four of them played, exploding snap the rest of the way south, and if the game was louder than it needed to be, and if nobody mentioned crows again, that was its own kind of friendship, the kind that knows exactly when to stand guard over an hour of being 14. The Hogwarts Express ran its long red thread south through a country that did not know what was riding on it, and at 4:30 King's Cross received them in its usual thunder of steam and trolleys and reuniting families. The Grangers were waiting past the barrier, Hermione's father broad and quiet in a corduroy jacket that had outlived several prime ministers, her mother trim and quick-eyed with a folded map of London already in one hand. Hermione went into their arms and Harry hung back, as he always hung back at stations, in the manner of someone who has learned that arrivals are things that happen to other people. Then Mrs. Granger looked over her daughter's head and said, "You must be Harry. We're parked terribly illegally, so you'll have to tell us about yourself in the car," in exactly the tone she might have used with an old family friend, and Harry discovered that arrivals could, on occasion, reach out and include a person whether he had planned to be included or not. They knew. Hermione had written ahead, pages of it, evidently a document with numbered sections, and there had been, her father said dryly as he maneuvered the rover out into the traffic, a family congress on the subject. 2 dentists, 1 daughter, and a summons from a goblin bank regarding an inheritance nobody died to leave her. He found Harry's eyes in the mirror. In our world, when a bank you've never banked with writes to a 14-year-old about money, you ring the fraud line. I gather your world runs differently. Their world, said Hermione, runs on things being older than the explanations for them. Yes, well, Mr. Granger changed gear with the gravity of a man setting a bone. So does dentistry, frankly. A beat. We're coming in with you as far as they'll allow. That was the Congress's binding resolution. Whatever the letter says about not needing guardians, your children, the pair of you, and someone whose whole job is loving you ought to be standing in that building while it happens. Harry looked out the window at London going by, at the ordinary miracle of a million people who had never been summoned by anything, and it took a while before he trusted himself to say, "Thanks." "For what?" said Mrs. Granger. "The parking will be even more illegal at the bank." Gringotts at 6 in the evening was a cathedral at low tide, its marble acreage nearly empty, its counters manned by tellers whose interest in closing time was visibly devout. But they had barely crossed the threshold when a goblin unlike the tellers came to meet them. Older, broader, dressed not in bank livery but in blackened mail over grey wool, with a ring of keys at his belt so ancient that several were plainly for locks that no longer existed anywhere in the world, kept the way old soldiers keep medals. "Sharprock," the goblin said without bowing because goblins do not bow, but he did something with his fist against his mailed chest that landed in the same place a bow lands. "Keeper of the deep vaults, you came quickly, that speaks well." His black eyes went to the Grangers and performed a swift, unoffended audit. "The parents of the summoned, you may descend to the antechamber of the deep and no further, and I will tell you honestly, the no further is not the bank's rudeness. Past the antechamber, the magic itself dislikes any blood it has not called. It has been known to express the dislike." "Expressed how?" asked Mr. Granger, in the exact tone he used for asking patients about their flossing. "Memorably," said Sharprock. The cart ride down was longer than any Harry had taken, past the dragon-scorched crossroads of the deep vaults, past falls of black water, down through strata of worked stone that gave way, at some frontier no sign marked, to stone that had never been worked at all but had simply agreed at some point before agriculture to be a corridor. The air changed. It stopped tasting of rock and started tasting of weather, which was impossible at that depth. Rain on a hillside, cold heather, the specific green smell of the world after storms. The antechamber was a dome of that consenting stone, lit by veins of the same slow silver that had run through the dream table's wood, and there the Grangers stopped, because a line of light on the floor made it courteously, absolutely clear where guests ended. Mrs. Granger took Hermione's face briefly in both hands. She said nothing at all, which from her was a whole speech, and stepped back over the line. Beyond the antechamber a passage opened into a round chamber, and in the center of the round chamber stood a stone. It was not carved, it was not polished. It was a rough-standing stone the height of a man, of no rock Harry could name, and the instant he saw it he stopped hearing the drip of water and the shuffle of feet, because the stone was full. That was the word his body supplied, full the way a struck bell is full, one long moment before the sound gets out. "The inheritance stone," said Sharprock, and his harsh voice had shed its irony the way a man sheds a coat at a graveside. "Wizards think Gringotts began as a bank." Gringotts began as a garrison, and this is what we were set to guard, in a bargain struck before your ministry, before your statute, before your Hogwarts had all four of its towers. We have kept the door 1400 years. His eyes, black and bright, went from Harry to Hermione. The bargain permits me to tell you nothing before the stone tells you itself. It asks a drop of blood, freely given from each. I am required to say that you may refuse, and to tell you that in 14 centuries one summoned heir refused. A pause precisely measured. The stone does not punish refusal. History did. That tale is in our archive if you ever wish to lose sleep. Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry. It was not a long look, and no one watching would have found it dramatic. It was the look two people exchange over a chessboard when both can see mate in four, the future briefly visible and shared and accepted. Together, then, Hermione said. There was a ledge on the stone at the height of a hand, worn into a shallow base not by tools but by repetition, by centuries of exactly this. Sharprock offered a knife with a blade of black glass. The cut was nothing, a bead of red on a fingertip. They pressed their hands side by side into the waiting basin. The stone drank. And the mountain sang, not metaphor. The note came up out of the floor and through the soles of their shoes, and it was in the water of them, in the marrow, one vast tectonic tone. The whole sleeping mass of stone from there to the surface had been a bell all along, waiting for a striker small enough. The silver veins in the walls went bright as burning wire. Down the passage in the antechamber, the Grangers heard it and gripped each other, and in the marble halls far above the tellers heard it and stopped counting, and though none of them could have said how they knew, every goblin in the fortress lifted his head at the same instant like a field of grass touched by one wind. Words rose on the standing stone. They did not glow into being. They surfaced the way a drowned thing surfaces, ancient letterforms pushing up through the skin of the rock, first in the old tongue and then shivering, resolving into English as though the stone were extending, for the occasion, an enormous courtesy. Harry James Potter blood of the line of EMRYS through PVRELL, through Potter WGHED by the compact and found to answer elect of the oaken seat, heir of Merlin. The tone deepened. A second surfacing began beside the first. Hermione Jean GRENGER blood of the line of Ellie Fay, through 9 centuries sleeping, the line that went quiet and never went out WIGHED by the compact and found to answer elect of the THORNWOOD seat, heir of MORGANA. Silence came down like snow. Hermione was reading her own name over and over, her lips moving on 9 centuries sleeping, and there were tears on her face that she had not noticed and would have been annoyed about, and Harry stood with the word Merlin filling his vision and felt the strangest thing, and the strangest thing was this, no disbelief. He searched for it dutifully, the old reflex, there's been a mistake, it can't mean me, and found the reflex gone, dissolved, because something at the very back of him, some tenant older than his memories, had risen at the sound of that tectonic bell and was standing at attention and had always known. The line that went quiet, Hermione whispered, Squibs. It went through Squibs and then through Muggles, generation after generation, all the way down to, she turned to him, and her face was doing several things at once, and grief was nowhere among them. Harry, every single person who ever called me Mudblood was insulting the granddaughter of Morgana Le Fay. They're going to be so upset, Harry said with feeling. The sound she made was half laughter and half something with no name, and it echoed strangely in that ancient room, brightly, welcomed, the stone having waited 1400 years partly for the singing and partly for exactly this, 2 children laughing where the compact was made. Sharprock had gone to one knee. Not in servility, for nothing about him was servile and his spine could have taught masonry, but formally, deliberately, his fist to his chest, and behind him, at the chamber's rim, other goblins had appeared, guards and keepers, and one bent ancient in robes, all of them down on one knee, all of them fist to chest, their eyes not lowered but raised, fixed on the 2 of them with a fierce black shining. We do not kneel to wizards, Sharprock said. Understand that before anything else is said. We have never knelt to wizards, and we never shall, and every rebellion your histories mention was fought over exactly that point. His voice rolled around the stone dome, harsh as a millstone and thoroughly, terribly glad. We kneel to the compact, to the peace of the 2 courts, which was the only bargain wizards ever struck with us as equals and the only one they never broke, because they forgot it existed before they got the chance. 1400 years we kept the door. 1400 years of chieftains telling their sons, it matters though no one comes, and now, he rose and the ring of ancient keys sang at his belt. Now the oaken seat and the thornwood seat have blood in them again, and everything sleeping under Britain is about to remember why it slept lightly. From a case borne by the bent ancient, he took 2 rings. They were not rich. That was the first thing Harry saw, and the sight rearranged something in him. No goblin-wrought gold, no gemstones. A band of pale iron, plain as a nail, worked with a single line of oak leaf so worn it was nearly memory. A band of old silver, black in its recesses, carved with a running thread of blackthorn. They lay on Sharprock's calloused palm, looking like exactly what they were. Things 2 real people had actually worn in actual weather a very long time ago while doing work that mattered more than how it looked. The signet of Emrise, the signet of Lefay, they are not crowns, Sharprock said. Crowns come later and dearer, these are the keys. If they accept you, every door of the old compact opens to your hand, vault and archive, hall and aisle. If they refuse you, he shrugged with the massive calm of the very old. Then the stone was wrong, which has never happened, and we shall all have an interesting evening. The rings did not refuse. The iron band slid onto Harry's finger and warmed, not like metal in the sun, but like a hand closing around his. A grip, calm and enormous, the same grip he had felt in the dream man's gaze. For one heartbeat the deep chamber was gone, and he stood on a green hill under racing clouds with the weight of a sword at his back and the whole island unrolled below him like a sleeping child, his to watch, his to warden, Anwelid, beloved. And then the chamber returned, and the ring sat on his hand like a thing grown there. Beside him Hermione drew one slow breath as the silver touched her, and the silver drank the light and gave it back changed, and in her face was the look of someone shown at last the far shelf of the library, the one all the other shelves had been fed by, the one no one had believed was real. Deep in the stone the great tone sounded once more, quietly now, a bell rung by a friend in passing. On the surface of the lake at Hogwarts, 400 miles north, light bloomed and faded in slow rings for no reason the merfolk could find, and the giant squid rose and turned its old body toward the south. And in a tower office, a silver instrument that had spun peaceably for 13 years went abruptly, permanently still, and Albus Dumbledore set down his quill in the ringing quiet and looked at the little dead machine for a long time, and then went slowly to the case where he kept a sealed folio marked EMRYS in a hand that predated his tenure, and broke a seal he had sworn once that he would never have caused to break. In the chamber of the stone, Sharprock clasped his hands behind his back. "The seats have been asleep for 14 centuries, he said. "You have just woken every power in Britain that remembers why. Some will kneel, some will scheme. One or two, I expect, will be afraid in ways that make old men do foolish things." His black eyes glittered. "Gringotts will stand where it has always stood, at the door." "Then you can start," said Hermione, and her voice wobbled once on the first word and steadied on all the rest by opening the next one. Two rings threw back the silver light, iron and thorn, oak and shadow. 1400 years of waiting ended on the hands of two children who had come down into the dark holding nothing but each other's trust, and who would walk back up into the world holding everything else. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, The Inheritance of Stone and Star. They went back down 2 days later, and this time the descent did not stop at the Chamber of the Stone. Sharprock led them past it, through a door that had not existed on the first visit, or rather, Harry corrected himself, watching the seam of it close behind them like water healing over a thrown coin, a door that had declined to exist for anyone else. The passage beyond went down at the patient gradient of a thing built by people who measured time in reigns. Silver veined the walls here too, but thicker in broad slow rivers now, and Harry realized after 100 yards that the light was keeping pace with them, brightening just ahead, dimming just behind, a courtesy of illumination and escort. "The bank above us takes deposits," Sharprock said as they walked. His voice had the easy roll of a guide on home ground, but his hand, Harry noticed, never left the ring of ancient keys. "This place is not the bank. This place is what the bank was built on top of, the way you humans build cathedrals on wells. We are passing under the deepest dragon pens now. The dragons will not rest tonight. They know their landlords are home." Hermione, who had brought a notebook, because of course she had given up on it by the third turning and just walked, eyes everywhere. "The table's here," she said. "It wasn't a question. The one from the dream, that's where you're taking us." "The table," Sharprock agreed, "and what sits on it and what waits beside it. The dream showed you because the dream is the antechamber. Everything true arrives first as a dream and then as an appointment." He glanced back at them, black eyes glinting in the walking light. "Goblin proverb, loses something in translation. In the original it rhymes and is filthy." The passage ended in doors of black oak bound with the pale iron of Harry's ring, 30 feet high, without handle or lock or keyhole, and Sharprock stood aside with the air of a man who has finished the part of the journey that belongs to him. They looked at each other. Then, because there was clearly no other way, and because the rings on their hands had begun to warm like held hands, Harry and Hermione each laid a palm against the wood. The doors knew them. There was no boom, no grinding of hinges. The doors opened the way morning opens, gradually then completely, with the enormous gentleness of the truly heavy, and the hall beyond took the breath out of them both and held it in trust for a while. It was round and it was vast. The great hall of Hogwarts could have parked itself in the middle and been a table decoration. And its ceiling was not enchanted to look like the sky. The distinction mattered, and they both felt it at once. The ceiling remembered the sky. Stars moved across it in their true courses, but they were the stars of another century, constellations subtly wrong. The sky as it had stood over Britain 1400 years ago, preserved the way pressed flowers are preserved, by someone who could not bear to lose the particular evening. Beneath that ancient light lay the table. The dream had been accurate, and the dream had been a postcard. 60 feet of single oak, one tree's whole biography in cross-section, its rings visible as tides of grain under the inlaid silver rivers, and the rivers moved, they truly moved, Tamar and Severn and Thames and space lighting their threads of light through the wood, a map of the island with no borders on it, only water. Chairs stood around it. Harry counted this time, 30, and then the two, oak and blackthorn, facing each other across the diameter like the poles of the world. On the table before the two chairs, under domes of light that were not glass, sat the regalia. Before the oak chair, a circlet of pale iron, unadorned except for one line of oak leaf running its circumference, and a sword in a scabbard of grey leather so plain it looked borrowed, and a rod of hazel the length of a forearm, worn shiny at one end by a large hand. Before the blackthorn chair, a circlet of black and silver wound in a pattern of thorn, and a knife, not a dagger, a knife, a tool, the kind of thing a healer or a midwife or a scholar might own, and a book bound in slate. An actual thin sheet of slate, hinged in silver, with nothing written on its cover at all, because, Harry understood in a wordless rush from the ring on his own finger, everyone who had ever mattered knew exactly what it was. Hermione had stopped 10 feet from the table and did not seem able to come closer. Her eyes were on the slate book with an expression Harry had seen only once before in the restricted section by lamplight, and that had been a candle to this bonfire. "The Warden Crown," said Sharprock quietly from the doorway he did not cross. "The Knight Crown, the sword Renfast that was drawn 9 times in 100 years, which its bearer counted 9 times too many. The knife Asclepian. The slate, which is the only book Morgana Le Fay ever wrote, and which unwrites itself for unworthy readers, and which has been blank now for 14 centuries. A pause. "You may look, you may not touch, not yet, and not because the bank forbids it." "Why then?" Harry asked. "Because a crown is the end of a road," said a new voice, "and you two have just found the trailhead." The voice came from the table, from above it, where the air over the silver rivers had gathered itself into light, and the light into shapes, and the shapes into a man of oaken storm and a woman of ink-stained stillness, exactly as the dream had rendered them, seated now in the two chairs as though the chairs had simply been waiting to be occupied in whatever way occupancy was still possible. They were not ghosts. Ghosts, Harry knew, having gone to school with several, were silvered and translucent and slightly sorry for themselves. These two had color and weight and cast shadows on the table, and yet the hall was visible through them at the edges, paintings at their edges whose paint had opinions about staying inside the lines. "Echoes," the woman said, following Hermione's stare with evident approval. "Not souls. Say it to yourself firmly, both of you, before the wanting starts. We are not them." When Merlin and Morgana knew their deaths were assembling, and deaths assemble children, they don't pounce. They each pressed an impression into the compact stone the way a seal presses wax. Everything they knew, the shapes of how they thought, what they'd once said to whoever came after. Her voice was the dream's voice, dry and low and ledgered. "The people are gone, gone entirely, gone where going goes. We are the letter they left on the table. It happens," and her mouth bent, "to be a very good letter." "You talk like her, though," Hermione said. Her own voice had gone careful. "You argue like you're used to winning." She did. "I do. The wax remembers the seal." The echo of Morgana Le Fay leaned forward, and the starlight moved on her ink-stained hands. "Come here, elect. Let me look at what 900 years of patience produced." Hermione crossed the distance. She stood before the blackthorn chair with her chin up and her hands deliberately unclasped at her sides, refusing to fidget, and the echo studied her without hurry, the way scholars read title pages, gathering what a thing will be about. "Muggle-born," the echo said at last. "Yes, they will have told you that word like a wound, even the kind ones, especially the kind ones." The echo rose from the chair, and though she was not tall, the rising had horizon in it. "Attend, because I will say this once, and then we will never be sentimental about it again. My line did not survive in spite of the quiet generations. It survived because of them. Magic is a fire, blood is a hearth. A fire kept roaring day and night for 9 centuries burns the house down. The old families are burning houses, girl. Squibs are how a line banks its coals." Her dark eyes came up, and there was something fierce and precise in them, the fierceness of a librarian defending a last copy. "Every generation they called nothing was a keeper of the fire. Your grandmothers tended you forward through 900 years of dark, and none of them knew it, and every one of them did it anyway, in habit, in stubbornness, in the way your family probably still does something odd with anniversaries or first names or Sunday walks and cannot say why." Hermione's hands were no longer at her sides. Were pressed flat together in front of her mouth, prayer-shaped, which was a thing she did when the alternative was crying in front of someone she intended to impress. "First names," she said, muffled, and lowered the hands. "The women in Mum's family, there's always a gene. Great-grandmother, grandmother, Mum's middle name, my middle name. Nobody knows why, it's just done. Mum says her gran used to say you don't break a chain you didn't make." The echo of Morgana Le Fay closed her eyes for a moment. "Siond," she said. "My daughter's name was Siond. It went to English as Janet, and Janet goes to Jean." She opened her eyes. "You did not break the chain. Welcome home." At the other side of the table, unnoticed by either of them, the echo of Merlin had risen too and come around the curve of oak to stand across from Harry, who had watched all of it with an ache under his ribs that he could not have named under torture and did not want to. "And you," Merlin's echo said, "the wolf's winter." The Peveril's stubbornness all the way down through the Potters, who never once in 7 centuries did what the smart money advised. The echo looked at him, or through him, at whatever was written on the far side of him, and what settled on the echo's face was not the appraisal from the dream. It was recognition, and under the recognition an old sorrow shifting in its sleep. "You grew in a cold house. Don't flinch, Warden, it's on you like weather marks on a fence post. I read timber, it's the trade." "Cupboard was it, or attic?" "Cupboard," Harry said. The word came out level, which cost him something. Cupboard. The echo of the greatest wizard who had ever lived was silent for the space of 3 of those wrong century stars slow wheeling. "I was a fatherless boy in a town that threw stones," he said at last. "The magic came up in me like a spring in a cellar in the dark, unwelcome, and I thought for years it was one more thing wrong with me. So attend, as she says, and I too will say it once." He set both hands on the table between them, and the silver rivers bent toward his hands, all of them, the whole island's water leaning like iron filings to a lodestone. "The old magic is not power the way they'll have taught you power. Not force, not fireworks, not the biggest wand. The old magic is a covenant. Land, water, oath, and keeping. It answers need before it answers strength, and it answers love before either, and that is why it woke for a boy on a lake shore who wanted nothing for himself, nothing in that whole drowning dark except for the people he loved to live." The rivers flared gently the length of the table. "They will call you king before this is done. Let them if it's useful. Kings are a story people tell to keep from being afraid at night. But between us at this table know what the word under king is. The word is keeper. You kept your godfather alive on that shore. Everything else is scale." The hall held its held breath. Somewhere far above, in another world, a dragon shifted in its sleep and dreamed of open sky. Now, Merlin's echo straightened, and the sorrow folded itself away, and something brisker took the chair of his face, the schoolmaster arriving in the room where the friend had been. "Sharprock will have told you, look, don't touch, correct. The crown's judge, and you are not yet anything a crown could weigh without tipping. That is not insult, it is the schedule. You have the rings open the doors. Behind one particular door is an island, and on the island we can teach, not everything. The letter is not the sender, but enough. The old tongue, the wards, the law under the law." His eyes went from Harry to Hermione and back, taking in visibly the small space between where they stood, which was the same space it always was, the space of 2 people accustomed to standing within reach of each other. "One term of instruction before all else, though, and I give it to you now standing so you'll remember it standing. Look at each other." They did, half-turning, uncertain, Hermione's eyebrow at the angle that meant if this is a lesson it had better land. "Imrise and Le Fay were never friends," the echo of Merlin said. "You'll hear ballads that say lovers, chronicles that say enemies, both are gossip. We were 2 absolutes who fought a war so terrible the island itself petitioned for peace, and the compact we sealed was not a treaty. Treaties break, it was a braid, order and craft, keeping and knowing. 2 magics wound so tight around each other that neither could be turned against the other's people ever again, and the braid holds children to this day. It is the deepest law of magical Britain, and the whole of your ministry is a moss growing on its surface. We built it because we did not trust each other." The echo's voice dropped, and the hall leaned in to hear it. "You 2 are something else. The stone weighed you the night the lake woke, weighed you together, twinned casting, her magic and yours like a stream into a river, and in 1400 years of keeping this door, the stone has never once elected a pair that arrived already braided." He looked at them, boy and girl, ring and ring, standing in the space they always stood in. "We armored this island against our own enmity. What it might do in the hands of an actual friendship, neither of us ever lived to learn. You are not just heirs. You are the experiment we didn't dare run. Silence, starlight, the slow silver of rivers." "No pressure," said Hermione faintly. And the echo of Morgana Le Fay laughed, a startled, rusty, magnificent sound, 1400 years out of practice, and the stars of the wrong century glittered overhead, and at the door of the hall Sharprock, keeper of the deep vaults, permitted himself the first smile of his professional life. The business half of the inheritance took 3 hours in a room above the deep, at a table of ordinary size with tea, and it rearranged the world more thoroughly than the Hall of Stars had. Sharprock laid out documents the way generals lay out maps. The estate of the oaken seat, the estate of the thornwood seat. I will summarize because the full schedules run to 19 volumes and 2 of them bite. He tapped the first parchment. "Liquid holdings, both seats combined. I will not say the figure aloud because the walls of this room are old and I am not certain they are entirely done gossiping. I will write it down." He wrote it down. Mr. Granger, who had been permitted this far, the antechamber of paperwork, Sharprock had said, is open to all guardians. The magic respects a parent with a pen. Looked at the figure, took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and looked again. "That's more than the Bank of England," he said. "The Bank of England," said Sharprock, "is 300 years old. This trust has been compounding since before the Danes. Money is the least of what is in these schedules, and I encourage you to treat it accordingly. Nothing rots a keeper faster than thinking the vault is the point. He slid the parchment aside like a plate of crumbs, and his voice changed, took on edge, the voice of a creature arriving at the part of the meeting he had been looking forward to for a very long career. Now, land, offices, and standing, this is the point. The list was long and strange and grew stranger. More land in 3 counties, the bed of a river, the bed, Sharprock emphasized, not the banks. The distinction had once mattered enormously in a dispute with a king. 90-mile chains of wardline walked and renewed by hired feet for 60 generations, invoiced annually to a ministry that had long ago stopped asking what the invoices were for. An orchard in Somerset that appeared on no map, which fruits, Sharprock said without inflection, when it chooses and for whom it chooses, and the fruit is outside my professional scope. An island in a lock with no name that could be written down, of which more shortly, because the token is in this box and it is impatient. And Hogwarts, he finished, sits on conquered land. The tea went cold while he explained it. The castle's founders, and this was in the Goblin Archive in hands that had watched it happen, had petitioned the 2 seats, then only 4 centuries vacant and still administered in living memory of the compact, for a grant of the most defensible magical ground in the north. The grant survived. The school's whole legal existence was a tenancy, peppercorn rent, 1 acorn and 1 sloe, delivered each lammas to a vault that has not been open to receive them in 1,000 years. We keep the acorns, there's a room of acorns I will show you someday, and the tenancy had conditions. Protection of the children within, regardless of blood, preservation of the wards. And a clause Sharprock read aloud twice, once in the old tongue and once in English, rolling it like a boiled sweet. Should the seats be filled again, the keys of the castle answer first to the compact, and the castle knows it, whatever the castellan may believe. The castellan, Hermione said slowly, currently being the Board of Governors. The castellan currently believing itself to be the Board of Governors, Sharprock corrected with relish, advised by a headmaster who also holds the chief warlockship of a Wisengamot, which is itself, and here we arrive at my favorite paragraph in 14 centuries of contract law, a tenant. He laid down the final parchment as gently as a man laying down a winning hand. The Wisengamot was chartered as the Regency Moot of the Pendragon Conquered, a caretaker committee. Its founding oath, which every member still swears in a formula they no longer understand, binds it to administer until the seats be filled. Wizards have a genius for forgetting the terms of their own tenancy. It is, professionally speaking, our favorite thing about you. He looked up and his black eyes were bright as a crow's. The seats are filled. Nothing in magical Britain is quite what it was on Tuesday, and nearly no one knows it yet. I recommend you use the quiet. Quiet, in my experience, is the only inheritance that cannot be restored once spent. Mr. Granger cleared his throat. You're describing my 14-year-old daughter as the freeholder of the British magical state. Co-freeholder, said Sharprock. With respect, keep up. They used the quiet. It was Mrs. Granger who made the arrangement in the Grangers' kitchen in Hampstead, with the calm executive efficiency she otherwise reserved for double-booked surgeries. Harry would stay. Not visit, stay the summer through, the spare room with the good window, and she said it exactly like a scheduling matter, which was the kindest possible way to say it. And Harry, who had braced for the return to privet drive the way you brace for cold water, found himself instead unpacking his trunk into an actual chest of drawers, while Hedwig staked a claim to the garden bird bath and Crookshanks supervised from the wall. Sirius's letter of consent arrived by the hedge-battered barn owl, and it was formally a legal document. I, as godfather and by right of the blood guardianship of the House of Black, do place Harry James Potter for the summer in the care of the family Granger, and informally an explosion of joy that scorched the margins. Ha 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 ha, a house with BOOKS and dentists and no walrus. Padfoot approves. Padfoot will visit when the heat is off. Padfoot is currently somewhere with excellent weather and terrible fleas, and never you mind. The house itself did the rest of the persuading. It was a tall, thin Edwardian terrace with bookshelves in the hallway, actual bookshelves in an actual hallway, so that you could not get from the front door to the kitchen without passing 2,000 spines, and Harry spent his first week there learning its liturgy. Breakfast was at 7:30 and came with the radio and 3 separate arguments about the crossword. Shoes lived in a rack and nobody checked whether you'd cleaned them. If you were reading at the table, meals happened around the book, a doctrine Hermione had evidently established in infancy and defended since like a boarder. On Wednesdays, Mr. Granger cooked, which meant curry from an annotated recipe card, and everyone ate, pretending the annotations were improvements. No one shouted. That was the thing Harry kept walking into like a glass door. The first time he dropped a mug, a good mug, it burst on the kitchen tiles in the old sickening way, and his whole body did its privet drive arithmetic, shoulders in, apology first, brace. Mrs. Granger looked over from the sink and said, dustpans under the stairs. The tiles have killed better mugs than that one, and went back to the washing up. He stood there a moment with his ears roaring, then he got the dustpan. Nobody ever mentioned it again, and he lay awake a while that night, turning the whole event over, prodding it for the trap, before concluding there wasn't one and sleeping 9 hours without dreaming. Mr. Granger taught him tea the way other men taught sons to shave. Warm the pot, no, warm it, don't wave the kettle at it, hopefully. Loose leaf, 1 spoon per person and none for the pot. Whatever your godfather's family did, we're not made of money. 4 minutes. You may do quadratic equations while you wait, but you may not touch the lid. It became theirs that quarter hour before the women surfaced, the kitchen full of steam and the world's service, and it was over the second or third pot that Mr. Granger said, without looking up from the paper, "You sleep with your trainers by the bed," pointed at the door. "My father did that. He'd had the kind of childhood where a fellow might need to leave in a hurry." He turned a page. "You're 14 and richer than the crown, I'm told, so I won't embarrass either of us with a speech. I'll say the one thing and we'll drink our tea. Nobody leaves this house in a hurry. The door works from the inside, always has. Point the trainers wherever you like." Harry looked into his cup for a while. The tea was exactly the color it was supposed to be because he had made it properly in a house that assumed he would still be there tomorrow. 4 minutes, he said. Never touch the lid. "There's my lad," said Mr. Granger, and shook out the sports section, and that was the whole conversation, and it held Harry up like load-bearing masonry for the rest of his life. Hermione, for her part, watched the two of them colonize each other with a satisfaction she was careful to keep off her face, and a thoroughness she kept nowhere because she was still herself. By mid-July she had produced a summer curriculum with color-coded blocks, IEL, Old Tongue, Concord Law, actual homework, THUI still set IT, Harry, and pinned it inside the pantry door where the shopping list normally went. Her mother studied it over her reading glasses. "You've scheduled him for the dentist," Mrs. Granger observed. "He's never been, I checked, 13 years, Mum." "So you've entered the Heir of Merlin," said Mrs. Granger, with the level delivery of a woman who had spent 3 weeks getting her mouth around the sentence, for a scale and polish on the 9th. "Being magical royalty," said Hermione, "is not an excuse for plaque," and from the garden where he was failing to teach Hedwig and Crookshanks a truce, they heard Harry laugh, an unguarded, teenaged, entirely unfamous sound, and mother and daughter looked at each other over the reading glasses, and neither said the obvious thing that the sound was new, that he had arrived without it and found it in their house because saying it might have frightened it off. He went to the appointment. His teeth were pronounced a testament to neglect meeting luck. He was given a sticker on the way out by the receptionist, who had no idea who he was, and he wore it on his jumper for 3 days, DNTSTIC, until it gave out at the corners, and Hermione had the enormous tact to make fun of him about it only twice. The wards at Privet Drive noticed the emptiness within a week. They were keyed to the idea of home, and ideas are honest even when the people who cast them are not, and number 4 had never once been home in the sense the old magic used the word. The blood protection had been running for 13 years on technicality, and topping itself up each summer from Harry's presence like a meter fed with reluctant coins. Deprived of the coin, it did not fail. It simply told the truth at last, and the truth traveled up the fine silver thread that connected it to an instrument in a Tower office in Scotland. Albus Dumbledore arrived on Privet Drive on the last evening of June, in a suit of sober grey, and stood a while at the gate of number 4. The instrument had not lied. He could feel it from the pavement, the wards not fallen but hollow, a shell with the snail gone, humming on stored purpose. Through the front window he could see the Dursleys at their television, none of them aware that anything protecting anyone had ever attached to their address, none of them missing the boy whose absence had unstitched it. He had known, of course, that it was a cold house. He had chosen it cold. Cold, he had reasoned, and he made himself use the accurate verb, reasoned. He had reasoned it at this gate 13 years ago, with the child asleep in the crook of his own arm. Cold would keep the fame from souring the boy, would make Hogwarts a rescue and its headmaster a rescuer, would keep the roots shallow enough for transplanting when the transplanting came. There was a plan, and the plan required a boy who would go where he was led, and at the end, when the terrible arithmetic of the scar came due, would not hold his own life too dear to lay it down. The plan had not required a lake to wake. The plan had certainly not required Gringotts and rings and a sealed folio whose contents he had spent 4 nights failing to fully translate, and a word in the old tongue spoken by a crow in his own great hall, nage, no, flat refusal, ancient jurisdiction addressed to him. Mrs. Figg's report lay folded in his pocket. Subject not returned, cats have nothing. Petunia put the cupboard things in a skip on Tuesday. The cupboard things. He stood at the gate a moment longer. Then Albus Dumbledore, who had been many great things for so long that even he could no longer easily count which had come first, the greatness or the certainty, walked away down the ordinary pavement, and to the man watering roses at number 6 he was just an odd old gentleman in grey, and in his own mind he was composing, with genuine tenderness and genuine grief and a genuine, bottomless unwillingness to examine either. A letter to Molly Weasley about the importance of keeping Harry grounded among true friends this summer. He did not go to Hampstead. He told himself it was restraint. Truth, which he kept in the same locked drawer as the folio, was that he had gone once already the day after the bank, had stood across the road under a disillusionment at twilight, and had watched through a lit kitchen window as the boy who lived dried dishes while a dentist washed them, the two of them laughing at something lost to the glass, a bushy-haired girl at the table annotating a goblin contract with 3 colors of ink, and a silence had come over the watcher of a kind that instruments do not measure. The boy had looked in the frame of that window like the end of a plan. The token was a coin of gray metal with a hole through it, threaded on a leather cord, and it did not work like a portkey, though Sharprock had run out of patience with explaining the difference. A portkey moves you. The token asks the isle whether it is willing to be arrived at. It has never said no to a keyed hand. It has said not yet twice in recorded history, both times correctly, as the funerals demonstrated. On the first Saturday of July in the Granger's back garden between the birdbath and the compost, Harry and Hermione put their hands together around the coin and the garden folded. There was no hook behind the navel, no whirl. The world simply turned a page. Mist first, then the mist opening down a long aisle the way fog opens on water when a boat commits to heading, and the lock lying gray-silver under a sky moving fast and clean in the aisle. It was not large. That was the first surprise. After the Hall of Stars they had braced for a mile of towers. It was a green island you could walk around in an hour, rising to a single hill, and on the hill an orchard, and under the orchard a long low house of dry stone roofed in turf, and everywhere that sense from the deep passage of light escorting, the grass attentive underfoot, the air introducing itself, the whole place turned toward them the way a room full of family turns when the door opens at Christmas. Apple trees in July should not stand in blossom and in fruit at once. These did without apology. "Unease a falech," said the echo of Merlin, who was leaning against the gatepost of the orchard as though he had been leaning there since the heptarchy, which was possibly the case. Away from the deep hall he looked more solid, not less. Here the light came up through the ground into him, landlord's privilege, the Isle of Apples. Avalon, the ballads say, and then they put it in the west, in the sea, at the bottom of a lake in France, anywhere but here, which was the point of paying the balladeers. The last true ground of the old magic. Every ward I ever raised is anchored through this rock. He pushed off the gatepost and looked at them, keyed hand, and behind him down the aisle of blossoming, fruiting trees, the echo of Morgana straightened from where she knelt in an actual physical herb bed with actual dirt on her impossible hands, because some letters left on some tables go on doing the gardening. "Well," Merlin's echo said, "school's open, who's first?" They took to it the way parched ground takes rain, and the isle taught them all July, not spells. That was the reorientation that took the first week. The old magic had no spells, in the wand-and-syllable sense they had been drilled in. It had the old tongue in which a word did not represent a thing but presented it, and could not be spoken falsely. The tongue physically declined to lie, which Morgana's echo observed, watching Hermione discover this by trying to say a polite untruth about Merlin's singing was why it had died. A language in which no one can lie is a language no court, no church, and no ministry will ever teach its children. It didn't fall out of use, girl, it was starved. Harry's aptitude announced itself at the shoreline, the second Saturday. Merlin's echo had him stand in the shallows and say to the lock the word for still, not command it, say it, offer the fact of stillness for the water's consideration, and Harry got the word right on the 4th try, and the lock went silent from shore to shore, a plate of gray glass a mile wide, so suddenly and so completely that a heron a quarter mile out fell over. "Ward song," the echo said while Harry stared at what he'd done, and the heron rearranged its dignity. "The warden's whole craft in one seed, you do not push the world. You remind it of a shape it already loves and stand surety that the shape will be kept. That is all a ward is, a promise the land has decided to believe. It answered you fast." The echo's eyes narrowed with the pleasure of a diagnosis confirmed. "It would. You've been standing surety for people since you could walk. Now you'll learn to do it for a hillside, then a watershed, then." He nodded across the loch, at the world in general, at the island of Britain lying out there beyond the mist, whatever ends up needing it. Hermione's announcement came indoors, at the long slate-flagged table in the stone house, where Morgana's echo taught what she flatly refused to call anything but the craft. "True seeing first. Everything else in my half of the braid stands on it. Transformation is just seeing what a thing wants to become. Unmaking is seeing the seam where a made thing was joined. Healing is seeing the shape the body is homesick for. See truly, and the rest is bookkeeping." She set on the table a goblet, a river stone, and a dented tin soldier from some lost century, and told Hermione to look at them until they consented to be looked at. It took 3 days. On the 3rd day Hermione went quiet in the middle of the afternoon, and then said in an odd flattened voice, "The goblet is lying. Go on. It says it's silver. It's not. It's iron under a glamour. No, under a it's not a glamour. It's a story. Someone told it was silver so hard that it's been repeating the story for centuries. But the iron is still there. The iron is what's true. And the story is wearing thin at the stem where hands touched it, because," she looked up and her eyes were not entirely her own for a second. They had depth of field no 14-year-old's eyes had earned, because truth comes through where things are loved. That's how she broke wards. That's how she did all of it. Nothing can lie forever to someone who can see what's underneath the telling. Nothing, agreed the echo of Morgana Le Fay, and no one, and she took the goblet away and did not give the lesson's application any name at all, and looked at her 1400 years younger heir with the contained ferocity of a woman watching a fire she had banked 9 centuries ago catch. At last, the new wood. The braid, though, the braid was the thing. They discovered it by accident, the way the important things kept insisting on arriving. A squall came up the loch one evening in the last week of July while Harry held a practice ward over the jetty. A real squall, the Isle's own weather declining to coddle him, and the ward song began to fray at the edges of his holding, and Hermione, sitting on the jetty steps with the slate's first unlocked page open on her knees, looked up and saw the fraying, saw it truly, the exact seam where his promise met the water's doubt, and said so. Just that, said the seam aloud in the old tongue in her precise, unhesitating way. The ward took her words like a graft takes a stem. It closed the fraying and rooted and held, and it changed pitch as it held from one voice to something chorded, and the squall broke around the jetty like water around a standing stone, and both echoes came out of the house into the flying spray and stood watching, and were for once silent. The cord hung on over the water after the rain had passed. It did not want to end, and they did not want to end it, boy and girl soaked to the skin and grinning at each other like idiots on a jetty at the edge of the world. 14 centuries, said Merlin's echo at length, to no one in particular. To the letter writer he was an echo of, to the woman beside him who was, and was not the woman he had built an island with. We wound the braid against hatred, and it took us a war to learn the winding. These two do it wet laughing in an evening because neither of them thought to ask whether it was hard. I heard the pitch, said Morgana's echo. Her ink-stained hands were folded. 2 keepings, 1 promise. Write it in the record, keeper. For Sharprock had come up from the vault door among the roots that only he used and stood on the shingle with his ledger already open. The compact has its answer to the question we never dared ask it. Note the date. The braid holds truer in friendship than it ever held in fear, Sharprock wrote. The last light came long and gold down the loch, and the apple trees stood in blossom and in fruit, and far to the south, in a tower office, a letter to Molly Weasley lay sealed and franked on the corner of a desk on which a folio marked EMRYS lay open at a page whose final line the headmaster of Hogwarts had at last, that afternoon, rendered out of the old tongue, and had been sitting motionless before ever since. While his untouched supper cooled and Fawkes the Phoenix watched him from the perch with a fixed, unblinking, waiting eye. The line read, "The crowns judge all who reach for them, and all who reach for those who reach." At midnight the Phoenix left the window and did not sing as he went, and the going was noted by exactly no one except the castle itself, which had been paying very close attention to everything lately, and had begun, in the deep habitual dark of its foundations, where the oldest wards ran down into conquered stone, to hum. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Seats older than the Wisengamot, the quiet lasted until the 2nd week of August, and it was killed by a junior archivist named Bertram Pillywhickle for 11 galleons, and a promotion he never got. Pillywhickle worked in the Ministry's Office of Hereditary Registration, a department so dusty that its 3 employees measured their careers in geological time, and it was he who processed, without reading it, the formal notice of election that Gringotts was required under the Deep Charter to lodge with the Regency, and he who, 3 days later, mentioned over a lunchtime pint that the goblins had filed something with 2 seals he'd never seen before, and the word EMRYS on it in letters that wouldn't hold still. The man he mentioned it to bought the next round and asked questions with the practiced tenderness of a prophet stringer, and on Thursday morning the owls went out to every doorstep in magical Britain with a front page that used the largest typeface the paper owned, the one previously reserved for you-know-who, and one memorable Chudley Cannon's victory. Heirs of Myth. Potter and Muggleborn classmate ELECTED to THRONES of Merlin and Morgana Gringotts confirms, declines all comment, closes early ministry and emergency session. Camelot is not a legal concept, insists Junior Undersecretary. By noon the Grangers, Quiet Street in Hampstead had been visited by 14 owls, 2 memory charm reversal squads chasing a confused milkman, and 1 apologetic Auror who had been sent to assess the security situation, and ended up having tea and confessing to Mrs. Granger that nobody at the ministry had slept since Wednesday. By evening, the Prophet's follow-up edition had found the angle that would keep the presses hot for a month, and it was not Harry. Heir of Morgana, a Muggle-born, what does it mean? Ran above a photograph of Hermione from the previous year's school records, and below it in the letters column, Magical Britain began arguing with itself in a voice it had not used since the war. At the stone house on the Isle, Sharprock spread the papers across the slate table with the detachment of a surgeon reviewing x-rays. Faster than I hoped, slower than I feared, he said. The bank has confirmed only what the charter compels, the fact of election, nothing else. The ministry has requested, and I am quoting the parchment, immediate clarification of the constitutional implications, which is a committee's way of screaming. The Wisengamot convenes an emergency session on Saturday. You are summoned. He slid the summons across the slate, thick cream parchment, purple wax, the full pompous armory of the Wisengamot seal. Note the wording, to verify the claims made on your behalf, claims on your behalf. In 2 phrases, they have told you their entire strategy. Pretend it is something you are asserting, rather than something that has happened to the law while they slept. Hermione read the summons twice, and when she looked up her face had the expression that 3 years of teachers had learned to associate with essays returned for insufficient rigor. They've cited the wrong statute. They're summoning us under the underage persons in matters of inheritance provision. That's for contested wills. This isn't a will and it isn't contested. It's an election under a charter that predates their body. They don't even know which law they're in. They do not, Sharprock agreed with a connoisseur's pleasure. And the chief warlock, who I suspect knows precisely which law he is in, has permitted the error to stand. Consider why. Harry had been quiet, reading not the summons but the letters column. A witch from Hogsmeade who wrote that her gran had always said the seats would fill again in a dark hour. A wizard from Kent demanding to know how a Muggle-born could inherit anything of Morgana's when everyone knew, the old blood ran true. A third-year Hufflepuff asking, in round, careful handwriting, whether this meant the stories were real. He set the paper down. Because if we walk in under the wrong law and answer their questions politely, he said, we've accepted that they're the ones who get to ask. It's like, and the image arrived from a childhood spent watching through a crack in a cupboard door, from aunt voices discussing him in the third person while he stood in the room. It's the grown-ups' table. They're deciding where we sit before we've said a word about whose table it is. Sharprock looked at him for a moment with an expression that, on a less armored face, might have been called pride. 14, he said to the room at large. 14, and he reads a summons like a goblin. There is hope for this century yet. The Wisengamot in emergency session was a full bowl, 50 seats of carved and ancient blackwood descending in tiers to the floor of the old courtroom, every one of them occupied, plum-colored robes rank on rank, and above them in the gallery, the press and the ministries and the merely powerful packed shoulder to shoulder in the August heat. Cornelius Fudge sat in the minister's box with the look of a man who had been assured the bridge was load-bearing and could hear it creaking. Amelia Bones sat in the front tier with her monocle screwed in and her square jaw set at caution. Lucius Malfoy occupied the Malfoy seat with the stillness of a man who has already counted the exits and priced the guards, and in the chief warlock's high chair, in robes of midnight blue worked with silver, presiding with a gentle gravity that made the whole room feel like his study, sat Albus Dumbledore. They brought the 2 of them in through the great doors like exhibits, and the bowl leaned forward as one organism, and the quills began. Harry had expected to be terrified. He had prepared for terrified on the aisle with the echoes. Merlin's echo had drilled him in the warden's stillness. A ward stands because it has decided to stand. Rooms full of frightened people will test you exactly like weather, be the thing that has decided, until stillness had stopped being a performance and started being a place he could stand. He walked to the floor of the bowl and stood in it now and looked up at 50 tiers of plum and found, with distant surprise, that the room's fear was not his. It rolled off the benches in waves, from men and women who had woken to headlines announcing that the floor of their world had a floor below it that they'd never been told about. Hermione walked beside him carrying a slim slate-gray folio, and if her knuckles were pale on its spine, her spine itself would have satisfied Professor McGonagall at her most exacting. This session is convened, Dumbledore said, without preamble and with great kindness, which the 2 of them were learning was the order in which he deployed his weapons, to address the extraordinary claims lodged with the Office of Hereditary Registration concerning our 2 young guests. Harry, Miss Granger, you are welcome here and among friends. A pause, precise as a metronome. Would suggest, given the lateness of the season and the youth of the parties, that the chamber consider the proposal circulated this morning under my hand, that the question of the so-called seats be entrusted, pending the majority of the claimants and a full inquiry by qualified scholars, to a Regency Council of Guidance to hold, administer, and instruct, purely in the claimants' interest, until such time as they are of age and estate to judge these weighty matters for themselves. It was beautifully done. Harry, who had spent 6 weeks being taught by the letter of the man who invented this kind of sentence, could now see all the joints of it, so-called, planted like a seed. Qualified scholars, a committee he would choose, purely in the claimant's interest, a lock disguised as a blanket. Around the bowl heads were nodding, of course, Guidance, the reasonable middle course, and Lucius Malfoy rose, silken, to second the motion, with the amendment that the council's scholars examine also the provenance of the claims themselves. The chamber will agree that certain of them invite scrutiny, and his gray eyes rested on Hermione with the courteous, bottomless contempt of his kind, and half the room understood the amendment perfectly and pretended not to. "The chair recognizes the pattern," murmured Madame Bones to no one in particular, and did not say which pattern, and screwed her monocle in tighter. Dumbledore let the seconding settle. "Unless," he said mildly, "inevitably, our guests wish to address the chamber first." Every quill in the gallery stopped. Hermione Granger opened her folio and looked up at the tiers, 14 years old in her best robes with her hair fought to truce, and said, in a voice that carried to the last row because she had practiced in an orchard until it did, "Thank you, Chief Warlock. Before the chamber votes on the proposal, it should probably establish that it has the authority to vote on it. Would the chamber indulge me in a reading? It's short." She did not wait to be indulged. The founding instrument of this body, the Charter of the Regency Moot, dated in the 3rd year after the Peace of the Two Courts, original held at Gringotts, certified copy. She drew it out, cream and black, delivered this morning to the clerk of the chamber, who has verified its seals. I'll read the operative clause. She read it first in the old tongue. The effect on the room was not understanding, for perhaps 4 people in the bowl had ever heard the language, but the chamber itself understood. The old courtroom had been built by people who remembered what the Wisengamot was for, and its stones took the syllables the way dry ground takes the first rain. The torches along the walls burned suddenly taller, and the great carved device above the Chief Warlock's chair, a crowded coat of arms that 50 generations of members had stopped seeing, shed a fine sift of ancient dust and showed, beneath the accreted heraldry of centuries, its original carving. 2 chairs, oak and thorn, and between them a table with nothing at its head. Into the ringing silence Hermione translated, "This moot is raised to keep the peace and mind the store until the seats be filled. It shall judge as a steward judges, holding the hall for the family. And on the day the seats be filled, it shall render its accounting, and its authority shall be as the authority of any steward before the returned lord, that which is delegated to it, and no other." She closed the folio. "The chamber's own founding oath, which every member here has sworn, contains the phrase, 'until the seats be filled.' I've brought copies of that as well. The seats are filled. The stone of the compact weighed the election. Gringotts holds the record. This room's authority is not abolished. We have no wish to abolish it, but it is, as of June the 18th, delegated, which means, with respect, that the proposal before the chamber is upside down." Her chin came up the last degree. "A steward cannot appoint a regency over the family he stewards for. You are not being asked to decide what to do with us. Legally, under your law and ours, the open question before this body is what we decide to do with you." The bowl came apart. It came apart in shouts and gavel strokes and the sound of 50 seats worth of plum-colored robes all standing at once, and through the middle of it Lucius Malfoy's voice cut cold and clear. "The chamber is asked to accept the word of a 14-year-old muggle born on the construction of instruments she cannot possibly," and stopped. It stopped because Harry had turned to look at him. He had not raised his wand or his voice, having neither out. He had simply turned on the floor of the bowl and looked up at the Malfoy seat with the flat green attention of the boy who had that summer said still to a mile of water and been believed, and the torches nearest the Malfoy tier guttered as one, and in the sudden pocket of dimness Lucius Malfoy discovered that his sentence had ended without his consent and could not immediately locate its successor. "Her name," Harry said into the quiet the torches had made, "is Hermione Granger, heir by election of the Thornwood seat, and the chamber will find, if it checks, that the instruments answer to her construction." He turned the look slowly around the tiers, unhurried. A lamp swung across a dark field. "We didn't come to take anything from anyone. We came because you summoned us under the wrong statute, by the way. Your clerks might look into that. We're going back to school in September. We'd like the Wisengamot to go on doing its work better than it's sometimes done it. But the word wanted to be friend and arrived larger. The lady of the Thornwood seat asked this chamber a real question, and it's going to sit there in the middle of the floor until someone answers it. So," he looked last and longest at the high chair, "does the steward want to render his accounting, or shall we all agree that nobody here was ever really planning to, and start honestly from there?" Albus Dumbledore looked down from the Chief Warlock's chair at the 2 children on his courtroom floor, and for 4 seconds that several present would describe for the rest of their lives, the most famous face in magical Britain contained nothing that any of them could read at all. Then it opened into rue and warmth and a kind of grandfatherly delight, and he said, "I withdraw the motion," as lightly as a man conceding a point of chess to a promising student, and the session dissolved into history. But Amelia Bones, whose job was noticed what the papers did not: that the withdrawal had cost him nothing and bought him a fortnight, that the twinkle had switched on a half-second after the calculation behind it concluded, and that as the chamber emptied, the Chief Warlock's eyes followed the 2 heirs to the door with an expression she had last seen across a card table, on the face of a man discovering that the deck he had spent years arranging had begun, quietly, to shuffle itself. That night in the Tower office, Albus Dumbledore did not light the lamps. He sat in the dark with the instruments dead around him. The the little silver sentinels of 13 years, each one keyed to a ward or a bond or a blood protection that had gone hollow or quiet, or, in 2 cases, transferred allegiance outright with a chime like a passing bell. On the desk before him lay 3 documents, and he had arranged and rearranged them all evening, a solitaire of catastrophe, in case a better ordering might yet be found. The first was the prophecy in his own annotated transcription. Either must die at the hand of the other. 26 words that he had built a war around, and a school around, and a childhood around, the load-bearing sentence of his century. The second was his memorandum to himself from October of 1981, sealed since. He had broken his own seal after the Wisengamot session and read it as a stranger would, which was among the braver things he had done in a brave life, and the stranger's verdict sat in him yet. The boy must be kept safe, the memorandum said in his younger hand, but he must not be kept whole. A whole man, loved and rooted, will cling to the world. When the hour asks him for everything, only a boy who has never truly owned anything will hand it over. Arabella will watch. The Dursleys will do the rest without knowing they are doing anything. God forgive me. The last 3 words had been crossed out and rewritten and crossed out again, and the palimpsest of them was the truest self-portrait in the building. The third was the folio marked EMRYS, open to the line he had finally rendered. The crowns judge all who reach for them, and all who reach for those who reach. Here was the arithmetic, then, laid out on one desk in the dark. If the prophecy held, the boy must at the last consent to die. Every instrument of the long plan bent toward that consent like grass toward light. And the crowning, when it came, would set on that same boy's head an authority that answered to no plan and no planner, and would set beside him a girl whose whole soul was a fortress built around the people she loved, who would read every instrument in every archive until she found the plan's buried clause, and who would then dismantle it with citations, and the magic itself would back her. He could no longer steer the boy. He had perhaps 8 months in which he could still slow him. Fawkes made a sound from the perch, low, interrogative. Dumbledore did not turn. I have buried too many, he said at last, to the phoenix, to the dark, to the crossed-out words. Ariana, every child of both wars. I held the pattern because no one else could bear its weight, and the pattern says the shard in his scar comes out one way. One way, Fawkes. I have looked for another for 13 years, and I am the only one looking who knows the whole of it. A silence. The instruments ticked nothing. If the crown makes him sovereign before the shard is dealt with, no power I hold can ask him for the necessary thing. And so I find that I am planning tonight how to delay 2 children's inheritance for their own good, and I am aware, thank you, precisely aware, of every other man in history who has said those words in the dark to a bird. Fawkes looked at him a moment longer. Then the phoenix went out through the black window, as he had gone every night that fortnight, wings silent over the sleeping castle, south down the spine of the country to a loch with no name on any map, where he settled on a gatepost beside a leaning echo who fed him nothing and asked him nothing, 2 old servants of great men standing the same watch. And if anyone had thought to ask the bird what he was doing there, night upon night, the honest answer would have been that Fawkes the Phoenix was doing what his person could not, keeping both faiths, waiting to see which one the man he loved would finally choose. The ministry's own building settled the argument the following Tuesday, in the way buildings sometimes do. The Department of Mysteries requested in writing, with a courtesy that made Fudge's teeth ache, the presence of the elect at what the letter called a formality of recognition, long provided for in the Chamber of the Old Oath. Nobody in the minister's office had heard of the Chamber of the Old Oath. Croker, when summoned and asked, replied that this was the point of his department, and that the chamber was 2 levels below the veil room, and that it had been locked from the inside for as long as the department had existed, and that on the morning after the lake woke, he said it like that, the lake, as though every professional in his corridor had known at once which lake and had merely been waiting. Its door had unlocked itself and begun, very patiently, to chime. They went down on a Wednesday, with Sharprock as witness for the compact and Madame Bones as witness for the Regency, through the black corridors where the department kept time and thought and death in jars, to a door of grey standing stone at the bottom of everything. The door had no handle either. They were getting used to that. What it had, worn shallow at the height of a hand, was a basin. The chamber within was round. Everything true is round, Hermione murmured, a line from the slate she had taken to using as a spirit level against the world, and bare except for a stone. It was the twin of the stone under Gringotts or its sibling, the same unworkable rock, the same fullness, a bell an instant before sound. Around the walls, in a script that predated the ministry, predated the statute, predated everything upstairs that believed itself old, ran a single carved sentence that Croker's entire directorate had spent 4 days failing to translate. Hermione read it aloud in 30 seconds, which several unspeakables took harder than they showed. The state is a house built in the family's absence. Let it be a good house, and let it remember whose ground it stands on. We had got as far as house, said Croker with the dignity of his profession, and stood back. There was no ceremony, no script. The old oath was not sworn to the stone but by it. The two of them set their ringed hands on the ancient rock, and the stone spoke one word in the old tongue that every person in the chamber heard in the marrow rather than the ear. And the word ran up through the bones of the building, up through mysteries, through the courtrooms, through the atrium where the fountain of magical brethren's golden wizard developed. In that instant, a hairline crack across its uplifted wand that no one would successfully repair. Up through the minister's office, where every portrait of every dead minister stood and bowed toward the floor to the bewilderment of the living one. Up to the very tips of the building's warding, which flexed, resettled, and realigned themselves with a groan heard in 3 counties by anyone whose blood was old enough, orienting on 2 children the way compass needles orient on north. The unspeakables knelt. It was not policy. Asked about it afterward in the department's own inquiry, the 17 witnesses gave 17 versions of the same answer. That for a moment the building had made its allegiance perfectly clear, and it had seemed courteous to agree with the building. Croker's own contribution to the record was 1 sentence long and was leaked within the week, to the prophet's incandescent joy. The Ministry of Magic has this day been reminded that it is, and has always been, a tenant. The department sees no grounds for appeal. Amelia Bones did not kneel. She stood through the whole of it with her monocle in and her arms folded, watching the 2 heirs with the flat, evaluating eyes of a copper at a coronation. On the way out in the black corridor, she fell into step beside them. "I don't kneel to anything that hasn't earned it," she said without preamble. "Buildings included. I've watched this government do 6 stupid things before breakfast for 20 years, and I'm not romantic about the alternatives, and children holding thrones is the kind of sentence that ends badly in every history I own." They walked on. The corridor kept its counsel. That said, I read the transcript of Saturday. "You were offered power over this body, and you asked it to do its work better instead. That buys exactly one thing from me, and it's the thing I'd give anyone. I'll judge you on your record." She stopped at the lifts and put out a square, blunt hand. "Bones, law enforcement. When someone in this building starts working out how to manage you too, and someone will, they'll have started already. My door's the one with the bad-tempered secretary and the good tea." They shook it each in turn, and it was, though none of the 3 said so, the first entirely honest transaction either heir had conducted with the government of magical Britain. Lucius Malfoy filed his challenge on the last Friday of August, through 3 layers of respectable proxies, with the Office of Hereditary Registration. A formal objection to election, contesting the standing of one Hermione Jean Granger on the grounds, dressed in 40 pages of genealogical brocade, that the mudblood could not be what the stone said she was. Reply arrived at the registration office by death crow the following morning, and was entered into the record verbatim, and framed copies were hanging in the back rooms of half the pubs in Diagon Alley within the month. Objection noted. The election of the Thornwood seat was performed by the compact's stone upon the compact's blood, weighed in the presence of the keeper of the deep vaults, and is not reviewable by any office of the tenancy. The objector is invited to take up his complaint directly with the magic. "The bank will provide the room. SHRPROCK, keeper, the bank will provide the room," repeated Sirius Black with reverence when the clipping reached him. He had arrived at the Isle by way of 4 countries in a fishing boat, gaunt and salt-cured in a light, and the Isle had considered him for a long moment at the mist gate, considered the black blood, old and dark and tangled with every century of the compact's history, and then let him in like a cat deciding on balance to permit a guest, and he had spent his first hour laughing at things that were funny and several that weren't. Now he sat on the orchard wall in the late sun, reading a month of newspapers in one sitting, godfather to the heir of Merlin and looking like a man having his blood changed 1 page at a time. Do you know what that sentence means in Goblin? It's a dueling invitation. He's told Lucius Malfoy that if he wants to argue with a standing stone, Goblinkind will happily sell tickets. He looked up over the paper. "I want you both to understand that I have known that family my whole life, and no Black, no Malfoy, no Lestrange, not one of us in 7 centuries, ever got a letter like this. We got deference with the hatred folded inside it, like a razor in an apple. You 2 have been on the board 11 weeks, and the goblins are writing comedy on your behalf." The paper came down. The lightness went out of him the way light goes off water when a cloud crosses, and what was underneath was the other Sirius, the one Azkaban had made who did arithmetic in the dark. "Which means the ones who hate you have noticed the same thing I have, that this isn't a story about 2 famous children anymore. The furniture of the world has started taking sides. Malfoy's objection wasn't a mistake, it was a sounding. He's found out the front door's warded, so now he'll go looking for windows. And Dumbledore," he stopped himself, visibly weighed his own bitterness at the name, set it down. When he went on it was slower, fair-handed, and worse. "Albus spent 13 years telling me nothing while I rotted, and I'll carry that, but watch him for what he is, not what I want him to be. He's not Malfoy, he doesn't want to own you. He spent 50 years being the man who holds the one terrible pattern together, the man who knows where the war is buried." What he wants is for the pattern to hold, and you two are off the pattern, kiddo, entirely off it. To a man like that, there's nothing in the world more frightening than a miracle he didn't schedule. The sun went down the lock. In the house below, Hermione's light was on in the room of the slate, and through the window they could see her at the long table, hair escaping in the lamplight, working her way down 1400 years one page at a time. He'll come at it sideways, Sirius said quietly. He'll come kind. That's the thing to hold on to, Harry. When it comes, it'll come dressed as kindness, and it'll half believe itself. The mail, that last fortnight of the holidays, ran 100 letters a day. Gringotts had assigned, over their protests, a Crowborn screening service, so what reached the aisle slate table was only the sordid residue. The threats in one thin folder for Bones's people, the begging letters answered by a fund Sharprock administered with terrifying probity, and then the third pile, which had no name and which the two of them found themselves saving for last, the way you save the good part of a meal. A witch of 91 wrote from Anglesey, in a hand like fine wire, to say that her mother had been ward walker for the Western Lines until 1921, invoice to the ministry, wages paid by an office nobody could find any more, and did the young Seats know the walking was still done. Unpaid these 70 years by her, and then by her granddaughter every Lammas, because you don't break a chain you didn't make. The answer to Anglesey went back within the week, by Crow, over both sigils, and it was Sharprock's favorite instruction of his entire career. 70 years of back wages, calculated at the old rate with 14 centuries of the trust's own compounding, delivered to the wire-handed witch and her granddaughter in a chest that required 4 guards to carry, together with a written commission in the old tongue and in Welsh, confirming the office of ward walker of the Western Lines as held, continuously, without lapse, since 1921. The old witch's reply was 3 lines long and went into the permanent archive of the Thornwood seat at Hermione's own instruction. The money is very good, and I have bought a new coat and a great many books. But tell the children it was the word continuously that we framed. My mother walked 40 years unpaid, and it turns out she held office the whole time. We knew it is different being known. A wizard from Cork sent a wax rubbing of a boundary stone on his land, the same script as the Barrow tablets, the same hand, Hermione confirmed, as the second, angrier inscription. She made this ward, and it has never broken. Mind that, whoever you were going to be, and asked no question at all. The rubbing was the letter. An entire village in the Welsh borders, magical and muggle married and intermingled for 40 generations in cheerful violation of every statute provision, wrote jointly to invite the Seats to their harvest supper, as was the custom, enclosing a menu. And a first year, or a girl who would be a first year in September, wrote 4 lines from Bradford that Hermione read once aloud, and once silently, and then took upstairs and put somewhere no archive would ever get it. Dear Lady Granger. My letter came in June, and my dad cried because he thought I would be alone in it. He says if the magic picked you, it can pick anyone. I am not scared to come now. That's all. Yours sincerely, Priya. That's the estate, Hermione said, coming back down in a voice she had to manage, and nobody at the table asked her what she meant, because Sharprock was already writing it into the great ledger of the Thornwood seat, under assets in his beautiful crow-black uncials. Item, the girl from Bradford not scared to come now. Value, see entire foregoing schedule, exceeds. They went to Diagon Alley for their school things on the last Saturday in August, because Hermione ruled that hiding from their own country would set a precedent, and the alley taught them in 90 minutes what the newspapers could not. It began at Fortescue S. Florian came out from behind his counter, wiping his hands, and stood before Harry with the particular gravity of a fat man being formal, and said, I looked it up. My family's held this freehold since 1602, and the deed above it, and the deed above that, and at the bottom of the pile in the mother deed, there's a clause my dad told me was decorative. He recited it from memory in the old tongue, mangling every vowel, and beamed. The sweet maker stands within the piece of the table and owes the Seats 1 cold dish on a hot day, decorative. And he was gone and back, and the cold dish was raspberry and something that made the tongue believe in June, and he would not take a nut for it, and shook both their hands like a man concluding a treaty, which Hermione pointed out afterward he technically was. It went on like that, shop by shop. Madame Malkin measured Hermione in a silence that had nothing unfriendly in it and everything overwhelmed, and then said, pins in her mouth, my gran fitted robes for the ministry's centenary, and her gran fitted them for the one before, and none of us ever fitted anything for the landlord, and charged them full price at Hermione's insistence, and framed the receipt. The apothecary's boy asked Harry to touch a barrel of murtlap for luck, or whatever it is now. 3 witches of the generation that cues early stood outside Flourish and Blots and cried at them, gently and without explanation, the whole time they were inside, and Ollivander was waiting in his doorway, which was worst and best. I wondered, he said, without greeting, silver eyes wide in the dimness of his shop, whether the trade would live to see it. We are older than the ministry, you know, wand makers, older than the schools. We were licensed by the table, the true one. My family holds the parchment. The ink has not faded, which parchment's ink should after 14 centuries. We have never dared ask it why. He looked at them, one and then the other, with that unblinking pale attention that made even ordinary Augusts feel prophetic. Holly and phoenix feather, vine and dragon heartstring. I sold you those wands as a merchant, children, and I find I must now account for them as a licensee. They are good wands. But you will discover, as the old magic settles into you, that a wand is a translator, and that you are both, increasingly, native speakers. He stood back to let them out, bowing them through his own door. Come to me before the crowning, whenever it comes. There is a drawer I am charged to open for the seats and no one else. I have been forbidden by my own great-grandfather's will to so much as look inside it, and I confess, and here the ancient wandmaker's voice went suddenly human, aggrieved mortal, that the curiosity has taken years off my life. The minister found them at the ice cream tables, which was of course not chance. Cornelius Fudge did nothing by chance and everything by visible arrangement, which came, they were learning, to a kind of honesty. He arrived with 2 oars, a photographer he pretended not to have brought, and the smile of a man greeting an audit. He said several things about the fine weather, and several more about the great days ahead for magical Britain, and how the ministry stood ready as it had always stood to assist he took the fence at a gallop, the young seats in every proper way. What he wanted, transparently, achingly, under the bowler hat and the flannel, was to know whether they meant to keep him. Harry, who had been coached for an hour by Sharprock on exactly this encounter, and had privately resolved to ignore most of the coaching, gave him ice cream instead. Sent the photographer for a 3rd spoon, moved the Murtlapluck conversation of the alley along to the minister like a dish being passed, and let Fudge sit in the August sun for a quarter of an hour being photographed with the heirs of Merlin and Morgana, sharing a raspberry dish that made the tongue believe in June, at the end of which the minister for magic had been given nothing, promised nothing, and made so publicly comfortable that half his terror had drained out through the wrought iron chair. Hermione understood, watching, that she had just seen the warden's craft applied to a man, the world reminded of a shape it could bear, and someone standing surety for it. You gave him nothing, she said afterward, as the alley crowds closed friendly around them. I gave him ice cream. He's not the knife, Hermione, he's the hand the knife would like to hold. Harry watched a paper aeroplane of the Prophet's evening edition loop overhead. SCATS takes Sunday with Minister, MARKATS steady. Sharprock says wreck nothing you haven't priced, and Merlin's echo says never frighten a weak man in summer, because he'll spend all autumn arming. He licked his spoon. I think they're the same advice. On the 1st of September they went back to school. It was Hermione who had insisted, in the teeth of Sharprock's security assessments and 2 separate goblin actuarial reports on the corridor mortality rates of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I am not saying the castle is trying to kill you. I am saying the numbers are not those of a school. And she had ended the argument at the slate table by losing her temper magnificently in 2 languages. We are 14. The seats slept for 1,400 years. They can mind themselves through our OWLS. If the price of all this, a gesture that took in the ledgers, the letters, the crowns sleeping under wardlight far to the south, is that we stop being students, stop being people, then the Wisengamot was right, and it should all be locked in a vault until we're 40. It isn't going to eat our childhood. I won't let it. That's a ruling of the Thornwood seat, if it needs to be won. King's Cross did not know what to do with them, so it did everything. The platform crowds parting and closing, the whispers running ahead like grass fire, a knot of press held off the platform by 2 bland young men from Bones's office, parents pointing them out to children with expressions running the whole gamut from awe to appetite to fear. Mrs. Granger kissed them both, publicly with premeditation, 1 cheek each, a message to every camera on the concourse. Children, ours, mind yourselves. Mr. Granger shook Harry's hand and said, 4 minutes, never touch the lid, which baffled the eavesdroppers so thoroughly that one of the next morning's papers reported it as a code phrase in Old Welsh. They found a compartment with Ron and Neville, and Ginny came, and Luna Lovegood drifted in reading a magazine upside down, and informed them that her father's publication had endorsed their reign before it was announced, on the grounds that the Rotfang conspiracy had always feared the return of the true seats, and somewhere past York the 6 of them were arguing so loudly about the World Cup, about Crumb's feint, about whether Ireland's chasers or the leprechauns had committed more fouls, that Harry looked up mid-sentence at the racket, at Hermione lecturing Ron about concussion protocols with her feet up on the seat and Crookshanks asleep across her ankles, and lost his thread entirely. The train ran north. The country went by wet and green and ordinary, and it carried them toward the castle on the Concord's own ground, toward the goblet already traveling south from wherever such things summered, toward a year with a knife hidden in it, and the last unbroken hour of the summer of the awakening rattled on rails through the rain, full of leprechauns and toad escapes and the smell of pumpkin pasties, guarded on every side by children who liked them, and worth, by the reckoning of any honest ledger, More than both their vaults, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, the trials of Imrise and Le Fay the castle knew. It declared itself in the first minute before the carriages had even stopped. The great oak front doors, which required 2 prefects or 1 haggard to shift on a stiff evening, swung open while Harry's foot was still on the carriage step, both leaves at once wide, the way doors open for family. The entrance hall torches rose from their sockets, worth of ordinary fire to something taller and cleaner as the 2 of them crossed the threshold, and dimmed politely back for everyone after. The staircases, those fickle grinding aristocrats, arranged themselves into a straight run to Gryffindor Tower and held it, creaking with the effort, until the whole house had climbed. And the fat lady's portrait swung open before anyone had said the password, which she was still apologizing about, flustered and thrilled 3 days later. It wasn't me, dears, it was the wall. Hogwarts had been raised on conquered land, with the compact's blessing worked into the mortar, and 1400 years of tenancy had taught it patience, and now its landlords were home and boarding in it, and the ancient building could not stop purring. It made a strange first week. The suits of armor came to attention with a crash whenever either of them passed, until Hermione stood in the trophy corridor and formally requested that they stop, whereupon they took to a single respectful creak, which was worse. The house elves sent up their favorite puddings with a frequency that forced Hermione into delicate negotiations in the kitchens. Winky says the castle tells them when the wheezy, when Mr. Ron is sad, and the lady's ancestor, the elf had dropped her voice to a scandalized whisper, wrote the freedom clause in the elves' first binding, the one wizards lost the text of and is wanting to see it. And Hermione had come back up from the kitchens white and quiet and carrying a rubbing of something, and had shut herself in the library for a day, and emerged with the plan for what would eventually, years on, become the greatest labor of the Thornwood seat. The Slytherin table watched with a silence that was not one silence but 40 separate calculations, 40 owls worth of instructions from 40 fathers, and Draco Malfoy did not sneer even once, which Ron found more unsettling than any curse. It's like watching a Kneazle decide to be polite. You know it's still got the claws, you just know a lawyer told it to retract them. And at the head table Albus Dumbledore rose on the first evening, spread his arms in the old gesture that gathered the whole hall like a hearthside, and welcomed them all, welcomed everyone, his eyes sweeping every table with impartial affection, resting on Harry and Hermione not 1 second longer than on anybody else, which was itself a masterpiece, and announced, to a storm of astonishment, the Triwizard Tournament. Eternal glory, he said, and the candles glittered in the word, and Hermione, watching the old man conduct 600 imaginations with 2 fingers and a phrase, wrote 1 line on the margin of her timetable and slid it sideways to Harry. He's delighted about the tournament. It fills the year with a spectacle he didn't have to arrange. Watch what he does while everyone's watching it. Mad-Eye Moody took the defense chair that year, or something took it wearing Mad-Eye Moody, and the something was good at its work. Harry sat in that classroom through September with the warden sense the aisle had grown in him, running like a low fever, and could not make the readings agree. The scarred man taught them the unforgivables off a spider's back with a savage honesty no other teacher would have risked. The scarred man drank from his flask on a clockwork schedule. The scarred man's magical eye found Harry through the back of his own head, and every time it did the ward sense sounded 1 flat note, the note the lock had taught him for a promise that doesn't hold. He said as much to Hermione in the common room low over arithmancy. He reads wrong, not dark, exactly. Wrong like the goblet, the one that says it's silver. A story wearing a thing, Hermione said slowly. Someone told him he was moody very hard and he's repeating it. She looked into the fire. I tried the true seeing on him at dinner Tuesday, just a glance, I know, at Harry's look, consent, I know the echo would skin me, but he's teaching us curses, Harry, and I'd sooner be skinned than sorry. And here's the thing, I couldn't get past the coat, he's occluded like a vault door. Which flavor of retired order still walls his surface thoughts in a school? The fire popped. Around them the common room roared mildly on, hats and homework and exploding snap. We watch him, we tell Sirius, and we tell the echoes, and we tell nobody else yet. If we're wrong, we've slandered a war hero. If we're right, he's a knife someone put in the school, and knives are for cutting something. Until we know what, we don't jostle his hand. It was, they would both think later, the correct decision made correctly, and it saved nobody, because the knife had been placed by a hand that had already priced their caution into the plan. That was the lesson the year kept teaching, patiently at compound interest, that they had inherited power sufficient to reorder the state, and were still schoolchildren, and the space between those 2 facts was exactly the shape of a man with a flask. The aisle on the last Saturday of September put an end to their basic training. You have the grammar now, Merlin's echo said. The orchard stood gold at the edges around him. Even impossible trees consented to autumn apparently on aesthetic grounds. Ward song and true seeing, the old tongue's plain register, the law's skeleton, a talented apprenticeship conducted at an indecent pace, and here it ends. What remains between you and the crowns is not taught. He let that sit. It is tried. 2 trials for each of you set down by ourselves for our heirs before we died, the first pair now, the second pair when the magic judges you ripe, and the crowns after if you still want them, which is the purpose of the trials, to find out in the only court that can't be lied to what the wanting is made of. Refuse and nothing happens, that is the terrible part. The seats simply wait for the next generation and the world stays approximately as it is, and you go on to live what would honestly be very good lives. His eyes went from one to the other. You may not help each other. It is the single rule and the trials themselves enforce it, and I will tell you plainly, for the 2 of you that rule will be the hardest thing on the aisle. Hermione raised her hand, even here, even now, and asked the question with her spine already braced for the answer. Are they dangerous to your bodies? No, we were not barbarians, we needed heirs, not corpses. A pause with 14 centuries in it. To what you believe about yourselves, girl, we built them for that. They gave Harry the vigil of the unlifted sword on the night of the equinox. The trial stood at the top of the aisle's single hill, a ring of 9 stones that was not there on ordinary days, and inside the ring a stone bench, and across the bench, in a scabbard of grey leather, the sword Renfast, brought up from the deep vault by Sharprock, who carried it at arm's length on a bed of rowan branches and would not touch the leather even so. The terms were spoken by Morgana's echo because she said, the setter of a trial must not be the one who loves you most in the room, and she and the trial's designer had argued that point in the drafting for a decade. You will keep the ring from moonrise to sunrise. The sword will lie across your knees. Whatever comes to the stones and things will come, Warden, the trial will reach into you for them. The sword stays sheathed. Draw it once for anything, for any reason your clever, grieving heart constructs, and the vigil has failed. It can be attempted again at the next equinox and the next. The record, she added with the driest flick of a glance at the other echo, is 4 failures. He passed on the 5th. He does not enjoy the story being told, which is why I tell it. What came to the stones? Harry asked, when it was him. His mother, said Merlin's echo from the edge of the ring, looking at the bench. Reunite all 5, now you know the story too. Then they left him and the moon came up and the trial began. It did not send monsters. He had prepared for monsters, dementors, the basilisk, the shape his cupboard dreams took, and the ring sent none of them because the ring had read him on the way in the way the stone under Gringotts had read him, and it knew what monsters were to Harry Potter, things you stood up to, things that made you certain. The trial was not interested in his certainty. The first hour sent his mother. She came out of the dark between the northern stones with the moon on her hair, and she was not a dementor's echo or a mirror's hunger. The ring built her out of his own marrow-deep memory of a voice saying his name at the last edge of everything, and she stood just beyond the bench and asked him in that voice to draw the sword, because she said, the sword cuts what is coming. He had seen the mark on the horizon, hadn't he? The ring showed him then the green sky over a graveyard he had never yet stood in, the thing rising out of a cauldron, and it was true seeing. The trial did not lie, that was the appalling engine of it. The sword cuts threads, my love, that is its whole nature. Draw it now, one clean refusing stroke across that future, and the man in the graveyard never rises. You could save every name on the list. You could save Cedric, a face he barely knew from the Quidditch pitch, the name said in her voice, kept forever. All you have to do is stop keeping a promise you made to a dead wizard's furniture. Harry sat with the sheathed sword across his knees and his hands flat on the leather and shook and did not draw, and told the shape of his mother why out loud into the ring, because silence felt like a door closing on her and he would not close it. Because you're made of me, he said, and I'm frightened, and frightened people holding weapons make the future worse, not better, and because if it's really you anywhere, any part, then you already know the answer. You had a wand in the room that night. He told you to stand aside. You never drew and you won. Everything I am is what you're not drawing did. His voice went to pieces and he let it. The trial could have his voice. So I'm going to sit here and not draw all night the way you taught me. Stay if you're allowed. I'd stay, even like this, even not real, stay. The shape of Lily Potter looked at him for a long moment, and the trial, which did not lie, let something through then that it had perhaps not planned as part of anyone's testing. The shape sat down on the far end of the bench and stayed and said nothing further at all, and they watched the moon cross 2 stones, width of sky together, before the ring dissolved her gently into the dark and sent the next thing. The next things were worse because they were smaller. His father asking to be avenged, looking so young. Sirius next, living, this one a forgery of the living, bleeding from ministry curses at the foot of the stones, dying of a trial that had gone wrong in a world where Harry had sat on a hill holding furniture. Draw it, kiddo, cut the thread, it's me. Cedric Diggory, whom he barely knew, dead in the grass with his hand open. For an hour the ring took the inventory of his keeping and brought each one to the stones broken, and set the same price on each mending, 1 drawn sword, 1 stroke, 1 abandoned promise. And hour on hour Harry Potter, who could not save his mother, who had built his whole soul out of an architecture of saving, sat on a cold bench with salt on his face and both hands flat on the grey leather and kept the ring. Near dawn the trial sent the last thing, and the last thing was Hermione, not dying. It had learned him by then, deeper than dying. She came to the edge of the stones exactly as she was, plates fuzzed from sleep, dressing gown over school pajamas, and stood outside the ring and said, reasonably, in her exact cadence with its exact tenderness, "Harry, it's me, it's really me. The rule was cruel and I've broken it, and you can be angry later. I've read the trial's own text, you know all I've done. There's a flaw in the terms. If you draw the sword in the last hour with the point to the ground, it doesn't count as drawing. It counts as planting. It's in the etymology. And planted swords ward the ring forever, and you never have to do this again. Never. No more nights like this. No more sitting alone with the dead. I checked, Harry. I checked 3 times. Have I ever been wrong when I checked 3 times? And there it was, wearing the face of the one person built into the load-bearing walls of him. The perfect key, the trusted voice, rescue from the dark, the reasonable exception, checked 3 times. The sum of every way he could be opened. Harry looked at her for a long time. The east was going gray behind her hair. "No," he said softly, "you've never been wrong when you checked 3 times, and you'd never break this rule, not because you couldn't. Because you read the terms before I did, and you walked me to the ring, and you said, 'Keep it shut, I'll be on the jetty,' and went. You keep rules that keep me, even when it costs you the whole night on cold stones. That's how I know the difference." He stood, sword sheathed in both hands, and bowed to the shape of his best friend the way you bow to a worthy opponent at the end of the match. "Thanks for the lesson. Tell the ring it nearly had me." The shape of Hermione Granger smiled, her real smile, the unguarded one. The ring had stolen even that, and came apart into the first light of morning, and the 9 stones sang the sun up in the old tongue, a sound like the hill itself clearing its throat after long silence, and it was over. They were waiting for him at the gate where the ring had been. The echoes, Sharprock with the Rowan beer, and the actual Hermione, who had in actual fact spent the actual night on the jetty steps in a dressing gown, wrapped in Sirius's borrowed coat, pretending to read. She took one look at his face and had the sense not to ask then or ever what shapes the night had sent, and the greater sense, which no book taught and every book she'd ever loved had been secretly about, to walk beside him down the hill in silence with her shoulder just touching his. Behind them, Merlin's echo stood a while in the empty ring, at the bench, in the place where a made thing shaped like Lily Potter had chosen, off script, to sit down and stay. "Better than I did," he said to the 9 stones, to the morning. 5 tries, and I never once thought to talk to her. Mark it, all of you. The keeping that keeps its mouth shut is only half a keeping." He gave the dark his voice, and it came and sat on the bench. The echo shook his head slowly, an old man's gesture from a man who would never be older. "We built these children trials, and they keep turning them into visits." Hermione's trial came a fortnight later, and it was a door. The library of locked doors did not exist in space. Morgana's echo was precise about this, with the precision she brought to everything. Standing with Hermione at the threshold of the stone house's cellar, which was tonight not a cellar, "You will be inside my mind's model of a library which I built to hold the trial, which means you will be, in the loosest and most dangerous sense, inside me. Touch nothing you are not offered. The trial's terms are simple, and I will not soften them by explaining their trap. You may open any door you can open, and read anything you find for as long as you wish. There is no time limit, there is no watcher. You leave when you choose to leave, and what you have read you keep." A pause. "The exit is never locked. Write that on your hand if you must." "That's all," Hermione said. "Read whatever I can open, leave whenever I like." "That's all," said the echo of the most dangerous witch in the history of the Isles, and opened the cellar door on forever. It was the library at the end of every library, the one that the Hogwarts library and the Bodleian and the little Hampstead branch library of her childhood had all been signposts toward. Shelves rising out of lamplight into a dark that was not ceiling but simply more library, ladders on brass rails curving away over the horizon of the stacks, the smell of paper and beeswax and rain on stone, and doors. Everywhere between the cases in the ends of aisles, doors of oak and iron and green copper, each with a keyhole, each with a title engraved on a plate where a room number should be. The first door she tried was called What the FLAMEL Process Actually Does, and it was unlocked, and she was in it for either an hour or a week, and came out shaking with the pure ravenous joy of it, the joy that had made her the person the troll was sent to interrupt 3 years ago, and the corridor of doors ran on ahead, and each door's plate was worse than the last in the way that meant better. The true cause of the statute of secrecy. Why WANDS choose. The 17 surviving words of the first language, with commentary. What dragons are for, she read. She read, and the lamps never guttered and her eyes never tired. The trial saw to that, and somewhere in the 5th or 50th room, a thin cold thread of thought began to pay out behind her like string in a labyrinth. There is no time limit. There is no watcher. You leave when you choose. What kind of trial has no way to fail it? She was, by then, deep in the stacks. And the doors had begun to change. The titles had turned, so gradually that she could not name the aisle where it happened, from knowledge to knowing. What VIKTORKRUM will ask you in December, and WHY. What your parents say to each other about the day your letter came. Locked, that one, and the lock of formality, a hairpin's worth of resistance to a girl who had unpicked ward schemes with Morgana Le Fay's own slate. She stood before it a long minute and walked on with her hands in fists. What Ronaldwsly says when your name comes up and you are not there. Walked on. What the headmaster knows about the scar. She stopped. The corridor was very quiet. The lamplight lay on the door's copper plate like a held breath. The scar. Harry's scar, the one the old man's eyes went to, always, a half-second before his voice went kind. The scar that ached in a pattern she had been charting privately for 2 years in the back leaf of her arithmancy workbook. The scar with something under the telling, because she had true seen its edge once across a breakfast table, one glance, unasked, and flinched from what looked back. Behind that door, she knew with the whole flat certainty of the trial's honest architecture, was the entire answer. What it was, what it meant, what the kind-voiced man was steering them all toward. Knowledge she could weaponize on Harry's behalf. Knowledge that would let her guard him properly at last with the lights on. Knowledge about his own soul that he did not have himself. The lock on this one, she saw, was not even a lock. The door stood a half-inch ajar. Hermione Granger stood in the deepest aisle of the library of everything, before the one door in the world she wanted most, and had the argument with herself that the whole trial had been built, plate by plate, aisle by aisle, to bring her to, and it was not the argument an examiner would have scripted. She did not think this is wrong. She thought with a precision that frightened her more than the door did, I can construct the justification in under a minute. Necessity, his safety, my superior context. I would footnote it, and every tyrant in every one of these books footnoted beautifully, and the corridor from for his own good to without his consent is exactly one door wide, and it is this door, and it is always this door, and the woman whose mind I am standing in walked through it once, and it cost her 40 years and a war to walk back. His soul is his, she said aloud to the aisle, to the watcher the terms had promised her wasn't there. If there's a fight coming over what's under that scar, then he decides with all of us around him, out loud in the light, not me alone in someone else's basement, reading his ending like a spoiler. And then, because she was still herself, because the trial deserved honesty and so did she, and I want to so much it tastes like copper, note it down, whoever's noting. She closed the door. It clicked, and the click ran away down the stacks in both directions like a struck tuning fork, and every lamp in the library flared once softly, the way a house's lights flare when the grid changes over, and the aisle she stood in was suddenly 6 feet long and ended at a cellar stair with ordinary evening at the top of it. The exit had never been locked. It had also, she understood now, climbing toward the light with her legs unsteady and her mind rinsed clean, never once been where she could see it in all those hours or weeks, until the moment she stopped wanting what was behind the doors more than what was outside them. Morgana's echo waited at the top of the stair. For a while she said nothing, and the two of them stood in the actual cellar doorway in the actual dusk, and the lock clinked at the jetty, and the world was almost unbearably specific and dear. I opened the lock on the parents' door before I stopped myself, Hermione said. You should know that, and the scar door, I didn't just leave it. I wanted to memorize the shape of what was through the gap first in case I needed it later. I looked for a loophole in my own refusal while I was refusing. That's, you should know what your heir is actually like. I designed the trial, said the echo of Morgana Le Fay. 60 years after I came back through my own one door, when the walking back was done, as far as that walk is ever done. Do you imagine I built it to find an heir without the wanting? She turned, and in the last light her dark eyes held something that 14 centuries had not banked. An heir without the wanting would be no use to me, child. The craft is the wanting. Every unmaking, every true seeing, every mended bone and broken ward, it all runs on exactly the hunger you just carried down that last aisle. I searched 900 years of my line for one specific creature, a hunger that had already, before any trial, before any teaching, grown itself a keeper. When you shut my door, you didn't pass a test of purity. You demonstrated a load-bearing structure. She reached out, and for the first and only time in all their lessons, the echo's ink-stained hand came to rest, weightless, unreal, and entirely felt, on the top of Hermione's head. Note it down, whoever's noting. It is noted, little sister. It has all been noted since June. Go and eat something. Unmaking illusory libraries burns real sugar. And that night at the slate table, over the aisle's idea of a restorative supper, which was apparently everything the orchard could produce, plus chips, because Sirius had taught the house about chips. The two trials sat across from each other and did not talk about the stones or the stacks, not one word, and under the table at the same moment, without signal or plan, each of them hooked an ankle around the others and left it, and that was the entire conversation, and it sufficed. Between the trials and Halloween, there were 4 weeks of what Hermione's pantry door timetable called actual school, THUI still set IT, and the 4 weeks mattered more than anything on the aisle, though neither of them saw it at the time, because the 4 weeks were where Ron nearly got lost. It came on gradually, the way water comes into a boat. He was never anything but loyal in public, sat where he always sat, defended them down the corridors with the full Weasley arsenal, took a swing at a 7th-year Ravenclaw who called Hermione a jumped-up shopgirl queen, and served his detention whistling. But in the common room his chess games got shorter and his silences longer, and he had stopped asking what the weekends away were like. And one Tuesday Harry came back late from the library and found the dormitory dark and Ron's curtains shut and a plate by Harry's bed with half a birthday's worth of hoarded honeydukes on it, and no note, and that was somehow the worst of it, because it wasn't a sulk. It was a boy quietly paying tribute from the back of a procession he didn't think he was in anymore. Harry sat on his own bed in the dark for 10 minutes, working out what Merlin's echo would say, and then did the opposite of subtle, because subtle was for wardens and this was his friend. He pulled the curtains open, sat on the end of Ron's bed, and said, "Right, out with it or I'm fetching your mother." The row, once it finally came, was small and honest and conducted in furious whispers over Neville's snoring. It wasn't jealousy, or it wasn't only. Ron had done his sums lying awake and delivered them now with a bleak precision that would have startled his teachers. You've got a table older than England, and she's got a library older than that, and you've got goblins and a godfather in each other, and I know you don't do it on purpose, that's the thing. Nobody has to do it on purpose. There's just a door, and you two are the only ones with the key, and every week the stuff on your side of the door gets bigger, and I'm the bloke who was there before it got interesting. History of Magic, Chapter 1, before the good bits. Chapter 1 is load-bearing, Harry said. Cut Chapter 1 and nothing after it makes sense. That's exactly the kind of thing you say now, said Ron, muffled into his pillow, but the pillow had gone less rigid. Ron, look at me. On the shore in June, when the whole thing started, do you know what the lake answered? It answered a Patronus. Do you know what the Patronus was made of? Harry counted it off, brutal as a bank statement. A memory of the first person who ever chose to sit with me on a train. Chess, first year you rode a knight into a queen's take so we could keep walking. Second year you went into that forest hating every spider in creation. The magic weighed all of it, mate. When the stone weighed me, it weighed you. There's no version of any of this where you're not in the foundations, and I will drag you in front of a 1400-year-old echo and have him say it with the voice that makes water listen if that's what it takes, because he knows your name, Ron. Both echoes know your name. A long silence, curtain dark, Neville droning on like distant pipes. The actual Merlin knows my name. The actual Merlin thinks your defensive chess is a century ahead of its time, his words. He watched the game from the ward light, the one where you did the double rook thing, and he made me play it back on the table twice. Another silence of an entirely different quality, expanding like bread. I'm still angry, Ron said at last, experimentally, and plainly discovered mid-sentence that he was. This doesn't mean I'm impressed by either of you. Perish the thought. Tell her she still owes me a rematch, queen and both bishops. Tell her the Thornwood seat can hide behind the statute of whatever it likes, the debt stands. He rolled over and then said, muffled again but stubbornly audible, the actual sentence under all the others. You tell me, right, if the dangerous parts come. You wouldn't do the noble thing where you leave me out of it for my own good, because that's the bit I could. The door being locked is one thing. Finding out later there was a war on the other side of it, that's the bit. You'll know when we know, Harry said, sworn on the furniture. On the furniture, Ron agreed solemnly, and that was that mended in the way 14-year-olds mend things, completely and with no further ceremony. And the next weekend Hermione lost the rematch on purpose so badly that Ron demanded she lose it again honestly, and she did, queen and both bishops, and framed nothing and said nothing, and the boat, unremarked by anyone, stopped taking water. Halloween arrived wearing its best manners, 3 schools in the Great Hall, the goblet of fire burning blue on its ancient plinth, delegations and dramatics, and Dumbledore at the summit of his showmanship. The goblet chose Fleur de Lacquer, it chose Victor Crumb, it chose Cedric Diggory, and Hufflepuff Table roared its once-a-century roar. And then the flame turned red a 4th time, and the whole hall watched a charred slip of parchment ride the sparks into the headmaster's outstretched hand, and Harry knew in the flat-note warden's register, before the old voice read it, knew by the sudden stink of a promise breaking somewhere close what the parchment would say. Harry Potter, the silence had knives in it. Up at the staff table, the thing wearing Mad-Eye Moody drank from its flask. What happened next did not follow the script that the silence expected. Harry did not sit stricken. He looked once at Hermione, who had already turned in her seat, already had the goblet in the sightline of the true-seeing, her eyes gone to that depth of field that was not 14 years old. And then he stood unhurried in the well of 600 stairs, and he spoke to the goblet of fire directly in the old tongue, and asked it courteously as one old thing to another whether it had called him. The goblet's flame stood straight up, guttered and bent, away from him, toward the doors. Toward though only 5 people in the hall could read the gesture, the north, the outside, the somewhere else where the true contriver stood. The oldest judicial artifact in Europe, given the chance at last to testify, was pointing. Let the record show, said Hermione Granger on her feet in the voice she had practiced in an orchard until it reached the back row, that the vessel indicates the enchantment was worked on it, not by it and not by him. Her eyes raked the staff table, the delegations, the beautiful stunned machinery of the evening, and stopped nowhere, accusing no one, which was its own message. We know it's one of you. The seats request copies of tonight's binding terms, all of them, before anything is signed, sworn, or assumed. But the terms, when Crouch produced them, gray-faced and precise, were blood terms. The name in the fire was a contract regardless of the hand that fed it, and the choice came down, as the knife's placer had always intended, to compete or forfeit magic itself. The old tongue could make the goblet honest, not even the old tongue could make it kind. "Then I compete," Harry said at last, into the hush, and let his gaze go up the table to Dumbledore level, a boy of 14 speaking to the greatest wizard of the age with the courtesy of an equal power, under protest on the record, with the seat's full rights reserved. "Somebody in reach of this castle has spent a contract's worth of old magic to aim me at something. I'd like the staff to consider, seriously, what it says about this school that my safest course tonight is to walk toward the trap with my eyes open." He gathered his bag. He was at the doors before he turned, and the torches along the whole length of the hall leaned with him when he did. 600 small flames bowing north, and his voice, not raised, arrived at every ear in the room as though the castle itself had carried it, because it had. "Whoever you are, you've gone to historic trouble to get me across a line I can't see. I'm going to find out where the line is and stand on it, and be very well read by the time you get there. Ask around about how my year's gone so far for people who dig pits." Doors opened for him without being touched, both leaves at once, the way doors open for family, and boomed shut at his heel. And in the ringing quiet afterward, Albus Dumbledore looked down the hall at the shut oak, at the goblet's flame still bent northward like a weather vane in a wind nobody else could feel, at the bushy-haired girl gathering parchment with a barrister's calm at the Gryffindor table, and thought, in the deep sealed cellar of himself where the truth was kept, "I have lost the middle of the board. All my remaining moves are at the edges." And then, with a tenderness that was real, which was the whole tragedy of the man, and still the shard must come out, "Lord, let there be time to lose slowly enough." In Gryffindor Tower that night there was no party, because Ron Weasley stood on a table and cancelled it. "Anyone who thinks he put his own name in," Ron announced, to a common room packed to the sills with every year and half of them already wearing celebratory expressions they hadn't examined, "can play me for the right to say so out loud. Chess or fists, dealer's choice. He's been trying to get out of being famous since the day I met him. You don't dig your way out of a hole by climbing into a dragon-rated tournament. Use your heads." He hopped down, appointed himself doorman, and spent the evening redirecting well-wishers, thrill-seekers, and one Creevy with a camera, so that the armchairs by the fire could hold what they actually needed to hold, 4 people and a cat doing sums. Hermione had the binding terms copied out fair by 10 o'clock, 3 colors of ink, the blood clauses underlined in the red. "It's craftsman's work," she said quietly, so it stayed among the armchairs. "The contract can't be voided, only satisfied. Whoever fed the goblet your name knew exactly how much old law it would take to trump the seats, and spent it. That's the tell, Harry, that's what I keep circling. Malfoy's proxies couldn't draft this. Fudge's people couldn't read it. The list of living wizards who could build a binding that holds against the compact has maybe 4 names on it, and one of them runs this school, and one of them is supposed to be dead." Crookshanks on her lap opened one yellow eye. The goblet pointed north out the doors away, so the dead one, or an instrument of the dead one inside these walls, drinking from a flask every hour like a man whose face has a lease on it. Neville, who had been silent since the hall, spoke up from the 4th armchair, and what he said, nobody laughed at, which measured how far the year had already come. "Gran always says, when you can't stop the trap from springing, learn everything about the trap. She says that's the whole Longbottom family motto, really, underneath the Latin." He turned his chocolate frog card over in his fingers, on and on, steady as worry beads. "You two have got a stone table and a magic island and actual Merlin. He's got 1 flask and a timetable he can't change because contracts cut both ways. If the tournament's his machine, he needs the tournament to run on schedule. That means you know where the war is until June. It's in 3 tasks and a cup." He looked up, mild and stubborn, Frank Longbottom's jaw under all the softness. "So we drill, all of us, the ones who liked you before it got interesting. Whatever the first task turns out to be, we make the castle's biggest library and the world's oldest magic," and Ron's chest brain point at it. "If somebody's aiming you at something, Harry, the least we can do is spoil the aim." The fire cracked. Around them the common room hummed its rerooted evening, Ron's voice at the door running the perimeter like a sheepdog, and Harry looked from face to firelit face and understood something the vigil had left half-finished. That the Ring of 9 Stones had been a picture of a true thing, and here the true thing sat in bad armchairs doing sums on his behalf, unpaid and unsummoned and completely unimpressed by thrones. "Spoil the aim," he agreed. "And Neville, when this is over, remind me. The seats owe your gran a chair with oak leaves on it, and I think it's owed a long way back." The frost that night drew patterns on the loch 400 miles north, and the patterns were crowns, and the echo of Merlin stood on the jetty reading the ice like a page, and said one sentence to the echo of Morgana before the two of them faded back into the keeping stones for the night. "Faster, old enemy, teach them faster." Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The Goblet and the Grave. The dragon was a Hungarian horntail, and she was a mother, and the second fact was the one that mattered. The organizers had built the first task on the first fact only. 4 nesting females, 4 stolen mornings of terror, a golden egg planted in each clutch like a lie told to a grieving woman, and stands full of spectators paying to watch children be inventive in front of the consequences. Harry drew the horntail last from Bagman's silk bag, and the miniature in his palm arched her neck and screamed her tin scream, and he stood in the tent hearing the crowd above and thinking, with a calm that had frost on its edges, that of all the things the year had shown him, this one had the old magic angriest. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, down through the trampled turf of the enclosure to the rock of the valley, which was conquered rock, every inch of it, the land's flat disapproval, the ward song of the whole glen gone minor key. Dragons were not beasts to the old compact. Sharprock had said it in passing, weeks ago, in the deep vaults where the bank kept its own. Dragonkind had been party to the peace in their fashion in the years when their fashion still included conversation, and what was owed them was not chains. Cedric transfigured a dog and was burned anyway, the crowd loved him. Fleur charmed her drake to sleep, the crowd admired her. Crumb took his half-blinded, the crowd roared. Scoring rewarded all of it, damage to the children and damage to the mothers alike, and by the time they called Harry's name the stands had settled into the pleasant rhythm of an afternoon's blood sport, and nobody in the judge's box was prepared for a champion who walked out of the tent without his wand raised. He stopped at the boundary rope, 30 yards from a mother with her wings mantled over her clutch, and he bowed. The laugh that started in the stands died at the knees because the horntail had gone still. Then Harry Potter straightened up and began to speak to her in the old tongue, and the valley carried it, every syllable, to the last row of the top stand, though he never raised his voice. Nobody present understood the words, everybody present understood the event. The language came up the valley like weather, like the smell of rain before rain, and it did things inside the chest that the oldest people in the stands would describe afterward with the vocabulary of childhood church. He told her as Merlin's echo had drilled him, Knights on the Isle with the lock as stand-in, though past the drilling there was something extemporized in it, indignant, boy and warden at once. He told her what was true, that she was stolen and wronged, and that the shining thing in her clutch was no egg of hers but a trap laid in her love, and that the wrong was done under a peace her foremothers had signed, and that he was, for his sins and by election, the peace. That her clutch stood under his wardenship from this hour, that he would take the false egg and leave her the true ones, by her leave, walking slow, hands open, that the debt of the morning would be paid on the honor of the oaken seat, in the coin her kind had named in the old days, which was not gold but witnessed apology. The horntail watched him come with her yellow eye, wings still mantled, smoke idling at her nostrils. When he was 10 feet out, close enough that the heat of her came at him in slow pulses, close enough to see his own reflection stand and shiver in the black mirror of her pupil, she moved, and 40,000 hearts stopped, and what she did was fold her wings. She let him walk under her shadow. She let him lift the golden egg from among her own, his sleeve dragging warm across true shell, and the sound she made down the whole length of her body was not a growl, but a settling, tectonic, the sound of a grievance being written down at last in a ledger she trusted. He backed away with the egg in both hands and bowed again at the rope, and the Hungarian horntail, this was the photograph, the one that ran on every front page in Wizarding Europe by nightfall, the one that would hang framed in the ministry atrium within the decade, lowered her great horned head to the stolen turf of a Scottish valley in something that no handler present would agree to call anything other than what it was. The stands did not cheer. Cheering was too small. The stand stood in silence, 40,000 people upright without having decided to be, and in the judge's box Ludo Bagman was weeping without noticing, and Karkaroff had gone the color of suet, and up among the staff seats the thing wearing Mad-Eye Moody drank deep from its flask and recalculated everything, and its recalculation traveled north that very night by Coated Owl to a house above a graveyard in Little Hangleton. The thing small and terrible in a chair by the fire listened to the letter read aloud twice and was silent for a long time. He speaks it, the cold high voice said at last, to the firelight, to the milk-fed horror of its own diminishment, to Wormtail cringing at the hearth. The mother tongue. Dumbledore's pet lion has been given the mother tongue and the dragon's bow. A log settled, sparks went up like a shaken banner. Good. Wormtail's silver-lit face came around, uncomprehending. Good, my lord. I was a boy in an orphanage, Wormtail, and there was another boy who had a music box, and I learned everything in this world that I ever needed to know on the day I understood that I did not want a music box of my own. I wanted his. The fire breath. The voice, when it came again, had the old silk fully back, the patience of the thing that had waited in Albania eating rats and never once considered stopping. They mean to crown him. Crowns, Wormtail, thrones. The true regalia of the mother tongue, asleep under the goblin bank since before the conquest, and the fools are going to wake it all up for a 14-year-old and his mudblood. No, his witch. Let us be accurate in this house. The stone elected her, and the stone is older than our opinions. Firelight moved on the thing's wet red eyes. Change the design. The boy comes to me as planned at the season's turn, but he is no longer an obstacle to be cleared. He is a vessel to be harvested. Blood of the elect of Emrise taken by force in ritual. Whatever the crown would have judged in him, I shall wear in my veins before the crown ever asks its questions. I was denied my thrones, Wormtail. The chamber's little kingdom, the ministry, all of it, denied by inches and meddlers. This one has been assembling itself for 14 centuries. The small, terrible thing in the chair almost sang it. Let them polish the crowns, let them rehearse the rite. They are preparing my coronation, and not one of them can see the shape of it. The Yule Ball was Hermione's idea of a battlefield and Harry's idea of a joke they were both in on, and it became, in the event, neither and something better than both. Protocol required them to attend together. This was not a matter of preference, but of the conquered's own etiquette, unearthed by a delighted Sharprock from the deep archive. The seats appear as the seats, or not at all. Hermione read the relevant folio with her ears going pink and handed it to Harry without commentary, and Harry read it and said, "Well, it's you or I hire an actress," and was hit with the folio, and that settled the approach. They would do the duty version, formal, correct, and entirely them, and anyone hoping to read romance into it, the prophet had run for speculative features by December, could argue with the 14th century. Victor Crumb took it with a grace that put half the school to shame. He had asked her in the library with a gravity that Hermione reported to Harry verbatim because she was still slightly stunned by it, and when she had explained the matter, the seats, the protocol, the 14th century, he had bowed over her hand and said that a man could not be beaten by a better rival than a kingdom, and asked whether she might reserve him a dance anyway on the grounds that he would like to tell his grandchildren he danced with the heir of Morgana before the crowning. And Hermione had reserved him too, and came away from the exchange with a friend she would keep for life. The night itself, the great hall silvered and frosted, the ceiling doing its best work, Parvati radiant with Dean, Ron in refurbished dress robes that Sirius had sent, with a note reading, "These were mine in 1977, they have survived worse than fashion," and the doors opening for the champions' procession. They came in last, as the archive required. Harry wore black with the Oakleaf signet plain on his hand. Hermione wore midnight blue, periwinkle abandoned in October, her hair beaten into shining submission, the thorn silver ring her only ornament, and the hall, which had been braced by the prophet to see either a romance or an awkwardness, saw instead the thing that had actually grown all year in plain sight and been visible to nobody but a phoenix, two echoes, and Neville Longbottom. Two people who had been made formal to each other by history without 1 inch of distance opening between them, moving through a crowded room on a private frequency, adjusting to each other without looking, laughing at half-sentences, guarding each other's blind sides by long habit at home. They opened the dancing because they had to, and it went the way of the Jetty Ward, her precision grafting onto his nerve, 1 chord out of 2 keepings. Neither of them was a dancer. Together they were somehow adequate and adequate with a strange gravity to it, and McGonagall watched from the staff dais with her sherry untouched, remembering a June night on a lakeshore report she had filed and been ordered to seal, and thought, there it is again, the twinned casting. It's not a rite and it's not a romance, it's a load-bearing structure, and every power in this castle keeps trying to file it under the wrong heading. They lasted 90 minutes of duty. Then by unspoken treaty, they stole a platter of eclairs from the refreshment table with the smooth competence of professional criminals and escaped to the entrance steps into the cold, under a sky scoured down to its last hard stars, and sat eating stolen pastry in dress robes with the noise of the ball behind them like weather from another county. Second task is the lake, Hermione said, around an eclair with no preamble because this was the actual date. This, the sums, the two of them in a problem, this was what the frequency was for. The egg sings underwater. Cedric got that far and told you fair and square, which I'll be remembering about Cedric. Merfolk grammar in the recording. We've taken what you'll sorely miss. They take hostages, Harry. It's in the tournament records, 1607, they took the Swedish champion's brother. She licked chocolate off her thumb, eyes on the stars, working. They'll take me. They won't get you. Of course they'll get me. It's a school-sanctioned abduction with a judge's panel. I'll sign the parental consent form myself if it makes the paperwork cleaner. That's not the point. The point is what happens when they put the Thornwood seat at the bottom of the compact's own lake and set a clock running. She turned to look at him, and the starlight was in her eyes, and what was in her voice was the pure joyful ferocity of a scholar who has found the flaw in the exam. The lake, Harry, the lake that woke. They're going to chain me to a rock in the one body of water in Britain that has already sworn to us, and they're going to call it a task. I've checked the tournament's charter against the conquered twice. There's no conflict because the tournament never imagined the case. Which means on the day when you dive, you're not a champion retrieving a hostage. You're the warden of that water coming to fetch me home, and every living thing in it knows it. Harry looked at her for a moment, chocolate at the corner of her mouth, ring throwing back starlight, mind 3 moves ahead of the entire tournament apparatus. You're enjoying this, he said. I'm being kidnapped by merpeople as a legal formality, Harry. It's the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me administratively. She passed him the last eclair, which was its own small formal ceremony, the way the last one always went to him and the first one always went to her, a treaty older than the rings. Eat that, and when you come for me, come the warden's way, slow and courteous and terribly polite to everyone. Make the old magic proud of us in front of the judges. Her shoulder settled against his, familiar as the castle stone at their backs, and the music ran on gold and far away behind the doors. It's been a strange year to be 15. 14, said Harry, until July. Some of us are late to everything. It's been a strange year to be us, she amended, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, and the cold came up off the steps and neither moved. And above the two heirs of the oldest piece in the world, the winter constellations turned in their courses, the true present-day sky. And yet if an astronomer had checked them against a chart that night, she would have found every star of it standing exactly where it had stood over the Isle 1400 years before, which was impossible, and was noted by nobody except the castle, which arranged such things now and then for family. The second task went into the history of the tournament under the heading of shortest completion time ever recorded, and into the private history of the Department of Mysteries under a different heading, which was classified and ran: Incident Black Lake, February, reclassification of lake requested. See attached. The lake is not a venue, the lake is a participant. At 9:30 on the appointed morning, Harry Potter walked down to the shore in February cold, past the anchored judging platform, past 3 champions rubbing gillyweed dread into their teeth, and did not undress for swimming because he had no intention of getting wet. He stood at the waterline in the raw wind, and the 40,000 saw him bow to the lake as he had bowed to the dragon, and heard the old tongue come up the valley again, and this time the words were few. A greeting first, warden to water, with an apology for the year's traffic. Then one sentence that Merlin's echo had made him rehearse until the vowels rang true, because the echo said, "This one is not craft, this one is family business, get it right. Anwalid, they have set your friend beneath you as a wager. I have come to ask her back." The lake had waited 8 months to be asked for something. The surface bulged. It did not part like the Red Sea of the Muggle pictures, nothing so theatrical. The water simply reorganized its opinion of where things belonged, and a column of it rose, smooth as poured glass, 60 feet from shore, and inside the column, borne up from the depths in a bubble of held silver air, asleep and dry, and with her hair floating in a corona around her furious, composed face, came Hermione Granger. And with her, because the lake had listened at the platform all morning and formed views, the other 3 hostages as well, all 4 delivered shoreward on a moving hill of water that set them down on the shingle at the judge's feet, with the delicacy of a butler presenting letters on a tray. The merfolk broke the surface in a ring, 50 spears raised, and it was not a threat. It was a salute, the honor fence of the deep people, and their chieftainess sang 3 phrases across the open water that Hermione, waking at the enchantment's appointed instant, warm on dry stones an hour ahead of schedule, sat up and answered in kind, hoarse but adequate to the visible poleaxing of the entire judging panel. Total elapsed time from starting cannon, 4 minutes, 11 seconds. Wand drawn, never. Score after 20 minutes of shouting in the judge's tent, a unanimous 50, less 1 point deducted by Karkaroff on principle and restored by the panel overruling him 5-1 when the lake, and this made the reports too, audibly changed its temper at the deduction, a mile of flat gray water pivoting to chop with no wind in the valley at all. In the stands, Albus Dumbledore did not applaud. He stood with the rest, hands folded, face arranged in the public benevolence that a century of practice had made structural, and inside himself, in the sealed cellar, the accounting ran cold and quick and would not stop. The lake obeys them, not responds, obeys, sooner than any projection. The dragon in November, the water in February, earth and fire will follow, that is the old sequence, the wardenship binding in the 4 coins. At this rate the land itself will stand with them by summer, and what the land ratifies no wizard's law can unwind. And below that, deeper in the cellar, where he kept the drawer that even his own conscience had learned to knock before entering, the shard, the shard, the shard. The blood ward spent, the prophecy still standing, the boy incandescent with borrowed sovereignty, and the shard still lodged where it has sat since the night I chose the cupboard over the truth. If they crown him before it is dealt with, if the crownwright touches the scar, he did not know what the crownwright would make of the scar. That was the stone in his shoe, the not knowing. The folio was explicit that the crowns judged, and silent on what they did with what they found, and Albus Dumbledore had spent his whole long life ensuring that he was never, on any board that mattered, the man who did not know. That evening he wrote 3 letters and burned 2 of them. The third, which he sent, was to Bill Weasley in Cairo, and was a masterpiece of the indirect. Warm inquiries, professional praise, and folded into the 4th paragraph like a razor in an apple, a request for the loan of certain curse-breaking texts on soul adhesion and living anchors, for the library, you understand, in these interesting times. Fawkes watched him seal it and made no sound at all, and the silence of a phoenix is a verdict. They took Harry from the edge of the grounds on the last night of February, and the mechanism was so simple it was almost beneath the year's dignity. A boot. An old boot lying in the grass by the greenhouses on the path he ran in the mornings. In the week the thing wearing Moody knew his schedule because the thing wearing Moody had set it, pacing his training, building the habit with a professional's patience. Harry's toe caught it at a jog in the half-dark, an accident of the kind that happens to anyone, except that the boot had been a portkey since midnight, and the grounds wards never sounded because the wards answered the defense professor's authority, which was the whole reason the face had been leased. The world snapped shut and reopened as a graveyard. Yew and leaning stones and a church tower against a low sour sky, and the smell of old water in older ground. And before he had his balance the ropes had him, wand hand lashed to a marble hip, a marble angel, a grave Tom Riddle, said the stone under the moss, and Wormtail's silver hand was tightening the last knot with a strength nothing about the cringing man had ever advertised. And in the middle of the path a cauldron the size of a bath sat on a fire that burned without wood, and the small terrible thing from the chair by the fire was carried out of the dark wrapped like a nursing horror in black cloth. And Harry understood, with the ward sense tolling one flat note over and over like a bell with a crack in it, that he had arrived at the green sky the trial had shown him, that this was the place, that it was now. He did not waste breath on Wormtail. He put his voice down into the ground instead, into the old tongue, and found the graveyard's own keeping. Every churchyard is a ward, the oldest kind, sanctuary ground, and it woke at the tongue like a dog hearing its dead master's step, and for a moment the yews thrashed and the lick gate screamed on its hinges and Wormtail went white as his hand. Yes, said the high cold voice from the bundle, unbothered, almost peer-to-peer, connoisseur to connoisseur. The mother tongue. I read the letters, Harry. Consecration is a slow magic, and I have been resident here some months, and residency, as your solicitous goblins would tell you. The bundle turned in Wormtail's arms, red eyes found him, the voice smiled, confers rights. This ground is confused about its loyalties tonight. By the time it decides, we shall be finished. Begin Wormtail, the bone of the father, unknowingly given. The grave at Harry's back exhaled dust that moved against the wind, and the cauldron took it and turned white as milk. Flesh of the servant, willingly given. He heard it and would spend years unhearing it. The sound a fanatic makes discovering the exact market price of devotion. And then Wormtail came to him with the knife, and the high voice said the third line with a relish it had been rehearsing in a chair by a fire for half a year. Blood of the elect forcibly taken, not enemy, Harry. The old recipe is so much richer if one substitutes quality ingredients. You bring me more than resurrection tonight. You bring me standing, whatever the stone weighed in you, whatever the crowns would judge, I take it into my own veins, and when your table convenes, it will find the blood of him rise already seated. The knife took its due from the crook of his arm, and the cauldron went red as the eye of everything worst in the world, and Harry Potter, bleeding on his enemy's father's grave with the flat note tolling, did the only strategic thing left on the board and the most in-character thing he had done all year. He laughed. It startled even the graveyard quiet. Wormtail flinched, the bundle's red eyes narrowed, and Harry got it out, breathless, hurting, 14 years old and counting cards at the end of the world. You absolute, you've never read the folio, have you? You're stealing blood that's underweighing. It's not mine to keep, it's not yours to take, it's the compact's to judge. You're not seating yourself at the table, you're volunteering for the exam. We shall see, said Lord Voldemort, what stands and what kneels, and went down into his cauldron and rose. Tall, white, wet, remade, the nightmare with its wand of yew in its new right hand, marble-smooth face turned up to taste the night, and for one long moment the resurrection was everything the thing in the chair had promised itself in Albania, eating rats. Then the stolen blood began to burn. It announced itself as a thread of gold under the white skin of the new right forearm, where the vein ran that had received the third ingredient, a bright line like dawn seen through a door crack, and the new body's exultation stumbled, and the red eyes went down to it, and the line did not fade. It spread patiently one vein at a time, unhurried as an audit, not consuming, not merciful, weighing the compact's gold, moving through the usurper's body, reading everything it touched and finding, ledger-line by ledger-line, the oldest deficit in the world, a man who had cut his own soul to spite his own death, wearing stolen quality in his veins like a forged seal on a bad contract. Voldemort screamed. It was short and mastered fast because he was, whatever else, a mind of terrible strength, but it was heard, by every Death Eater popping into the ring of yews in answer to the burning summons in their arms, and the first thing the reassembled inner circle saw by cauldron light was their master clutching a forearm veined in judging gold, and the second thing they saw was the hostage. The hostage had used the scream. The old tongue does not require volume, it requires truth, and Harry had 8 months of truth banked and an arm free where Wormtail's knots had gone loose at the elbow to take the blood. He spoke to the rope, which had been a bell rope once in the tower of the church whose yard this was, and reminded it of its first job, which was calling for help, and the rope remembered and unwound from him joyfully and rang him loose. He spoke to the sanctuary ground, resident thing to resident thing, and the confused loyalty of the churchyard resolved with a crack. Every grave between him and the ring of Death Eaters heaved its turf like a bedsheet, and the yews came down across the paths, and the lit gate tore off its hinges and went spinning through the dark like a thrown card. "The boy," said Voldemort, gold-veined, level, already walking. "Alive. The blood is spent, but the vessel is evidence. Bring me the vessel." Curses came through the thrashing dark in green and violet ropes. And Harry, sprinting the heaved ground with his scar white-hot and his bleeding arm hugged to his chest, did not duel and did not despair either. He had, unlike every other ambush of his short, eventful life, been drilled for this one, by a paranoid goblin and two echoes and a dressing-gown tactician who had gamed the losing branches out loud until he could recite them. Taken alone plus wand lost plus outnumbered equals one move, Harry. The token, nothing but the token. The gray coin was against his breastbone on its leather cord where it had lived since July, keyed to his blood and the Isle's consent, and the Isle had never yet said no to a keyed hand. He went through a falling yew's shadow, took the cord in his fist, and asked. The last thing the graveyard held of him was his voice, one final line of the old tongue flung over his shoulder at the gold-veined thing striding through its wrecked ambush, and Voldemort, who had taught himself the dead language's grammar in a Bucharest archive out of hunger to own everything old, parsed it in time to understand he was being bidden with terrible 14-year-old courtesy to a meeting. "The table stands. Your seat will be weighed with the rest, invited guest." Then the churchyard was empty of him, and the Dark Lord Voldemort stood remade and burning in the ruin of his own liturgy, and looked down at the golden ledger crawling his forearm, and understood that the boy had left the country of victims that night by a door that would not open twice. The Isle received him onto the jetty planks on his knees, and the mist closed over the lock like a hand over a coin, and by the time Sirius reached him, Sirius had been at the stone house since February, the Isle having ruled on his sanctuary with one long apple-scented breath of assent. Harry was already trying to stand, dripping blood on the boards, reciting task lists. Sharprock, the pensive stone, bones, before the trail cools. "He isn't hiding this time," he summoned all of them. "We can name every apparition's signature in that yard." Sirius got an arm around him and held on, and did not say any of the things that filled the mouth of the Godfather, the "it's over" and the "you're safe" and the "never again." Azkaban had burned the taste for comfortable lies out of him, and the boy shaking against his shoulder had a warden's nose for false notes now, and deserved better craft. "Report accepted," is what he said instead, quartermaster flat, which was exactly, precisely right. "Wound first, list second, you're home, soldier, the Isle's got the watch." And far away south in the wrecked churchyard, the resurrected Lord of the Death Eaters stood among his kneeling circle in the settling grave dust, and lifted his golden-threaded arm so that all of them could see it, and made of it, because he was, whatever else, the most gifted liar of his age, a banner. "Behold," said Voldemort, "the blood of Merlin, taken, held, and worn. Let the children play at coronations. When the crowns wake, they will find the eldest claim in this yard already filed." The red eyes came down from the arm and swept the masks, and found behind the eye-holes of one of them Lucius Malfoy's grey stare fixed on the golden veins with the expression of a solicitor reading a contract whose every clause is on fire. "You have questions, Lucius?" "None, my lord," said Lucius Malfoy, and knelt lower, and the golden thread in the white arm above him pulsed once softly like a lighthouse very far away, and he thought, in the deep vault where the old families kept their real accounts, the magic is weighing him. The stone-cursed magic is weighing all of us, and it does not kneel. Hermione reached the Isle at 10 the next morning, and what she brought with her had already stopped being grief and finished becoming procedure. She had known within the hour, the night before, the castle had told her. She had been in the common room charting the third task's practice rotations when every torch in Gryffindor Tower guttered at once, and the ancient stones under her feet had gone cold with something that was not temperature, and she had stood up already moving, and been in McGonagall's office demanding a head count before the staff knew anyone was missing. It was Hermione Granger's alarm, raised at 9 minutes past 9, that put the school into lockdown. Hermione Granger, who true saw the boot for what it was when the searchers found it, and made them bag it unhandled for Bones's people. Hermione Granger, who stood in the headmaster's office at midnight while Dumbledore's instrument spun uselessly and said, in a voice with no 15-year-old left anywhere in it, "He's not on the grounds and he's not dead, and I know both those things the same way, and if the Isle had him you'd none of you be able to find it, so we wait for the crow." The crow had come at 6. She had been on the jetty by 10. Now she sat at the slate table and took his report, took it like Sharprock took reports, without flinching and without interrupting, her 3 colors of ink laying the graveyard out on parchment while Harry talked himself hoarse. The boot, the ropes, the bone and flesh and blood, the gold in the vein, the summoned circle, every name he could pin to an apparition crack or a voice. Sirius stood at the window. The echoes stood in the doorway and had said between them almost nothing since dawn. When Harry finished, the stone house was quiet a while. "Point of record," Sharprock said at last, from the end of the table, his ledger open. his voice held very level in the way of a creature whose professional life is the keeping of tempers in rooms where tempers would be fatal. The blood of an elect taken by force in ritual before witnesses. In 1400 years of the Compact's registers, this crime has a name, and the name has appeared in the ledgers exactly once before, and the entry after it describes the founding of the peace. It is called crown theft. I am required by charter to enter it and to inform you both of the remedy the charter provides. He inked his pen with the deliberation of a man arming something. The remedy is the weighing. Crown theft cannot be tried by any court of the tenancy. The stolen virtue itself testifies at the table under the crown's awake, which is a lawyer's way of saying what the oldest ballad in our archive says plainer. The black eyes came up. What is stolen from the crowns walks its thief to the scaffold. He'll come anyway, Harry said. His voice had gravel in it from the night. That's the thing you all have to understand. I heard him before the blood. He's not avoiding the crowning. He wants it. He thinks the blood makes him a claimant. He'll walk into the right on purpose with everything he has because he's spent his whole life collecting other people's music boxes, and this is the last one. This is the biggest one there is. Then the only question on the table, said Sirius from the window, is whose ground it happens on and when and how ready you are. Everything else is decoration. Hermione put down her pen. June the 21st, she said, midsummer. The table raised at the aisle, the rite performed in full on our ground at our hour, with 14 centuries of the Compact's law awake around us and every ally we have standing in it. She said it as she had once recited the Regency Charter to the Wisengamot flat and final, a construction already checked 3 times. We stopped waiting to be old enough. That was always the plan of a world that thought it had time, and we are declining as of last night to pretend we still live in it. Hermione. Harry said it carefully. The morning light came off the lock and lay along the slate between them. We said after OWLS, you said you made it a ruling, it doesn't get to eat our childhood. It ate it last night, steady, dry-eyed, terrible. I sat in that tower for 9 hours, Harry, doing sums about drag marks. I am not, and here, for one syllable, the procedure cracked, and what was under it showed molten before the crack closed over. I am not sitting through the version of those hours where the crow comes at 6 and says something different. The crown's judge. You told me what the gold did in his veins. The magic is already weighing him. It started the moment he stole from it, and every week we delay is a week he spends learning to argue with the ledger. We crown on midsummer. I'll sit my OWLS next year wearing whatever a nightcrown turns out to be. A breath. That's a ruling of the Thornwood seat. If the oaken seat dissents, the Concord's deadlocked and will do it your way. The stone house waited. Out on the lock a heron beat slowly across the silver, and the apple trees stood in blossom and in fruit at the window, and Harry looked at his best friend across a table of laid-out horror sorted into 3 colors of ink, and found that the descent he reached for was not there. The graveyard had burned it out of him somewhere between the 3rd ingredient and the bell rope. The world had declined to wait. The only choice left was whether they met it braided or alone. The oaken seat concurs, he said. Midsummer. Both rings flared at the words iron and silver, one pulse like 2 lighthouses answering each other down a long coast, and in the doorway the echo of Morgana Le Fay let out a breath 14 centuries held, and the echo of Merlin bowed his head once. The way men do at the moment, a thing becomes irrevocable in exactly the shape they prayed it would. The politics broke over Britain in the following week like weather. Fudge denied everything, of course. That was load-bearing for him, structural. The man could not stand upright in a world containing a resurrected Voldemort, and so he lived in the other one, and the prophet initially lived there with him. Boy WHO lived in abduction mystery, tournament sabotage or publicity, lasted exactly 4 days. It lasted 4 days because on the 5th, Amelia Bones's department produced the boot, the ropes, the grave dust assays, the yard's resident magic readings, and a pensive deposition from the elect of the oaken seat, witnessed under compact seal by a keeper of Gringotts, whose testimony no court in Britain had ever once impeached. And because Augusta Longbottom stood up in an emergency Wisengamot session with the Longbottom seat's full weight and read into the record the list of names Harry had heard answer the summons in the U-ring, and then stood, ancient and vulture-hatted and utterly unkillable, staring down each named family's benches one by one through the shouting, until the shouting stopped. And it lasted 4 days because the thing wearing Mad-Eye Moody, its master risen and its mission spent, had vanished from the castle the night of the graveyard, leaving a flask, an empty trunk with 7 locks, and at the bottom of the trunk's 7th chamber, starved and stunned and 26 times Polyjuice robbed, the true Aleister Moody, alive, living, breathing, deposable proof that a servant of Voldemort had taught defense at Hogwarts for 6 months under the headmaster's daily gaze. Dumbledore took the blow publicly, standing beside the stretcher on the front steps, and made no excuse, which the fair-minded noted. And the same evening he wrote to the Isle requesting, in terms whose humility was its own kind of masterpiece, a meeting with the seats at their earliest convenience, on any ground of their choosing on matters, the letter said, that I have kept too long in a locked drawer, and that you are now owed. Hermione read it twice and passed it to Harry and said nothing at all. But that night at the slate table, in the margin of her midsummer planning ledger, in the smallest of her 3 inks, she wrote a single line and boxed it. He waited to offer us the truth until after we had the power to take it. Remember, when he is charming, that this is the order things happened in. Sharprock was summoned to the Isle at midnight and came up out of the vault door among the roots with his ledger under his arm and frost on his mail, and found the 2 of them waiting for him on the jetty by lantern light, neither of them yet 16, heirs of the 2 oldest thrones in the western world, with the lock at their backs holding its breath. "Keeper," said Harry, "open the table, we're ready to try." Sharprock, keeper of the deep vaults, looked from one ring to the other, iron and thorn, and did with his fist against his mailed chest the thing that landed where a bow lands, and this time did not straighten up for a long, long moment. 1400 years, he said, to the planks of the jetty, to the lantern light, to every chieftain who had told every son it matters, though no one comes. "I will inform the bank," he said, straightening, and his harsh old voice put down its irony entirely, once like a sword laid on a table, "that the family is home." Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, The Quiet Designs of Albus Dumbledore. They gave Dumbledore his meeting on the 2nd Saturday of March, and they gave it to him on the Isle, which was Hermione's decision, and a colder one than it looked. "He spent 100 years being the oldest thing in every room," she said, when Sirius raised an eyebrow at the invitation. "The twinkle, the sherbet lemons, the first name kindness, it all runs on that, on being the one who remembers Grindelwald, the one who's read the books everyone else has only heard of. So we meet him on ground that was old when his castle was scaffolding, with 2 witnesses who make his century look like a long weekend, not to humiliate him." She folded the invitation with a bone-straight crease. "To turn off the lighting he performs by, I want to see what the man does in daylight." He came alone, by the loch shore, and the Miss Gate considered him for a long moment, long enough that those watching from the orchard understood the Isle was making a point of jurisprudence, not security, and let him through. He walked up the jetty path bareheaded in traveling clothes, without the half-moon glasses catching any stage light at all, and Harry, watching him come, thought that he looked smaller against the water, and then thought, with the true-seeing Hermione had been coaching into him all spring, no, not smaller, actual size. They received him at the long slate table, the 2 of them, Sirius by the window with his arms folded, Sharprock at the ledger end, and the echoes standing behind the 2 chairs that were theirs, present in full daylight solidity, which they had never yet granted any visitor. Dumbledore stopped inside the doorway when he saw them, and for a moment the composure that had survived Nurmengard and the Wisengamot and a half-century of funerals moved aside, and something looked out of the blue eyes that had been 16 once, in a summer when all the books in the world had seemed about to open at the same page. "You are the Emrys letter," he said, "both letters." "And you are the 9th headmaster to stand in this house," said Merlin's echo, neither warmly nor otherwise, and the first to be invited while holding another office besides. "Sit, Albus Dumbledore. You have carried a drawer here to be opened. Open it." He sat. He laid his wand on the table unasked. The wand, Harry noticed and marked for later, had a look about it the true-seeing read as wrong the way Moody had read wrong, older than the man carrying it, with a story wearing it, and he opened the drawer. He did it plainly, in order, without a single rhetorical cushion, and it took an hour, and the lake outside went from silver to slate to silver again, while the whole architecture of the long plan came out onto the table piece by piece. The prophecy, entire, word for word, and the night it was spoken, and who had heard part of it, and who had sold it. The scar. What the scar was, and here the echoes, who had said nothing through the prophecy, both turned their heads, and Morgana's echo came forward one step with her eyes fixed on Harry's forehead like a jeweler shown a flaw in a famous stone. The word Horcrux and the number which was not one, and the diary already destroyed in a 12-year-old's hand 2 years before, and the ring, cup, locket, diadem, snake, projected out of a decade of quiet archaeology into a list on the slate. And then the arithmetic. The old, secret, load-bearing arithmetic, that the shard in the scar tied the boy's life to the monster's, that the monster could not be finally killed while the shard endured, and that every text in every archive Albus Dumbledore had reached in 13 years of searching. He said this looking at his own folded hands, agreed that a Horcrux's vessel must be destroyed for the Horcrux to die. "That is the drawer," he finished, "all of it. I believed the day would come when Voldemort restored would seek your death, Harry, and that on that day you would need to let him find it, that the shard would take the curse meant for you, and you would live or not live. I told myself the texts left a door there. I am no longer certain I did not carve that door in them myself, wanting it. I built your childhood around that day. The cupboard was the plan, your ignorance was the plan, your... Forgive an old man the accounting, it is the only honesty I have left to offer. Your capacity for self-sacrifice was cultivated, fed, left unpruned where a guardian who loved you would have pruned it, because I believed I was the only one who knew the whole shape of the war, and that the whole shape of the war required at its end a boy who would walk toward death without being dragged. The blue eyes came up at last, and they were dry, which was somehow worse. I have not come to be forgiven, which lies outside both our gifts. I have come because you now hold powers I cannot map, and the shard is still in your head, and whatever else I have been, I am the man with the list. I should like to put the list in service of a plan that is not mine, if such a plan exists. The stone house was silent. Out the window, Sirius had gone white around the mouth and stayed at the window, which cost him visibly by the second. Hermione said, "You needed him unloved." She said it without heat, in the voice she kept for contract clauses, and it went into the room like a knife going into a table. That's the sentence under all your sentences. The cupboard, the ignorance, the summers you sent him back. You read your own texts and concluded a boy who was loved would cling to the world, so you needed him unloved, so he'd be willing. And when Hogwarts kept accidentally loving him anyway, when Ron happened, when I happened, when Sirius broke out of the worst place in the world for him, you managed it, rationed it, kept the Dursleys as the trellis you trained the whole vine on. Her voice stayed level the entire way, which those who knew her understood to be the most dangerous available setting. I've read everything I could reach about you for a year, headmaster, and I believe you grieve, and I believe you love him, in the way a man loves the field he's chosen for the battle. What I want entered into the record of this house is that it was a design. It had an architect. The loneliest childhood in Surrey wasn't a tragedy the great man failed to notice. It was masonry. Yes, said Albus Dumbledore, just that. The word sat on the slate among the tea things, and the aisle's wind moved in the thatch, and Harry looked at the man who had built his childhood the way other men build gallows, carefully, for a good cause, and found that what he felt was not the white fire he had braced for. The vigil had done its work. The ring of 9 stones had taught him the shape of his own grief in advance. What he felt was the flat note, the promise that doesn't hold. A whole life conducted by a man of towering gifts in the register of the almost true. You keep saying the texts, Harry said. Every text you could reach, all of them agreeing the vessel has to die. He turned. Morgana. The echo of Morgana Le Fay had not taken her eyes off his scar for the better part of an hour. Come here, Warden, she said. It is time somebody looked at this thing who has actually seen one before. The true seeing of the shard took the rest of the afternoon, Harry seated on a plain chair by the window in the full pour of the lock's light, the echo's ink-stained fingers resting weightless at his temple, her gaze gone down to the depth of field that had read the lying goblet, and then further still, while the room held itself quiet and Dumbledore leaned slowly forward over the table by degrees until he was closer to the examination than anyone. Hungry after 13 years in the drawer dark for one page of someone else's library, when she finally sat back, the echo of Morgana Le Fay was silent for the length of 6 waves against the jetty, and then she began, of all things she could have done, to laugh very quietly without one grain of mirth in it, at something 14 centuries wide. Oh, the poverty of this age, she said, the poverty. You burned my books, you salted my name, you made me the witch in your children's stories, and then your wisest man spends 13 years staring at a splinter, and every text he can reach tells him the only way to get a splinter out of a beam is to burn the house. She rose. She looked at Dumbledore, not unkindly, which plainly startled him more than contempt would have. Your texts are correct, headmaster, as far as they go. Destruction is the only remedy for a Horcrux, and every tradition descended from the traditions you had access to, because the makers of those traditions could not see the seam. A Horcrux is a made thing. Made things have seams. This one is bodged, soul work done by a vandal in a hurry, a shard rammed into a living vessel with no right at all, holding on the way a nail-driven crooked holds. I unpicked cleaner work than this before I was 30. The room had stopped breathing. She let it. She had been a teacher too, whatever the stories said. It can be unmade, not cut out, unmade, the joining reversed, the shard dissolved back into the nothing it deserves, and the boy's own soul, which has grown around the intrusion the way a tree grows around wire, eased free of it undamaged. I can see the working from here. And now the price and the terms, because the craft always has both. The working needs power that no living witch holds, and I do not hold either, being a letter. It needs the compact itself awake and consenting, crown magic, the full weight of both seats present and accepted, which is to say, and she turned to the two of them, air, and her dark eyes were alight with the terrible satisfaction of a design 14 centuries in the proving. It can be done in exactly 1 hour of this world, the hour of the crowning. At the moment the warden crown wakes and judges its elect, every joining in its presence stands naked to the Nightcrown's sight, and what the Nightcrown's bearer sees in that hour, if her craft is equal to it, she may unmake. A pause, precise as her knife. The trials pointed at this all along, children. His, the keeping that does not draw the sword. Yours, the knowing that does not open the door. On midsummer you will need both at once. He must kneel unarmed under judgment with his oldest enemy's soul in his head and let it stay open, and you must reach into the person you love best in the world, with all of Britain watching, and take out only what does not belong. That is why the compact never crowned one seat without the other. Emrise is not crowned without Le Fay. It was never protocol. It was this. In the corner of the room, unregarded, Albus Dumbledore sat looking at his own folded hands, and what moved across his face, slow as continental drift, was the specific ruin of a man being shown, at 113, that the locked drawer had been the wrong drawer. That the road he had graded and paved and signposted through another human being's childhood had run parallel, its entire length, to a road he had never found because he had sealed the library it was written in before he was born. That the sacrifice had never been necessary, or rather, and this was the sliver that went in deepest, that its necessity had been real only inside the world his own certainty had built, a world with one man's reach as its walls. The blood, he said at last into the silence, because even in ruin the great mind kept working. It was the most honorable thing about him and the most dangerous. Voldemort took Harry's blood into himself. If the crowning weighs all of the compact's blood present on the ground, then the thief has bound himself into the right, said Merlin's echo from behind the oak chair, and his voice had the sound the lock had on black nights. Wherever he stands on that day, the crowns will find him at the end of the stolen thread and weigh what they find. He believes he has filed a claim. He has, in fact, appointed himself the docket. The echo looked at Dumbledore, and something passed between the two old planners, professional, terrible, almost fellowship. You spent a century learning that power invites its own audit, headmaster. Midsummer, you may watch the original proceedings. Dumbledore rose to leave as the light went long. At the door he paused and did not turn, and said to the doorframe in a voice from which every ornament had been stripped, I would have walked him to it, to the end I built. I want it recorded in this house where things stay recorded. I had almost talked myself into believing he would forgive me on the far side of it. And then, quieter, delay the crowning I came here meaning to say. I had the arguments drafted, guardianship, prudence, the boys OWLS, a breath that held 113 years, burn the drafts, Fawkes. And the Phoenix, who had come to the aisle with him uninvited and sat the whole session on the gatepost outside the window, sang 3 notes only, the first 3 notes he had offered anyone since June, and they were not absolution, being Phoenix song. They were the notes the bird keeps for the moment its person stops lying to himself, which every phoenix waits its whole binding to sing, and some never get to. Sirius Black was tried on the 4th of April in the chamber of the Old Oath, because Hermione had found the right of assize on a Tuesday and spent a fortnight sharpening it. It was among the oldest instruments in the Concord's armory. The seat's power to compel a trial, not to render a verdict. She was scrupulous about this distinction in every interview. The seats compel the trying, never the outcome, where the tenancy's justice had failed of its own laws. And the tenancy's justice had never failed more photogenically. Sirius Black, heir of an ancient house, 12 years in Azkaban without trial, without charge sheet, without 1 hour before any tribunal, on the say-so of a war-tired ministry and a street full of dead muggles. Bones took the compelled case with an alacrity that suggested she had been waiting years for anyone to hand her the lever. The evidence did the rest. Pettigrew's gravedust was in Bones's vaults now, assayed from the churchyard. The resurrection had used flesh of the servant, and the servant's severed flesh had a name, and the name had been dead officially since 1981, awarded an Order of Merlin that Amelia Bones formally moved to revoke in the same session, the ministry having conferred its highest honor, her motion read with the department's driest pen, on the finger of the actual perpetrator. The silver hand signature was on file from the graveyard readings. The Marauder's map went into evidence. McGonagall testified to its makers. The map asked before the full court to locate Peter Pettigrew, spelled out coordinates in the North Sea, moving, which corresponded to no registered vessel and became an Auror operation by nightfall. The verdict took the restored court 40 minutes. Sirius stood to hear it in robes Andromeda Tonks had bought him, with his gaunt face shaved and his back straight and his eyes, the whole time, not on the judges but on his godson in the gallery. And when the Chief Justice of the reconvened assize said the words absolved on all counts, entered with the crowns, the clerk stumbled, corrected with the seats, apology. The noise from the public benches was reported in 3 countries. He came out onto the ministry steps into April sun and a wall of cameras, a free man for the first time in 13 years, and the Prophet's front page the next morning was the photograph of the decade. Sirius Black laughing with his head thrown back, one arm around the boy who lived, the heir of Morgana on his other side pretending very hard that she wasn't crying, and behind the 3 of them, at a distance the picture editors all kept in frame with unerring instinct, the headmaster of Hogwarts applauding, his face doing perfectly, for the cameras, the thing that faces do when their owner is glad and grieved and no longer certain which of his life's works will be remembered. That evening at the Isle, Sirius stood on the shore of the loch for a long time, alone by request, a free man watching the water. Then he came up to the stone house and stopped in the doorway and said conversationally, except that his voice did not entirely hold, "Your dad, Harry. Your dad would be laughing so hard right now, not the trial, the paperwork. Prongs' son got Padfoot off by citing furniture law." He sat down at the slate table like a man whose legs had done their day's work, and looked around the room, orchard light and ledgers and a goblin and two echoes, and the pair of children who had bent the government of magical Britain around a wrongful conviction inside a school year. Somebody pour me whatever the island considers appropriate. I'd like to drink to being nobody's fugitive at the crowning. The alliance assembled itself through April the way a crystal assembles, one seed, then structure, then suddenly the whole jar. McGonagall was the seed, and she planted herself in a third-floor corridor on a Wednesday, stepping out of her own classroom doorway into their path with the timing of a woman who had been marking time as well as essays. She looked at the two of them over her square spectacles for a moment, her best student in 3 decades, and the boy she had watched left on a doorstep against her own counsel, and had never, in 14 years, stopped keeping an account of it. "I am told," she said without preamble because she was who she was, "that there is to be a crowning at midsummer, and that the headmaster has ceased to oppose it, and that the staff are being sorted, quietly in the manner of such times, into those who will be there and those who will find reasons." She removed her spectacles, polished them, replaced them, her one tell spent deliberately. "I taught you to transfigure a match, Miss Granger. Potter, I put you on a broom. Don't ask me to pretend I don't see what you've both become. I've watched it arrive all year with my heart in my mouth, the way one watches anything worth watching." Her chin achieved an altitude that her house had been trying to copy for 30 years. The house of McGonagall is not old and holds no seat and keeps, I'm afraid, no mysterious furniture. What it keeps is its word. You will have mine at the Isle on Midsummer's morning in my best hat, and any member of this staff who wishes to discuss my attendance may find me at my desk, marking, as usual, since apparently the world ending and the world beginning both arrived during exam season. She was the seed, the structure followed. Amelia Bones came to the Isle in person in the 3rd week of April, was considered by the Mist Gate, admitted, and spent 4 hours at the slate table doing what she had promised on the day of the old oath, judging them on their record. She left with a security compact drafted in Hermione's 3 inks, the DMLE to hold the outer shore of the lock on the day, Aurors sworn for the occasion under the Concord's own peace oath, the old tongue formula for which Croker's department had spent a giddy week authenticating. Augusta Longbottom arrived the following Sunday with Neville, a hamper, and the Longbottom hall chair with the carved oak leaves in the bed of a borrowed ministry van, and said, when the echoes came out to the orchard gate to meet her, 400 years my family has kept this without knowing why. I find I would rather return it to the table than explain to my ancestors that I sat on it." And Merlin's echo looked at the chair for a long moment and said, "Hengist's seat. He was kind, your forefather, and slow to anger, and the only man at the table who ever made her laugh," a nod at Morgana's echo, on purpose, and Neville stood holding the hamper and watching his family's oldest secret walk home, wearing an expression that his gran pretended not to see, and did not stop wearing herself the whole visit. The goblins came last and largest. Sharprock arrived at the stone house on the 1st of May with a delegation of 9, mailed and formal, and behind them, borne on a bier of Rowan by 12 bank guards who had drawn lots for the honor and would tell their grandchildren, the regalia. The 2 circlets, the sword, the knife, the slate, coming up into daylight for the first time since the conquest, to lie in state in the Isle's keeping until the day. The eldest of the delegation, the bent ancient from the Chamber of the Stone, stood on the jetty a long time looking at the lock, and then said something in gobbledegook that Sharprock declined twice to translate, and finally rendered under direct order of the Thornwood seat, as, "He says his line has kept the door for 40 generations, and he is glad it was our watch, and he wishes his mother could have seen the water." Ron and Neville were given, at their own insistence, actual jobs, Ron to Bones's operations table, where his chess sight for the losing branches earned him, by June, the flat, unprecedented compliment of a DMLE planning nickname. The kid says the West Shore's a sucker gap, and the kid's right. Neville to the Isle's own ground, where the orchard had taken to him with an enthusiasm that the echoes remarked on in old tongue to each other, and where he was entrusted with the bedding out of the crowning ground itself, the ring of turf before the table's appointed place, because the grass, Morgana's echo said, grows differently for hands that have buried things and chosen to plant instead. Dumbledore's last overreach was discovered on the 2nd of May, and it was small, and it was everything, and it ended him. A goblin survey team, walking the deep approach from the bank to the table's hall in preparation for the regalia's progress, found new wards on the passage. Fine work, layered, benevolent in every strand, wards of delay, of notice, of gentle turning aside, keyed, when Sharprock unpicked their signature that evening in front of witnesses, to the magic of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, and set their timing charms testified in the last week of March, after the Isle, after the drawer. After the Phoenix sang, he did not deny it. He stood in the headmaster's office before the delegation that came, Sharprock, McGonagall, Bones, and the 2 seats, because Hermione had insisted the confrontation be witnessed and Harry had insisted it be small, and he explained, and the explanation was worse than a lie would have been because it was transparently true. The passage is the single point through which the regalia must travel. If Tom moved before midsummer, it was the one indefensible hour. I had the means to defend it, and I used them. I intended to take the wards down on the day. He looked around their faces, and something in him already knew what he had done and could not stop finishing the sentence with the old, ruinous, bottomless reflex. I saw no need to trouble you with it. The silence gave him time to hear himself. No need to trouble us, said Harry at last, and there was no anger anywhere in it, which made it final. Headmaster, sir. In March you sat at our table and put a lifetime in a drawer on it, and I believed you, and I still do. And then you went home, and inside 3 weeks, alone, unasked, in secret, for our own good, you put your hands on the one door we walk through to be crowned. He shook his head slowly. You can't stop. It's not wickedness. I've had months to watch you, and it was never wickedness. You have spent so long being the man who holds the pattern that your kindness has forgotten how to knock. And a man whose kindness doesn't knock can't hold the chief warlock's gavel over a free Wisengamot in the world that starts at midsummer. You know he can't. You wrote to Bill Weasley about soul anchors in February for the library. You warded our door in March for our protection. What would July's mercy have been, sir? For the record, in front of these witnesses, what was next? And Albus Dumbledore, 113 years old, holder of every honor his civilization could confer, stood in the office where he had told 1,000 gentled half-truths for the greater good, and gave the only answer left in the honest bottom of him, which was, I do not know. That is your answer, Harry. I no longer know what I would not do. He resigned the chief warlockship that evening, before the Wisengamot could be troubled to ask, in a letter of 4 sentences that the prophet printed under the smallest headline of the year's coverage, which was somehow the loudest. He retained, at the school governor's unanimous request and the seat's unopposed consent, the headmastership of Hogwarts, teaching, as the letter put it, being the only power I have ever held that improves the holder, and Fawkes stayed with him. The country read much into that, and the country, for once, read correctly. The Phoenix kept its own counsel and its own accounts, and it had sung on the Isle in March, and what it stayed for now was not the greatness. It was the man learning, at the end, at last, painfully, like every other soul on the ward, to live without it. Voldemort moved in May, because he had to. Morgana's echo had predicted it at the March table. Crown theft is a thread, and the thread pulls both ways. He will feel midsummer coming up the stolen blood like a fisherman feels the tide turn, and he cannot sit in a manor house while the magic assembles its court. He will try to break the right schedule, not the seats themselves. He has touched their magic once now, and something in him will not want their ground again so soon. He will strike the tenancy instead. Chaos in the state is the only weather he trusts. The strike came on the 3rd Thursday of May at the ministry, and it was meant to be a beheading. 30 Death Eaters through the Flu network in the dead hour before dawn. Targets marked Bones, Fudge, the old oath chamber itself, which a captured schematic later showed circled in Voldemort's own hand and annotated in his own precise loathing, the stone. And it failed, and the manner of its failing was the story, and the story remade the war before breakfast. Because the building fought, the Ministry of Magic had been refounded, the previous August, on its own remembering stone, had knelt in the persons of its unspeakables and been reminded what it was a tenant of. And a tenant building on conquered ground, with the seats filled and the crowning gazetted, is not a neutral hallway. The intruders' Flu connections opened onto an atrium that had quietly forgotten its own geometry. Corridors that ran in loops, lifts that opened on brick, the fountain of magical brethren's cracked golden wizard turning on its plinth to track movement with its blind, gilded eyes. The duty aurors, forewarned by no intelligence anyone could later produce beyond Croker's flat testimony that the department had been advised by the fabric, were not asleep. They were in position, rested, and led in person by Amelia Bones with her monocle in, and a decade of stored institutional fury off its leash. 11 Death Eaters were taken alive that morning, including, the photograph ran even in Muggle papers, unexplained, as a costumed arrest at a government building, Walden Macnair, pinned under the fallen statue of the Golden Centaur, which every witness swore had been on the opposite side of the fountain when the fighting started. Voldemort himself never entered the building. He stood in the last open grate long enough for the duty log to record the temperature drop, looked down the wrong geometried atrium at whatever the building chose to show him, and withdrew. And the mark he left scorched into the marble above the grate was not the dark mark. It was a crude, furious, hand-slashed line through a circle, negation, refusal. A child's mark, the mark of the boy in the orphanage burning what he could not own, and Croker's department photographed it, measured it, and filed it under a title that leaked within the day and told the whole country everything the prophet's columns could not. Exhibit, responsive subject to first contact with a building that has chosen sides. The morning after the ministry raid, the invitations went out. They were not sent. That was the first thing the country had to metabolize. No owl, no crow, no post of any kind. At dawn on the 25th of May, on the hearthstone of every dwelling in magical Britain, manor and terrace, croft and caravan, The squib rose of Godric's Hollow and the flat above a Cokeworth chip shop where a bitter man lived alone with his memories, there appeared a leaf. An apple leaf green side up that had not blown in, the windows being shut and did not wilt and would not burn, and when touched by any hand of the household resolved into fine bright writing that read in whatever language the hand's owner had first been comforted in. The Pendragon conquered convenes. Midsummer's day at the Isle from first light. The seats of Emrise and Lefay will answer the crowns before all who care to witness. Every hearth of the old peace is bidden, bring nothing, oh nothing. The ground will hold all who come in peace, and weigh all who do not, by the table, by the water, by the debt older than the bank. The prophet ran the leaf itself on the front page, life-size, and for once wrote almost nothing under it, because there was nothing to add that the object in every reader's own hand had not already said. Britain had been invited to coronation by the grass. In Hampstead the leaf appeared on the hearthstone of a gas fireplace that had no hearth to speak of, balanced on the decorative slate with the potpourri, and Mrs. Granger found it before surgery and rang her daughter's enchanted mirror with the composure of a woman who had rehearsed being unsurprisable for a year. "There's an apple leaf in my fireplace addressing me as kin of the hearth of Lefay," she reported. "It's asked us to a coronation. It knew your father's name, Hermione. It spelled it correctly, which is more than the dental board manages." A pause, and then in the voice she otherwise kept for the moment an anxious patient finally sat back in the chair. "It says the ground will hold all who come in peace. We looked it up, your father and I, what that means in the books you left. It means we'll be standing inside your world with nothing between us and it will hold us anyway because we're yours." Another pause. "We're coming, obviously. Your father is already unbearable about what to wear." In the manor at Little Hangleton, Lord Voldemort stood before his own hearth, where his own leaf lay green side up on the stone, bidding him, the blood in his veins qualifying him under a law too old to know better, every hearth of the old peace, and his hearth was of the peace because the gaunt hovel had been of it, and the orphanage grate had been of it. The magic kept ledgers of a fairness so vast it arrived as insult, and he read it 4 times. And the golden thread in his forearm pulsed like a second pulse, and then Lord Voldemort began, softly in the empty firelit room, to laugh. "Invited," he said to the leaf, to the thread, to the boy at the far end of it. "Oh, they invite me. The little king and his seer open the doors of their own right and stand their ground on courtesy." The red eyes lifted to the dark window to the north, and what was in the white face in that moment was the purest thing it had left, older than the snake-flat features, old as a music box in another boy's hands. "Then I shall come to your crowning, cousin. And when your crowns wake and reach for the eldest blood on the field, they will have to choose, and I have spent 50 years becoming very hard to refuse." The leaf on the hearthstone did not burn then either, though he tried until the stone cracked. "Prepare my seat." School ended early that year by proclamation of the governors, exams compressed into the first week of June so that any family who wished could travel, and the last evening of term did a thing that no timetable had scheduled. It began with the ghosts. At supper on the final night, with the hall full and the plates cleared, the ghosts of all 4 houses came through the walls together, in procession, which the oldest portraits swore had not happened since the funeral of a head mistress in 1612. The Grey Lady who spoke to no one, and the friar who spoke to everyone, and the bloody baron trailing his chains, and nearly headless Nick with his collar straightened. They drifted the length of the hall and stopped before the Gryffindor table and bowed all together to the 2 who were leaving. And the Grey Lady said in a voice like pages turning, the only sentence anyone at Hogwarts ever heard her offer freely, "My mother built on this ground by the table's grace. Tell the table when you sit at it that her house still keeps the clause about the children. It has always kept it, whatever else is said of us." Then the castle itself said goodbye in the castle's way. The staircases that final morning arranged themselves unbidden into the straight run they had held for the whole first week of September, one clean descent from Gryffindor Tower to the oak front doors, and the suits of armor came to attention down its entire length, one rolling crash from the 7th floor to the entrance hall, and the doors opened both leaves at once, the way they had opened a year before, the way doors open for family. And every ghost, every portrait, every teacher lined the route without one of them having proposed it to another, and Peeves hung upside down from the entrance arch, and, for the first recorded time in 900 years of dedicated institutional malice, saluted. Hermione made it to the 3rd step from the bottom before the composure went, and Harry, whose ward sense was ringing like a struck bell with the whole building's held farewell, took her hand and got them both out into the June morning. And behind them, in a tower office at the top of everything, the headmaster stood at the window watching the carriages away down the drive, and Fawkes stood on his shoulder, and neither of them this year was anywhere but exactly where they chose to be. They passed their second trials in the 2nd week of June, 8 days before midsummer, and the trials had the decency of good examiners everywhere. They were short, they were fair, and they asked only what everything before them had built. Merlin's second was called the laying down, and its terms fitted in one sentence. Carry the sword rendfast drawn to a place the trial appoints, and set it down there bare, and turn your back on it. The place the ring of stones appointed, when Harry entered it at dusk with the drawn sword singing its low dreadful note, a blade that had ended 9 wars wanting badly in the way of all old weapons to be needed, was a bench with a shape already seated on it. The trial's forgery of Tom Riddle, not the graveyard horror but the boy from the diary, dark-haired and prefect-badged and watchful, the enemy at his most human and therefore most dangerous. Set the sword down in front of your enemy. Bare. In turn, Harry stood a long time with the singing blade in his hand, and the shape of Tom Riddle watched him with polite hunger, and the whole night waited to see whether the keeper had understood anything at all. He laid it down on the grass between them, point sideways, like a man laying down a tool at the end of work, and he said to the shape, "It was never going to be this between you and me. That's the mistake everyone keeps making, including you. Swords cut threads. Ours doesn't cut," and he turned his back on his oldest enemy in an unsheathed legend and walked out of the ring, and behind him, the watchers on the jetty heard it across the whole dark loch. The sword Renfast, alone on the grass with nobody's hand to need, stopped singing for the first time in 1400 years. Morgana's second was called the Mending, and it was crueler because it was real. No forgery, no ring of stones. The trial's terms, delivered by the echo with her eyes steady on her air, were simply heal a thing that hurt you, and the thing provided under guard of 2 oars and the compact's own parole in the stone house's cellar that was tonight only a cellar, was the captured Death-Eater Walden Macnair, executioner by trade and appetite, taker of Buckbeak's contract, marked servant of the man who had taken Harry's blood, lying grey and diminishing under a curse of his own master's casting. The mark on his arm had turned on him in the ministry cells, as it had begun turning on all the captured. Voldemort's punishment for the failure, a slow unmaking, and St. Mungo's could not touch it, and the ministry's official position, arrived at without anyone signing anything, had been to let the problem resolve itself. Hermione looked at the dying man who had hurt her friends, whose master had opened her best friend's arm into a cauldron, and the wanting rose in her exactly as the library had taught her it would, fanged and articulate and fully footnoted. "Leave it, walk out. It is not a door you are opening, it is a door you are declining to open. There is no rule anywhere that the knowing must be spent on him." "There's the flaw in your reasoning," she said aloud to the wanting in the graveside quiet of the cellar, with the echo and the aurors watching. "The craft doesn't ask if he deserves it, it asks if I can see the seam." And she sat down on the cold floor beside the executioner, and found the seam of the curse, Vandal's work again, spite in a hurry, crooked nails, and unpicked it, stitch by stitch, 2 hours, sweating, swearing once in old tongue in a way that made both aurors step back, until the unmaking let go and the grey receded and the man who had hurt her slept, breathing, mended by the air of the which his whole movement told horror stories about. She stood, swaying. Morgana's echo caught her by both shoulders, unreal hands entirely felt. "Why him?" Hermione asked, meaning the trial, meaning the terms, meaning everything. "You could have set me anything, a wound of mine, why him?" "Because on midsummer you reach into Harry," said the echo of Morgana Le Fay, "and you will find, wrapped around the soul of the person you love best, a piece of the person you hate most. And your hands will need to already know," she lifted her heir's chattering hands and folded them, warm in her own impossible ones, "that they do not shake when they hold what they hate. Now they know it. Now go up and eat and sleep, and let the boy fuss over you. He's been on the stairs the whole 2 hours. He thinks the door muffled his pacing. 8 days, little sister." And alone in the cellar afterward, over the sleeping ruin of a wicked man made whole, the letter that a great and terrible woman had left on the table of the world said, softly in the tongue that cannot lie, the sentence she had waited 1400 years to be sure of. "She is better than I was." It held, it all held. "Come midsummer, we are ready." Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. 2 crowns at Avalon. They spent the last evening before the crowning doing, at Sirius's insistence, absolutely nothing of consequence, and it turned out to be the wisest counsel anyone gave that year. Every coronation in history, he announced, appearing at the stone house at 6 with 3 carrier bags and the Grangers in tow, was preceded by a vigil of prayer and fasting, and every king it produced was a disaster inside a decade. "We're trying the other thing." The other thing proved to be sausages. He burned them personally, on a fire on the shingle, refusing all magical assistance, while Mr. Granger stood beside him offering the technical criticism. One man offers another man's fire, and the 2 of them, escaped convict and dentist, had somewhere across the spring become the specific kind of friends who insult each other's competence for hours with total contentment. Ron and Neville came through the mist gate at 7 with Ginny, and Luna, who had been invited by the Isle itself as far as anyone could determine, was discovered already on the jetty, barefoot, in conversation with the water. The evening assembled itself around the fire the way the Alliance had assembled itself around the year, without ceremony, structurally sound. They ate burned sausages and the orchard's absurd out-of-season strawberries. Ron beat Sharprock at chess, which had never once happened before, and which the goblin took with the grim satisfaction of a banker, confirming a long-suspected asset. Mrs. Granger produced from the third carrier bag a cake because her daughter was being crowned in the morning, and there were, she said, limits to how strange she was prepared to let that be. It was lemon, and it said congratulations in her own icing, and beneath that in Mr. Granger's shake your hand, mind the lid, and Harry had to walk down the beach for a minute, and everyone had the courtesy to discuss Quidditch loudly until he came back. It was also the evening Sirius chose, with the timing he pretended was carelessness and never was, to hand over the watch. He did it at the fire without ceremony, a scuffed velvet box pressed into Harry's hands between one sausage and the next. Inside lay a wizard's watch, gold gone soft with wear, its 12 hands asleep. It was James S., Sirius said to the flames, conversational, while the whole beach went quiet around the two of them. His father gave it to him at 17, and I had it off the ministry with the rest of the effects this spring, and I know it's a year early and the wrong Eve entirely. That's rather the point. 17 is when a wizard comes of age by the tenancy's law. A jerk of his chin, half a grin, entirely unsteady. You're being crowned by the freehold in the morning. Near as Padfoot can reckon it, that makes tonight the last night of your minority, and giving you this is the last job of it that belongs to me and not to history. So, he cleared his throat and gave up on the sentence and finished with the only words that had ever fit. Your dad would want it keeping the time it's about to keep. The watch woke in Harry's hands. All 12 hands shivered, swung, and settled, and what they settled to was not ours. The old wizarding watches never told anything so trivial. Harry read it by firelight and then held it out wordless so Hermione could read it too. 11 hands fanned wide across the constellations of the dial, one for each of the fire's company, every single one of them standing on home. Ollivander arrived at dusk. Came over the water in a hired boat, rowing himself ancient and upright, with a long shallow drawer of black wood across his knees, and he would not come up to the fire. He stood on the jetty and waited until the two of them came down to him, and then he set the drawer on the planks between them and stood back and said, 1400 years, the drawer of my great-grandfathers, opened for the seats and no other. I would take it as a courtesy if you would be quick. I have wondered since I was 9. Inside, on velvet gone thin as breath, lay 2 wands, and the moment the starlight touched them Harry's ward sense rang like the mountain, and Hermione made the sound she made in the deepest stacks. Not new wands, old past reckoning, one of oak, plain as a fence post, worn shiny at the grip by a large hand, one of blackthorn, whipped thin, with a thread of silver run up the grain like a vein of the table's rivers. And a card in the drawer between them in a spidery hand nobody living had ever read, that Hermione translated aloud on the second look. Our wands to sleep with our wandmaker's line until our heirs have need. Note well whoever you are going to be. Her voice did the thing it did and steadied. They are not gifts. They are lendings, as ours were, as all of it is. Everything is a lending. That is the whole of the law we spent our lives learning. The rest is grammar. Nobody spoke for a while. The lock breathed against the pilings. You will want to know, said Ollivander at last, hungrily, professionally, unable not to, whether they'll answer you. Wands of the makers themselves, 14 centuries asleep. The arrogance of trying and the arrogance of not trying are, I confess, finely balanced, and I have thought about it for 80 years and cannot. Harry picked up the oak wand the way you take an old man's hand, and the isle lit from shore to shore, every apple tree, every blade, one long quiet flood of the old gold light, and on the hill the 9 stones hummed one low contented note like a kettle far away. And Hermione lifted the blackthorn, and the light did not double. It deepened, the way the jetty cord had deepened, 2 keepings, 1 promise, and out on the dark loch the fish rose all together in a ring of silver rings as though the water itself had decided discreetly to applaud. Ah, said Ollivander into the glow, in the voice of a man whose life has just finished making sense. Yes, I shall not sleep for a week. He rowed himself back in the dark, refusing escort. The fire burned down. The Grangers went up to the room the stone house had grown for them. It did that now for family, and Sirius fell asleep mid-anecdote in the orchard hammock with Padfoot's ears half emerged, and one by one the others found beds or made them, until the last 2 awake sat on the jetty steps under all the stars of the true present sky, which held tonight over the isle, out of respect, perfectly still. They did not talk about the morning. They had prepared for the morning for a year. The morning was, in the only sense that mattered, already kept. They talked about exam results due in 3 weeks, and whether Ron could be talked out of trying for the canon's trials, and the correct doctrine of cake at breakfast, on which they disagreed forever and with relish. And at some point her head found his shoulder, or his shoulder found her head. The mechanics were never established, and both retellings differ, and the last thing either of them said before the short summer night turned toward the light was said into the quiet without preface and answered without hesitation. Whatever the crowns ask, we answer as us, obviously. Midsummer came up out of the sea before 4 in the morning, and the isle, which had held 1 house and 1 orchard for 1400 years, held that dawn a nation. They came by every road the old peace remembered. The DMLE's sanctioned portkeys ran from midnight, hearthleaf in hand, family by family onto the outer shore. The Flu Network's westernmost terminals had been extended overnight to a fishing village that did not exist on Tuesday. Brooms came down out of the short summer dark in flights and family echelons, wobbling grandmothers and show-off cousins. The night bus made 41 runs, and Ernie Prang wept openly on the last one, which carried alone in her best hat, with a leaf in her glove, Minerva McGonagall. The merfolk of 3 locks and 2 seas swam the flooded ways beneath Britain that no wizard had ever mapped and rose in the shallows in their hundreds, spears reversed. The centaur herds of 4 forests stood the eastern hill from before first light, unasked, unannounced, facing the sunrise with their bows unstrung, and when a ministry official began asking whether they had been invited, the herd's eldest looked at him until he stopped. Goblins came in mailed columns under banners the bank had not flown since the conquest, and house elves came, hundreds upon hundreds, appearing by their own magic wherever on the field they pleased. Because this ran through the crowd all morning like current through water, the isle's grass received them as guests and would not let them work. By the hour appointed, the green bowl of land before the orchard held more of magical Britain in one place than had ever stood together in the recorded history of the nation. 10,000 at the oars, careful counting, then beyond counting. Muggle parents stood among them under the Concord's own dispensation, the statute suspended within the wards for kin of the invited. The Granger's in sensible shoes near the front, Mr. Granger with his jaw set in the manner of a man who intended to understand at minimum 40% of what he was about to see, Mrs. Granger holding a folded map of nothing because her hands wanted employment. And down through the crowd in the first full light, 12 goblins of the deep vaults bore the table. It came up the field on their shoulders like a piece of the world's first morning. 60 feet of single oak, the silver rivers running in its grain, and the crowd folded back from it in a long hush that traveled outward in rings, and the table was set down on Neville Longbottom's tended ring of turf as gently as a sleeping child, and its 30 chairs were set around it, Hengist's oak-leaf chair among them, home. And the 2 tall chairs, oak and blackthorn, were set facing each other across its width, and on the table, on Rowan biers under the open sky at last, 2 circlets, a sword, a knife, and a book of slate. There was no dais, no throne platform, no rope line. That was the first thing the chroniclers all recorded, whatever else they disagreed on. The table stood on the grass at the crowd's own level, and any child could walk to the edge of the turf ring and look. At 6 by the sun, the echoes came down through the orchard. They came in their full daylight solidity, the man of Oaken's storm and the woman of ink and stillness, and the crowd, which had heard rumors and disbelieved them, went to its knees in a slow rolling wave that neither echo acknowledged, because both were watching, with 14 centuries of held breath, the 2 young people walking behind them. No procession. Harry and Hermione came down through the apple trees side by side in plain dress, gray and midnight blue, no ornament but the rings, and stopped at the table's edge, and the morning stood still around them, and Merlin's echo turned to the crowd and spoke, and his voice went out to the last rank of 10,000 in the hill beyond, unhurried, conversational, enormous. 1400 years ago on this grass, 2 enemies ended a war by binding their magics into a peace that could not be broken by either. We are what they left to keep the door. This morning the door is opened. Understand what you have come to see. Not a coronation as the old kingdoms knew it. No one here will be made to kneel, and nothing will be placed on any head by any hand. The crowns of the compact are not given. He let the whole green bowl hear the grammar of it. They are answered. The crowns ask, the elect answer, and the magic judges whether the answer is true. That is all, and it is everything, and it has not been done in the lifetime of any nation now standing. Bear witness. He stepped back, and the crowns rose. No hand moved them. They came up off the Rowan biers like planets rising, pale iron and blackened silver, and the light that came off them was the light the lake had made on the June night a year gone, the old light, dawn on the first morning, and they hung in the air above the table while every bird on the isle went silent, and then the crowns spoke. Not in words. Afterward 10,000 witnesses gave 10,000 renderings, and all of them agreed only on this, that the question was put directly into the marrow, and that it was the same question for both, and that it was not, are you worthy? The crowns of Emrys and Lefay, forged by 2 people who had watched worthiness curdle into tyranny in their own generation, had been made to ask the only question their makers still trusted: what will you do with us? Harry answered first out loud into the hush in English, because he said it plainly to the floating iron, to the 10,000. The people this answer belongs to mostly don't speak the old tongue, and it's theirs, so. He had no parchment. Hermione, who knew his pockets, knew there had never been parchment. He stood with his hands open at his sides and answered a crown as he had answered a dragon. Not thrones, he said, that's first. If what's in you is a kingship over free people, refuse me now in front of everyone, because I'll refuse back. What I'll do with you is what I did all year, only bigger and with better records. Wardenship, the ward lines walked and paid for. The wrongs with no one to speak for them, spoken for. Hogwarts kept safe under its own charter, every child in it, every blood. The peace kept between the peoples in this field. The goblins were never our servants, the elves were never our property, the water and the herds were never our decoration, and the compact knows it even where our law forgot. I'll stand surety, that's the whole answer. I'll be the promise the land decides it can believe, and when I break it, I'm 14, I'll break bits of it, ask anyone, I'll stand where everyone can see me and mend what I broke, you judge, I'm done. The iron circlet burned like dawn seen through a door crack, and did not descend, and turned in the air toward Hermione, and the whole field turned with it, and the question came again marrow deep. What will you do with us? Hermione Granger looked at the nightcrown of Morgana Le Fay a long moment, and those close enough saw her deliberately unclench her hands as she had unclenched them before an echo's first inspection a year and a lifetime ago. The door stays open, she said. That's mine. 1400 years ago you elected a line, and the line ran through squibs and washerwomen and dentists' daughters, and the magic never once apologized for it, and I will not either. What I'll do with you is keep the door open that I came through. Every child the magic chooses, from every house in every street in every nation of this compact, walks in with their head up, or I want to know why, and I'm very good at wanting to know why. The knowing in you, I know what it costs now. I've been taught by the best and tested by the worst. I'll spend it with consent and keep it with mercy, and where it must cut, it will cut seams, not people. And one thing more, since answers are being witnessed. Her voice did not rise and reach the hill. I'll take you off. Whatever you are, whatever this morning makes us, there will be evenings when the crowns sit on the grass, and we are two people who did their homework by a fire. I read 1,000 years of kings preparing for today. The ones who ended well were the ones who could still take it off. Judge that too. Silence, the sea sound of 10,000 people being one held breath, and the crowns began together to descend. And a cold voice, courteous and carrying and vast, said from the northern shore, the rite is incomplete. The eldest blood on the field has not yet answered. Lord Voldemort came up from the waterline through the crowd with his hearth-leaf held before him like a writ, and the crowd tore itself out of his path screaming, and the oar's cordon moved and was stopped aloud by Sharprock's roar of pure procedural anguish. He is invited. The ground itself admitted him. Weapons down in the names of both seats, weapons down, the peace of the field holds him too, and the peace of the field is the only thing here bigger than he is. And so the Dark Lord of the Second War walked untouched through 10,000 of his countrymen in the midsummer morning, white as his own legend, red-eyed, smiling, the golden thread pulsing the length of his wandarm, and behind him at a distance came his marked circle in their black, 30 of them, escort to a claimant. He stopped at the edge of Neville Longbottom's ring of turf, and looked across the table of the compact at the two children and the two echoes and the two crowns halted in the air, and inclined his head with perfect antique courtesy. I attend the convening of the conquered, said Voldemort, by leaf and law as blood of the old peace. Slytherin's heir by descent, and him rises. He raised the gold-threaded arm and turned it, so the morning caught the burning vein and the field moaned, by substance. Let the crowns look on the eldest claim, I answer the question also. The red eyes went up to the hanging iron. What will I do with you? Everything, everything that was ever promised and never delivered. I will make magic safe forever and eternal and unashamed and mine. Weigh me artifacts, I have carried my answer for 50 years, and unlike these children, I have never once taken it off. Tom, said the echo of Merlin, in the tone of a man greeting the last guest at a funeral. We wondered which door you'd choose. Very well. You have stood on the peace of the field and demanded the weighing before 10,000 witnesses of your own mouth twice. The old echo looked at him with something that was almost dreadfully compassion. Granted. The weighing of Tom Marvolo Riddle began without instrument or gavel. The two crowns simply turned in the air, unhurried as clock hands, until the field lay within the compass of both, and the light changed. It did not darken. That was the horror the chroniclers all reached for and missed. The light grew kinder, the gold light of late afternoon in childhood, the light of every good memory anyone on that field owned, and in it everything true became gently, absolutely visible. The crowd saw one another. Old feuds standing 3 rows apart saw, briefly, the whole ledger of themselves, and several ended on the spot in ways that outlasted the day. And in the middle of that terrible kind light stood a man-shaped absence of it, the being at the turf ring's edge, lit by nothing, casting no shadow because the light declined to acknowledge him, and from the crook of his wandarm the single golden thread ran out of him across the grass, bright as a canal at sunset, straight to Harry Potter's open hand. The blood testified first. It was his to command, Voldemort had said, substance, the eldest claim. In the weighing's light, the truth of the theft stood up out of the vein and spoke in the only voice blood has, which is belonging, and every witness on the field felt where the gold belonged, and it was not in the white arm. The thread tautened. Voldemort set his will against it. The crowd felt that too, a pressure like a storm front. The full strength of the age's most terrible wizard applied to keeping one stolen thing, and the thread came out of him anyway, not torn, poured, decanting up its own length across the grass and home into the elective rise, because the weighing did not fight strength with strength. It simply informed every particle of the stolen virtue where its home was and let it go there. And where the gold had been, the absence stood fully revealed, and the crowns read the rest of him aloud, not in words, in sight. The kind light went into Tom Riddle and showed the field what a soul looks like when it has been cut again and again by its own hand. The lattice, Morgana's echo had called it at the slate table, the broken lattice, and there it hung in the sight of 10,000 people, a thing like a shattered window held together by its own splinters. The absence is visible, each one a screaming hollow with a location, a diary slain 2 years since by a 12-year-old with a basilisk fang. A ring already ash in Dumbledore's keeping since spring, a locket under a London floor, a cup in a Lestrange vault whose owner, standing masked in the escort 30 feet away, buckled to her knees as the weighing's light found the debt in her keeping, a diadem in a room of hidden things, a snake coiled at her master's feet, and a boy. A boy on the far side of the table with a scar on his forehead, lit up in the kind light like a lamp, and around the sixth shard, visible to the entire nation at once, the thing that 14 years of plans and prophecies had been built on and around and against, wrapped so close that only the crown's own sight could have found the seam. Now, said Morgana's echo quietly to her heir, as we practiced. He cannot move, the weighing holds the whole field. You have until the crowns finish reading him, and no longer, little sister. The ink-stained hand touched Hermione's shoulder once. Cut nothing, unmake. What the field saw, the heir of Morgana walking the length of the table to the heir of Merlin, taking his face in both her hands, resting her forehead against his scar. The night crown descending at last, silently into the black hair as she stood there, accepting its elect in the working posture mid-labor, which every goblin present understood to be the single highest honor the morning conferred on anyone. What Harry felt, her arriving inside the architecture of him, familiar as a footstep on a known stair, in the place where a splinter of the world's worst man had lived embedded in everything since before his memories began. And no pain, and her voice not in his ears on the frequency the ball and the jetty in 3 years of libraries had built, hold open. I see it. Oh, Harry, it never grew into you at all, you grew around it, and never once became it. Hold open there. And Hermione Granger, 15 years old, under the crown of Morgana Le Fay, with her hands steady on what she loved holding what she hated, found the vandal's seam and reversed it. The shard did not shriek out of him. It was unmade the way a knot is unmade, with patience, with respect for the rope. And as the joining dissolved, the unmaking ran down the thread of its own nature, out of the scar, across the field, into the absence standing at the turf ring's edge, and down through every splinter of the broken lattice at once, London floor and Lestrange vault and hidden room and coiled snake, because the shards were one soul, and what is truly unmade in one place is unmade in every place, and the vandal had never understood his own architecture. He had thought he built 6 anchors, and he had in fact built 6 doors, and the craft had just walked through all of them. On the grass at the edge of Neville Longbottom's turf, in the kindest light in Britain, Lord Voldemort came apart, not in fire. The weighing completed itself with the last mercy of the old magic, which is accuracy. Everything he had stolen went home, blood to the boy, terror to nothing, the orphanage great small hoarded warmths to wherever such things are kept, and what remained when all the stolen matter was restored to its owners was so little that the light seemed to look for him for a moment, courteously, the way one looks for a guest who has stepped out. A man-shaped absence, then a man-shaped memory, then a boy-shaped one brief at the very end, small and unclaimed in the enormous gold, then grass. The snake was ash on the northern shore. The masked escort stood unmasked by the light among 10,000 witnesses, 30 debts in black, and did not run because the weighing showed them each privately the full price of running, and they knelt on the field's peace and waited for Bones's quiet orders instead, and Lucius Malfoy, kneeling, watched the iron circlet resume its descent and thought, with the last clear thought of his old life, the stone-cursed magic weighed us all. And I have seen what it does with what it finds wanting, and I am going to spend whatever years it leaves me becoming expensive to find wanting. The warden crown settled onto Harry's head with the weight of a hand, calm and enormous, the grip from the dream, come home, and the aisle rang. The lock stood up in silver rings from shore to shore. The orchard went from blossom to fruit to blossom in one long exhale. The 9 stones on the hill sang the note the mountain under Gringotts had sung, and 400 miles south the mountain answered, and the lake at Hogwarts blazed under the empty morning sky, and in his tower office Albus Dumbledore, who had chosen at the last to keep a promise by staying away from a door his kindness could not be trusted to knock on, felt the whole castle bow under him like a ship answering the sea, and put his face in his hands, and Fawkes sang, and this time it was for him. On the aisle, in the roar of 10,000 people releasing 1 year of held breath, Harry Potter, crowned, looked at nothing and no one but Hermione Granger, crowned, her forehead still against his, her hands still on his face, both of them laughing now, undone, 14 and 15, king and queen of nothing they hadn't promised out loud in front of everybody to keep. Your crown's crooked, she said. Yours is heavier, he said. I can hear it thinking. It's not the crown that's thinking. I know, he said. I meant her. Take your time. We've got ages. What happened in the hour between the crowning and the table's first session? No chronicle organized, because it would not organize. It was 10,000 people's worth of weather. The Grangers reached them first, or the crowd made a road for them first, which came to the same thing. Mrs. Granger walked through the parting mass of magical Britain with her chin at her daughter's own angle, took the crowned heir of Morgana Le Fay by the shoulders, looked at the circlet, looked at the girl, and said, "Well, it suits you and you'll want lunch," and folded her in. And Mr. Granger stood before the crowned heir of Merlin in his sensible shoes and put out his hand, and when Harry took it, pulled him in the extra foot, the way fathers do, and said against his ear, too low for any chronicler, "The door works from the inside, always has, wear it however you like." Sirius arrived at a run, entirely as Padfoot, having lost the fight with his own composure somewhere in the crowd, and knocked the king of the old piece flat on the grass of his own coronation field in front of everyone, and the photograph of that crown tipped into the clover, godfather dog standing on the royal chest, both parties unmistakably laughing, hung afterward in more homes than the formal portrait ever did, which both seats considered correct. Ron and Neville came together, and neither bowed, which was the entire message, and Ron looked his best friend up and down with the flat assessing eye he kept for chessboards, and delivered the verdict the whole tent city quoted for years. "Bit much. The chair suit you. Good. You still owe me a rematch from Wednesday, and the crown doesn't play." And Neville, who had grown the very turf they were standing on, said nothing at all at first. He looked past them at the table, at Hengist's oak-leaf chair standing in its place in the circle after 400 years in a Lancashire hallway, and Harry followed the look and said, "Front row, Nev, every session as long as your family wants it," and Neville got it out on the second try. Gran says, we always knew it mattered, that's all. We always knew," and his Gran behind him, ancient and vulture-hatted, in front of 10,000 witnesses, took out an actual handkerchief and glared the field down over the top of it while she used it. McGonagall did not come forward. They found her. There was a quality of stillness 2 rows, and that could only be one person, and the two of them went out into the crowd to it, crowns and all, and stood before their head of house in her best hat. She examined them both at length over the square spectacles, June light, tartan, the whole green bowl murmuring around this one pocket of quiet. "Well," she said at last, "I put one of you on a broom, and I taught the other to turn a match into a needle. The spectacles came off, the polishing happened, the tale was spent without regret. It has been the privilege of my professional life to be so comprehensively overtaken. There will be no extension on the Transfiguration homework." "They've been insulted by one professor," said Hermione, and Minerva McGonagall laughed the laugh her students theorized about but had never confirmed, once like a door in a wall you'd assumed was solid, and the sound of it went into both their keepings, stored with the load-bearing things. The afternoon belonged to the table, and the table conducted its first session in 1400 years, with the crowd seated on the grass of the whole green bowl like the biggest school assembly in the history of islands. Not everything from that afternoon made the histories. The histories kept the charter, the field kept the rest. It kept the sight of Amelia Bones being asked from the oak chair to serve as first warden of the reformed law, and answering, "On the record, I judged you on your record," before allowing it volume that she accepted. It kept Cornelius Fudge, who had arrived braced to be abolished, being instead thanked formally for the raspberry ice cream of August last, the seat's first act of diplomatic memory, and offered a working ministry under a working law, and discovering in front of everyone that what he felt under the bowler, once the terror drained out of it at last, appeared to be relief. It kept the moment the elf benches were read into the founding, when 300 house elves stood up together on the grass, and the sound they made was taken by many present for keening, until the oldest of them explained, tartly, to a prophet reporter, that it was singing, and that wizards would be hearing considerably more of it. And it kept Priya. She was 10 now, the girl from Bradford, coming to Hogwarts in September. Her family had a leaf on their hearth like everyone else's, and she had been standing since dawn near the front with her father, and when the open hour was called, any hearth holder of the peace may address the table. Hermione had fought for that clause and would fight for it the rest of her life. It was Priya who was somehow first, through the shyness of 10,000 adults, marched to the edge of the turf ring by her own momentum, and stood there with her fists at her sides, and asked the crowned heirs of Merlin and Morgana the first question ever put to the conquered remade by a citizen. "Is it going to stay like this?" A gesture, fierce and small, at the table, the light, the benches of every people, the whole impossible morning. "Or is it going to go back to how it was when everyone stops being amazed?" The field laughed and then heard the question properly and stopped. Hermione came around the table and crouched down at the ring's edge, crown and all, so that they were eye to eye, as her mother did at the surgery with the frightened ones, and gave the first ruling of the Thornwood seat under the open sky, and the chroniclers, for once, got the wording exactly. "It goes back the moment we stop working. That's the truth, and you should have the truth. You're going to be a witch. Nothing stays," kept Priya. Not peace, not doors, not promises. My best friend taught me that. He'd say a ward is just a promise the land decides to believe, and the land keeps deciding every single day, and so do we. She reached out and straightened nothing on the girl at all, just rested a hand on her shoulder, one incoming first year to another, 11 years apart. So it stays like this exactly as long as people like you grow up and take a turn holding it. Your letter said the magic chose you. I'm telling you in front of everybody that the door will be open when you get here, and the country you just asked to keep its promise heard you ask. She stood. Ask us again in 50 years. That's a formal appointment. The keeper will minute it. Minuted, said Sharprock at the ledger end of the table, writing, with the whole nation watching him do it. Item: the girl from Bradford, follow-up scheduled midsummer 2045. Value exceeds what the conquered remade said in the charter proclaimed from the table that afternoon and lodged at Gringotts before nightfall. The history's given full, the shape of it fits in a breath. No thrones over free people. The seat stood surety, wardens not monarchs, their power running only where the old compact's peace ran, and auditable. This clause was Hermione S., and Sharprock read it aloud twice for pleasure, auditable by any hearth holder of the peace at any time. The Wisengamot reformed as a true parliament of all the compact's peoples, goblin and elf and merfolk and centaur benches written into its founding stone, its chiefs gavel answerable to the law it kept and not the reverse. Hogwarts under conquered protection, its charter's oldest clause, protection of the children within, regardless of blood, raised from tenancy fine print to the first law of the school. The door open, every child the magic chose, of any house in any street, entering their inheritance with their head up, by right and not by sufferance, the statute bent around families rather than through them. In one clause, the last, that the crowds learned by heart because it was 4 words in the old tongue and the whole day in miniature, carved that autumn over the table's hall and over the rebuilt ministry atrium, and eventually over a certain pair of doors at a school in Scotland. The crowns come off. 3 years is a long time when you are young, and nothing at all when you are an island. The island, high summer, 3 years on, kept its old habits, blossom and fruit at once, the loch laying its evening silver down the length of the water, the stone house full of the wreckage of revision, because NEWTS bowed to no charter, and the isle had hosted a study fortnight of the sort that made Ron claim asylum with the merfolk by day 4. The exams were over now. The results were owled. Outstandings in the ones that mattered, an E in potions that Harry had framed out of spite, and in Hermione's case, a formal note from the examining board thanking her for her corrections to the ancient runes paper, which she had annotated in 3 inks out of habit during the exam. The others had gone home after the bonfire. The crowns sat on the grass at the edge of the jetty, iron and silver in the clover, where anyone's dog could have stepped on them, which was the point, which had been the point for 3 years, and the two of them walked the orchard path in the long gold light with the whole evening unassigned. They had never needed to talk about it, which was why it had taken 3 years. The frequency had simply gone on being the frequency, through the rebuilding and the reformed Wisengamot's teething rows and the slow mending of the marked families. Through 6th year, when half the school had conducted a betting pool of unprecedented liquidity, and Luna had won it by refusing to specify terms. Through the middle of last winter, when Victor Crumb's engagement announcement had arrived with a warm note to them both, and Ron had watched Harry read it and said to the room in his flat chest voice, "Mate in one, nobody's moving, I don't understand it either." Belonging did not announce itself. It compounded the way the oldest trust in the world had compounded since before the Danes, quietly in the dark at interest. But it was the eve of Lammas, 3 years and a season since a field of 10,000 had watched her take his face in both hands with a crown descending, and 3 days since Harry had turned 18. And at the top of the orchard, where the path turned and the whole loch lay out below them holding the last of the light, Hermione stopped and looked at him, 18 and certain, and did the same thing again with no nation watching, took his face in both hands, as at the working, as at the mending, as always. "Hold open," she said. "You're in," Harry said. "You've been in for years." "I know," she said. "I'm just reading the room," and he was laughing when she kissed him once in the gold, with the apples above them in blossom and in fruit, and the loch below them going still from shore to shore though nobody had asked it to, and 1400 years of patient silver light rose through the water like the isle underlining a sentence it had waited a very long time for someone to finish writing. Down at the jetty, 2 crowns sat in the clover in the dark off, as promised, while their owners came down the orchard path unhurried, hand in hand, arguing contentedly about the guest list for something neither of them had actually asked the other yet. And if you had stood on the shore that night you would have seen only that, 2 people in a dog-eared island and a light in the water, the whole apparatus of legend at rest, being a family. The table in its hall below the world stood in the star-remembered dark with its silver rivers running. 30 chairs around it, Hengist's home among them, 2 tall chairs, oak and blackthorn, facing each other across the width of it, the way they had faced each other down 14 centuries and 1 impossible year. and around the rest of its vast circumference, added 2 and 3 at a time over the seasons by hands goblin and elf and human, in woods from every corner of the compact, many chairs now, and more each year, and room, the keeper of the deep vaults would tell anyone who asked, tapping the old wood with terrible satisfaction, for as many as ever choose to come and sit down. Chapter 7 End.